Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the Scion Fanfics. Back with amazing fanfiction. This is the series of What if Deku had Lagomorph Mutation Quirk? Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Lagomorph. A mammal of the order Lagomorpha, a hare, rabbit, or pika. Less than 20% of the global population is considered quirkless. Theoretically, that means 1 in 5 people, or every 5th person passed on the street has no quirk. However, 16% of the global population are elderly, who make up the vast majority of quirkless people. Subtracting that number from the total leaves only 6% of the adult and adolescent population quirkless, the number declining rapidly as time goes on, as does the population's tolerance of them. Izuku knows these numbers by heart, though not by choice. Since the day he turned 4, every doctor, teacher, and know-it-all at school has drilled it into his head that he is an anomaly. That not all men are equal. That without a quirk, he's unevolved and therefore not even human. He is one of the few remaining HMO sapiens, while everyone else is considered HMO Vafram. Quirked man. He can only sigh quietly as he looks up at the chalkboard, at the numbers written on the board, hoping his face gives nothing away as his classmates whisper and stare. It's not as if it's new news that he's the only quirkless kid in the class. They've known since he arrived at Aldera wearing the incriminating red shoes that only his kind wear. Since his teacher made him stand at the front of class and declared his status for all to hear, then proceeded to shove him into the corner desk and ignore him for the rest of the year. Quietly, Izuku begins to pack up his things, eyes down on his vandalized desk as the clock ticks forward, inching towards when the dismissal bell will ring. Maybe if he's quick, he can dodge the feet he can already see sticking out into the spaces between desks. Berinning. Quick like a bunny, he darts out of his seat and hops over the first foot, trips over the second, and makes a beeline for the door. He can smell burnt caramel, the first sign that all is not right. A searing hand lands on his shoulder and he hisses in pain, biting back a cry that would draw any more attention. It's all Izuku can do to bite his lip and stay quiet as he's dragged back towards the windows and away from the safety that are the crowded hallways, where he can lose his blonde tormentor in the crowds. What makes you think you can leave so easily, Deku? Izuku shakes his head, already stuttering out his usual denials. A crackle of sparks near his face shuts him up, his jaw snapping shut audibly as he stares up at his former friend, awaiting his fate. I heard you're still trying to get into UA, Bakugo taunts, gripping Izuku's uniform front in his fist. UA, his dream school. The #1 hero school in all of Japan, where the greatest hero alive, All Might, graduated from. His one and only chance at becoming the hero he'd always wanted to be. You think you're better than me? You're a useless Deku. I'll rise right to the top, all the way past All Might. You should count yourself lucky for being crushed under my boot. Bakugo's lackeys grin and jeer from behind him like a pack of hyenas stalking a lion's kill, waiting for the moment the big cat loses interest so they can go in for the leftovers. Izuku squeezes his eyes shut and prays that it'll be over soon. His mom wanted to have a movie night and he'd hate to miss it because he was late coming home. You'll never be anything while you're quirkless, so just pray you'll get a quirk in the next life and go take a swan dive off the roof. Izuku tumbled to the ground, suddenly let go, his palms just barely hitting the floor in time to stop himself from face-planting. He could only stare at the ground as the shoes of his classmates departed, stunned. That was it? No beating, no playing keep-away with his notebooks, just some baiting? He was almost relieved. It came crashing back down a second later when he registered that fact. He was so afraid of Bakugo that being told something so horrible was better than facing him. He really was like a bunny. Quick and fearful. Slowly he picked himself up and started towards the door again, wiping his face free of any tears that might have accumulated. He caught a few on his sleeve and made a note to wash this jacket again, glad Bakugo hadn't used his quirk any more than making his hands hot. He couldn't afford another jacket this year. He poked his head out the classroom door and made sure the coast was clear before scuttling into the hallway, quickly making his way outside. He was walking down the street in record time, eager to get home to where he hoped dinner was waiting. If he was lucky, his mother hadn't been called in for an emergency shift, but Izuku had long since learned never to count on luck. He was born a bad omen after all. Mom! I'm home, he called out, closing the front door behind him and kicking his shoes off. He traded them for his house slippers and ventured further into his apartment, looking around for signs of life. Inko's keys were on the table and so was her purse, so she was home at least. Izuku! You're just in time. Izuku turned to see his mother exit the kitchen, wiping her hands off on a towel as she smiled at the sight of him. They came together in a hug, arms wrapped around each other as they slowly relaxed, the stress of a long day evaporating thanks to the comfort of familiar arms. "I made Katsudon," his mother said, squeezing him gently. "We still on for movie night?" "Of course, Mom. Let me change and I'll be right there." Izuku chirped, his usual cheer returning swiftly. They broke apart and went their separate ways, Izuku to his room to get dressed, Inko to the kitchen to serve their dinner. When they met up again it was at the sofa, where they both sat down and took their bowls and utensils before scrolling through movie titles for something to watch. Once found, they settled down against the couch, both of them curled up with their legs up and bowls set on their laps. It was almost funny how similar the two were to each other, like a pair of twins. People often joked that the Midoriyas were actually just clones of each other. Sitting with his mom beside him, Izuku could almost forget everything troubling him. His nose twitched as he glanced over at her, focusing on her calm face and relaxed posture. Despite what had to be a hard day at work, she always managed to come home with a cheerful attitude and a love for life. He envied her some days, because more often than not he found himself resenting the world. It was a recent development for sure, because he couldn't remember ever not smiling so much his face hurt. Nowadays he felt like a cloud followed him around, draping his world in gray, raining on his parade. It had been a while since he'd felt truly happy. Appetite ruined, Izuku set his bowl down on the coffee table and tucked his legs up, watching the TV with his mouth pressed to his knees. His mother couldn't notice his lack of smile if he hid it entirely, right? But a mother's intuition was never wrong. Inko noticed, of course, her own soft smile falling slowly as she watched her son withdraw into himself. She thought back to the articles she so often saw online about quirkless statistics. Most didn't live past their 14th birthday. Izuku was overdue. Mornings were Izuku's favorite time of day. He knew many people disliked them on principle, either because it meant the start of work or school, or sometimes because many enjoyed sleep far more than being awake. But Izuku liked them because sleep rarely brought the kind of comfort most experienced. Mornings were a relief from bad dreams and nightmares of a sugary sweet scent and sparking fireworks. They also meant his morning training, which had to be his favorite part of the day. The steady beat of his feet on pavement kept in time with his heart always served to calm him down. Rather than his feet following his heartbeat, it was almost like the opposite. Izuku could always count on his feet to take him anywhere he wanted and calm his frazzled thoughts. His favorite thing had to be his exercises up on the rooftop next to the bakery that had the cinnamon muffins he so enjoyed. It was covered in pipes, low structures, and empty crates he could use to run and jump off of. He had so much energy to burn all the time, especially in his legs, and getting it all out up there meant he wasn't bouncing his legs so much in class. It was fun and he always enjoyed himself. With the sun just rising, it gave him enough light to see by so he could start his usual stretching routine. He'd always been flexible, so toe touches and bending backwards so his hands touched the ground were easy for him. He pushed off his feet and sprung backwards, standing back upright so he could hop up and down and shake himself out. Lately he'd felt so pent up, like a spring coiled up tight. Maybe it was PBRTY? He'd been eating so much lately thanks to his growth spurt, it could be the source of his newfound energy. Izuku took off towards a tall crate, jumping up as high as he could to try and reach the top without the use of his hands. The bottoms of his shoes scraped the edge, arms pinwheeling as he nearly fell backwards, but he managed to lean forward and just barely make it, a triumphant hoot leaving his mouth as he jumped up and down. Finally! "Looks like all that training has finally gotten me somewhere," he said to himself, grinning so hard his face hurt. He jumped down and continued, launching himself over stacks of boxes and rolling under pallets leaned against the utility room atop the roof. He jumped from pipe to pipe and clambered up and down every available surface until he was sweaty and heaving for air. Then and only then did he make his way back to his bags and sit down heavily, his brain finally calm and quiet. Silence achieved, he pulled out his latest notebook from his bag and opened it to the last page, eyes skimming over what he'd written. Eraserhead, Underground Hero. Right, his latest hero obsession. He was a bit miffed at himself for picking such an elusive hero, but then again, he liked the challenge. Finding anything out about the guy, or girl, even the hero's gender was a mystery, but he was sure they were a guy, was like trying to find a needle in a haystack, though the crumbs he'd scrounged up were interesting. He fought quirkless, for one thing, which excited him immensely. For another, he was spotted nearby only a few nights ago, meaning his route might be close too. He scribbled in his notebook excitedly, mumbling up a storm as he wrote down his ideas. "Maybe tonight I can go out and investigate? Mom has the night shift, so she won't miss me or anything. If I can study his fight pattern, that'll give me an edge in the entrance exam," he whispered to himself, pencil flying across the pages. A small noise alerted him to something nearby, a cat maybe? It was so quiet, he'd nearly missed it. He whipped his head around to see, his eyes landing on a pair of black combat boots. They trailed up and up, head craning upwards, his eyes almost bugging out of his head. "Oh my God," he whispered, beginning to quiver in excitement. Eraserhead. To his credit, the hero only blinked, his surprise so well hidden that Izuku almost didn't perceive it at all. If it weren't for the tightening of the man's hand in his scarf, he would have thought he was entirely unfazed. "That's right, kid. Nice catch," the hero said, though his brows furrowed. "What are you doing up here, though?" Izuku blinked, head tilting to the side and sending his curls flopping about. What did he mean? He was just sitting on a roof. Oh. Bakugo's words rang in his head and he winced, reaching up to scratch his head sheepishly. It's not what you think, I promise," he stuttered, waving his hands about. "I'm just here, studying? Sort of. I am practicing for the UA entrance exam, you see, but there's not a lot of places to really do that." Eraserhead blinked again, this time keeping his thoughts well guarded. He was quiet for so long that Izuku started to sweat before finally reacting, his expression softening. "The entrance exam, huh? Nice to see someone coming in prepared," he said dryly, stepping forward and dropping into a crouch. Izuku stared in awe at the hero, eyes wide and hands clutching his notebook tightly. Should he ask for an autograph? He's an underground hero and identities were so carefully hidden, maybe he shouldn't. "You can have my autograph, kid. Just try and breathe between words, MK?" Eraserhead said, a hand extended expectantly. The greenette slapped a hand over his mouth, mortified. He hadn't meant to mumble. He'd just gotten so excited. So to keep from putting his foot further in his mouth, he put his hand down and quickly flipped to an empty page in his notebook and handed it and his pencil over, shaking his fists up and down as he watched the hero scrawled his messy signature across the designated page. "Why, you're like my favorite hero," Izuku gushed, nearly tearing up from how emotional he was getting. "Oh yeah?" Eraserhead said, sounding surprised as he handed the notebook over. "Why yeah. You're just so cool. You're like that pre-quirk superhero, Batman. Stalking the rooftops at night looking for crime, swooping in and saving the day. And you do it all basically quirkless," he blurted, holding the signature close to his chest. "Why, you really inspire me to be a hero." Eraserhead was stunned. This kid who he'd seen writing in a book at the edge of a rooftop was a fan of him? Was inspired by him? He could hear his husband squealing in the back of his head at that very moment. Thanks, kid," he said, reaching up to scratch his own head. I don't think anyone's ever said that about me." "They should," Izuku said bluntly, a blush rising to his cheeks at his own words. "You're awesome." "You'd better stop before my head explodes from all the praise," Eraserhead said with a huff. Izuku blinked and suddenly looked incredibly worried. It does that?" The Ravenet blinked once, twice, then chuckled and shook his head, reassuring the kid with a rather awkward pat on the head. "No, it doesn't. It's a metaphor, kiddo." Oh, sorry," Izuku said, growing even more flustered. Eraserhead waved it off and stood up, stretching his arms above his head and wincing when his back popped. Right, he'd been heading home when he saw Izuku. His husband was probably awake by now and wondering where he was. "I gotta go, kid. You got a name?" he asked, stepping towards the very edge of the rooftop. Izuku," the boy answered, staring up at the hero with wide eyes. Eraserhead nodded and peered out across the city, unaware of how awesome he looked with his capture scarf waving in the wind, the sun outlining his figure. "I'll look for you at the exam. I hope to see you in my class." With that he leapt off the roof, casting out a length of his scarf to catch a street lamp and swing down nearly to the sidewalk before launching back up into the air. He was gone in seconds, leaving Izuku with his jaw on the floor and mind blown. "Eraserhead is teaching at UA?" he squeaked, only to slap his hand over his mouth again. He hadn't meant to say that either. A day later saw Izuku gently dabbing at his notebook with a tissue, painstakingly absorbing as much water as was possible from the pages. Many were ruined beyond repair, but he hoped that at the very least he could transcribe what was salvageable. He frowned as he dragged his thumb across the edges where the koi fish that lived in the school pond had nibbled at, ruining the book further. He'd have to look up whether or not paper was okay for them. Not only did he not want to harm them, but he was sure to be held responsible if they were, despite Bakugo having been the one to toss the book into the pond. He hadn't held any care for animals, or anything, really, in a while. Distracted by his task, he failed to notice the underpass he'd stepped under, nor the drainage grate lifting up out of the ground. He caught the smell of something revolting, nose scrunching as he looked up. It was too late to do anything, his instinctive scream lost to the muck invading his throat. "You'll make a perfect meat suit to hide in," the villain growled, a sinister grin peeking through the slime. Izuku clawed at his face, thrashing about as he struggled to clear his airways. He could feel the villain crawling down his throat, his nose, his lungs, invading his body in the worst possible way. His vision was darkening and he'd collapsed to the ground under the weight of the sludge, fingers reaching out desperately for someone, anyone to come save him. "Man, you're really doing me a favor. You really are my hero," the villain said, wrapping himself in and around the boy. "Never fear. For I am here." Izuku woke up to light smacks on his cheeks, pulling him out of oblivion. He immediately rolled over and heaved, spitting up disgusting green sludge onto the ground. A hand tentatively patted his back as he rid his body of the horrible substance, his eyes watering. He looked up to try and see his savior, only for his heart to leap into his throat. Meeting Eraserhead was amazing, a dream come true. But if that was a dream come true, then what was this? He had to be asleep, because there was no way All Might was really standing in front of him. "What are you talking about?" "I am here," the man said, standing up straight and setting his hands on his hips. Another case of Izuku speaking his thoughts. "I saved you from that sludge villain. You should be more careful, young man. Walking through dark tunnels alone is never a good idea, especially not for someone so young." Izuku sputtered and apologized, staggering upwards so he could bow profusely. He quickly reached for his dropped notebook, muttering about an autograph, only to open it to find that it was already signed. He really thinks of everything. Izuku thought in amazement. He looked up only to find All Might crouching down, preparing to take off. He leapt forward in alarm, eyes wide. "Wait! All Might, I still need to ask you something." Before he knew it, the man had jumped. He left the ground and everything seemed to slow down, as if the world wanted him to watch in 4K his greatest opportunity fly away. The second sped up and he vaguely remembered his feet leaving the ground before his hands caught the man's pant leg, his eyes widening. He looked down and proceeded to scream, scrambling up All Might's leg to wrap all his limbs around it. "Young man! I have to insist you let go." All Might yelled over the wind, shaking his leg to try and get him off. Izuku held on tighter, terror gripping his heart and forcing it to beat even faster. "Why you can't? I'll die if I let go." The hero cursed so quietly he almost missed it before aiming for an empty rooftop. He landed hard, accidentally sending Izuku tumbling away, though with his meager training he at least managed to roll well enough to avoid injury. "All Might, please wait," he cried, turning around and shooting up onto his feet. "Please, just for a moment." He was rendered speechless as he watched the man begin to smoke, eyes widening as his form started to shrink. His mouth was stuck open throughout the entire process, caught between horrified and shocked. What stood before him wasn't All Might anymore, but a man resembling a scarecrow with how thin he was. Even his face was gaunt and his eyes sunken in. What happened to him? "Hey, are you okay?" Izuku asked faintly, blinking dumbly. All Might nodded and sat down on the edge of the roof heavily, seemingly needing to catch his breath. He pushed his fingers through his hair and looked up at Izuku, staring at him for a moment. He saw what he needed to, his expression softening into something sullen rather than stern. "I am fine, young man," he said, a little touched by his worry. "Thank you. I'm sure you're wondering what made me like this." All Might gestured vaguely to himself and looked up to see the boy nodding shyly, curious but afraid to offend. He couldn't help but huff in amusement and stood up, lifting his shirt as he went. 5 years ago, I fought a powerful villain. While I defeated him, he delivered one last powerful blow that left me brutally wounded. It means that I can't hold the form of All Might anymore, similar to how a swimmer holds in his gut at the pool," he explained quietly, glad to be able to vent a bit, even if it was to a random kid. He didn't have to fear him tattling, at least. No one would believe him. "I have a question," Izuku asked quietly, staring at the wound from under his bangs. "Can someone like me become a hero? I know it's hard, and I know even the best of the best don't make it, but I wanted to know. Can a quirkless person become a hero?" He looked up to see All Might standing stiff, a strange expression on his face. He held his breath, his grip on his backpack tight as he waited for his answer. All Might looked at Izuku and saw himself. He'd asked the very same question, once, to a very similar person to himself. His mentor, a woman with a smile far brighter and more genuine than his own, who was gone too soon. Anyone can be a hero. A quirk is just a tool, like a hammer. What you really need is the heart and determination to make it there. The question is, do you think you can be a hero? But his mentor was dead and All Might was living on borrowed time. Maybe 5 years ago his answer would have been different, but now? I can't tell you to be a hero. It's not realistic. But if you really want to save people, you could become a policeman, or a fireman, he said, stepping forward to put a thin hand on the boy's shoulder. They are very admirable jobs all the same, I'm sure you'd be very good at whatever you choose. Izuku couldn't breathe. He felt numb, like his ears and mouth were stuffed with cotton. He looked up as All Might put his hand on his shoulder, his eyes watering. There was regret in his eyes, but he didn't take his words back as he slowly walked away, heading for the roof access door. "It's not a bad thing to dream, kid," he said, the door swinging shut behind him. A tear fell to the concrete, followed by a second, then countless others. Izuku could only cry as his idol walked away with what was left of his dream, ignorant to what he'd just done. He clutched his notebook tightly in his hand and stared down at the signature written in it, his tears falling to stain the pen ink. "Not realistic," he quoted quietly, wiping his eyes on his sleeve. A distant explosion jarred his senses, making his ears ring as he whipped his head up. In an instant he'd run across the rooftop towards the noise, spotting a cloud of smoke in the distance. A villain fight. He narrowed his eyes and leaned further forward, something familiar about the street it was coming from. Wait, that was where Bakugo had been headed. Izuku grabbed his things and bolted down the building stairs in a panic. The villain. He hadn't seen what had happened to it while unconscious, but maybe in saving him, All Might had left him get away. DMN, that meant he'd unwittingly gotten in his way. He shook that thought off as he exited onto the street, looking back and forth before darting across the road and taking off. It didn't matter right now. He just had to get to Bakugo before it was too late. "Get off of me, you bastard!" Bakugo thrashed and lit his hands up, trying to explode the villain that had ambushed him into smithereens. He just laughed, making fun of the arrogant boy who thought he'd actually escape. He rampaged down the street, directing his palms toward shops and buildings, causing as much chaos as he possibly could while the heroes all around struggled to counter him. "We need to wait for a better matchup to arrive. Form a perimeter, keep any civilians away," one of them yelled, trying to get the gathering crowd under control. The villain grinned, eyes glinting with glee as he watched them all scurry like rats. How pathetic. These were heroes? They couldn't even save one measly kid. "Be Bakugo." The blonde whipped his head to the side, eyes wide. "No. Don't tell him." Izuku shoved his way through the crowd, face red with anger. No one was doing anything, so he'd just take things into his own hands. He threw his backpack with all his strength, launching it straight for the villain's face, and subsequently Bakugo's, though it was only partly on purpose. As fate would have it, his loose zipper took that moment to burst open, sending his textbooks and school supplies flying into his eyes, making him reel back and cry out in pain. With the villain incapacitated for the moment, Izuku lunged forward a considerable to dig through the slime and sludge, just barely managing to get Bakugo enough air to breathe. He grinned when he saw the boy inhale, though it stuttered when he instantly began to yell. "Get out of here, you Deku! You're just getting in the way!" Bakugo shouted, before the villain wrapped itself back around his face, pulling him deeper in. "Pathetic," he shouted, his body stretching out with long tendrils, surrounding Izuku and caging him in. "What do you think you're going to do to me, huh? You're just a nobody." The greenette gulped and wondered the same thing. What had he been thinking? For a half-baked plan, it was better than others, what with using his bag to blind the villain, then going for the most solid section of slime around Bakugo's mouth to pull at, but it was still half-baked. "I'm not gonna do anything," he said, clenching his fists. "But the heroes will." Backdraft looked around at the others, watching them stand there uselessly as a kid went to do their jobs for them. He cursed and left the civilian wrangling to Kamui Wood, taking off at a run towards the sludge villain. Just in time, he sent massive jets of water surging towards them, trusting that the kids would be smart enough to hold their breaths. As he'd suspected, the slime was no match for his water, simply washing away in the stream. It even served to decrease his mass, meaning catching and containing the main body would be so much easier. Bad matchup, his butt. Izuku gasped for air and shook his head out, landing on his hands and knees once the water was gone. He got to his feet shakily and looked around, eyes wide. A fist grabbed him by his jacket, dragging him face to face with Bakugo. "You could have killed us, you fing moron," he shouted, shaking the other violently. "What the F makes you think you're better than a hero? Eh? Why the F would you run after me?" "I don't know. My feet just started moving on their own," he squeaked, gripping Bakugo's wrist and paling as his uniform started to smoke. "You're still looking down on me. You little sheet, you're nothing, you hear me? I don't fing need your help and I never have," the bully roared, throwing Izuku to the ground before storming off. Izuku swallowed and sat up, staring off after the other as he disappeared into the crowd of reporters that had gathered. He could distantly hear some of the heroes berating him, one even yelling loud enough to rival Bakugo. He couldn't hear it, though. That was dumb, but admirable. His head snapped up to see Backdraft, the newly debuted firefighting hero, walking away. But he was sure it was him who'd said that. It startled him into standing, then he found himself fleeing the scene, trying to get away and back home. Hopefully his face hadn't been caught in any of the cameras on scene, though he was certain that his mother would recognize him anyway if even a tuft of green hair was shown. Izuku braced himself for an evening full of mother henning. As expected, Inko was on him the moment he stepped through the door, checking him over for injuries and sitting him down anyway. He had some bruises and a scraped elbow, but otherwise seemed to be all right. She insisted on treating his elbow, though. "What happened, Izuku?" she asked worriedly, dabbing antiseptic onto his scrape. Izuku winced and tried to pull away, insisting he was fine once more, only for his protests to be ignored. He sighed softly. "May as well explain, then. I was on my way home and ran into that villain," he said, squeezing his eyes shut as she gasped, hand flying to her mouth. "Bakugo tossed my notebook into the koi pond, so I was drying it off and wasn't paying attention. Sorry." Inko squeezed his shoulder and rolled his sleeve down, nudging him to continue. He swallowed and did so. "He was on top of me before I could think. It was awful, Mom. Like eating raw sewage," he said with a shudder. "That sounds horrible. How did you find Katsuki, though?" Inko asked, sparing him from having to tell her about All Might. He'd rather not think about it, if he was honest. "Well, a hero saved me, and I saw the explosion from far away. I just knew it was Bakugo, but either way I couldn't stop my feet. It was like they had a mind of their own or something, and they were going so fast. But when I saw him, oh Mom, he looked so scared," Izuku said, leaning against his mother and accepting her comforting hug. "Like when we were kids and he nearly drowned in that river. I couldn't let him die because all the heroes were just standing around." Inko held him as he cried, rocking back and forth as she kissed his head and shushed him softly. She squeezed tightly and wept too, though for a different reason. Her poor boy, so empathetic and heroic. How dare the world treat him so poorly, when he was going to be the one to save it? Inko sat at the bus stop wondering about her son. If he was happy, if he felt loved, if his needs were being met. She checked off box after box, but her doubts continued to plague her thoughts. Izuku could easily be hiding things from her. Even she couldn't see everything, especially if her son didn't want her to. While she sat pondering, a man came up from behind her and snatched her purse up in his hand, startling her right off the bench. She screamed for help, the strap caught on her arm, struggling both to get it off and to kick the man away as he yanked and yanked, too caught up to try and loosen it. "Help! Help me!" she yelled out, frightened that no one would hear her. It was so early and very few heroes were out during this time of day. Inko spotted a shape on the rooftops above, eyes widening as the figure jumped down, a winding length of gray cloth shooting out to grab the thief around the neck and yank him back. He went down with a choked-off yell, smacking down onto the concrete and staying there as Inko's savior stood above him. The hero rolled him over and bound his hands in zip ties, and the puffs of flame coming off of the criminal's hands stopped. It must have been his quirk, though Inko wasn't quite sure how it worked. Izuku was better at figuring out quirks than she was. Inko winced as she tugged her purse strap off her arm, blinking at the hand suddenly move into her tear-filled vision. She took it carefully and looked up to see dark eyes peering out from over the gray scarf around the hero's neck. She noticed the man's hero outfit, his scarf and long hair specifically, and remembered something her son had told her about not long ago. "I saw Eraserhead, Mom. He was so cool." We talked for a bit and he was just so cool. "I said that already, but he told me I could be a hero even though I'm quirkless. No one really knows what his quirk is. It could be the scarf he carries around, but his long hair floats when he uses his quirk, so it could be that dash. Eraserhead," Inko exclaimed with a gasp, pulling herself to her feet and hurriedly wiping her eyes. Thank you for rescuing me. My son is a big fan of yours." Eraserhead's eyes widened as he scanned her face, before his expression softened as he huffed. "You must be Izuku's mother. You two look alike." An understatement, Inko thought amusedly. She and her son shared the same big green eyes and green hair, though her boy had gotten his wild curls from his father. If she didn't wear so much makeup, they'd have matching freckles, too. "He speaks of you often." "I'm Midoriya Inko," she introduced herself. "I'm aware you two met a few days ago. You left quite the impression on him. He hasn't stopped talking about you." Inko giggled as Eraserhead pushed his face deeper into his scarf, covering her mouth with a hand as his face reddened in embarrassment. She almost wanted to tweak his cheek just to tease him. I do need to go," she said, spotting her bus in the distance. "Are you sure? You don't need your arm checked out?" he asked, tapping his earpiece to call the police. Inko just smiled again and walked towards the bus, waving gently. No, I'm fine. I work at a hospital, they can take care of me before my shift. Goodbye, Eraserhead-san." Eraserhead waved as she got on the bus, watching her go and huffing as she snapped a quick picture with a playful grin. She immediately sent it to Izuku and sank into her seat, pulling up her phone. An idea had popped into her head. She should take her son out to dinner, just the two of them, and Inko could tell Izuku more about her savior. Izuku, HGJKHSKJGSGMOM. That's Eraserhead. Mom, I know. He rescued me from a purse thief a few minutes ago. I talked to him, he's as kind as you say he is. Izuku, wait, what? Are you okay? Mom, I'm alright, Zuku, don't worry. I'll have my arm checked out when I get to work, but I'm sure it's fine. It was just yanked a bit, that's all. Izuku, if you're sure. Mom, I'm sure. How do you feel about going out? Izuku, tonight? Mom, yes. What do you say, just you and me? We could go out to dinner, I know you've been wanting to try that place next to the music store that just opened. Izuku, that sounds amazing, Mom. I'd love that. Mom, okay. Why don't we meet each other there? I'll head over right after work, since I'll be coming home late. Izuku, alright, see you there. Mom, love you, love. Izuku, love you, love. Inko smiled down at her phone. There, that ought to help him feel better. Eraserhead turned around and was met by a fist to the face. His quick reactions meant that instead of a broken nose, he had a bruised cheek, but he cursed himself anyway. He was never this sloppy, but meeting Inko had distracted him long enough that the villain had managed to get out of the zip ties. He must have blinked while speaking to Inko and not noticed. The thief took off into a nearby alley, Eraserhead hot on his heels, but between one turn and the next, he suddenly found a brick wall in front of him and no thief in sight. He jerked his head back and forth, finding no fire escapes, ladders, or tags to suggest a hidden door. But that made no sense, he couldn't have just disappeared. Unfortunately, about a foot away, the thief and his partner were huddled into a corner, holding their breaths as the seconds Quirk hid them. So long as they didn't move an inch and Eraserhead didn't step any closer, they'd remain invisible in the little bubble they were in. Eraserhead cursed and ran back down the alley to double-check every possible escape, fists clenched in frustration. He never let a target get away like that. What was wrong with him? Well, maybe being awake for 36 hours could have been why, but it had never affected him before. Maybe he had to face it. He wasn't the young, dumb hero he used to be. Izuku headed out at around 17:30 to be at the restaurant by 1800 hours, grabbing his keys, wallet, and phone on the way out the door. He skipped down the stairs and out the front door, slowing to a walk once he was outside. It wasn't too late, the sun still barely visible over the surrounding buildings, but it wouldn't be long until it set. It wouldn't be the first time he'd been out at dusk, though his mother always worried when he came home that late or needed to go grab something from the corner store. But he wasn't defenseless. Not anymore, at least. He'd been practicing. So he made his way down the street with his hands in his pockets, wearing only a collared shirt and black pants. He was dressed simply but comfortably, not too fancy but not casual either. He kept his red shoes, though, since trying to find anything else both in his size and the quirkless style was nearly impossible. There were only the red ones that everyone knew by the patented shade, but at least red went with everything. With his eyes on his shoes, he heard rather than saw a commotion in the alley beside him. He looked up and stopped against his better judgment, peering into the gloom to try and see what was going on. A familiar gray scarf caught his eye and he gasped, racing into the alley without a second thought. He hid behind a dumpster and peered over top of it, eyes wide as he watched the fight before him. Eraserhead versus a mystery villain, seemingly with a mutation quirk if his shark fin and long teeth were anything to go by. The hero danced around the clumsy villain with uncanny grace, leaping from wall to wall and using his scarf to trip him up. It was almost like watching a cat play with a mouse. With a clever twist of his scarf he wrapped the loose edges and loops around the guy, his jumping around having been hiding the weaving of a great net. The shark man struggled, but his mouth was tied shut, leaving him with no way to get out. In just one move, Eraserhead had won the fight. His quirk must not be obvious, Izuku muttered to himself, wishing he had his notebook with him. Maybe that scarf is his quirk? But it comes right off and I don't see a dispenser or anything dash. I can hear you, kid. Izuku squeaked and hid behind the dumpster, only to shake his head. Why was he hiding when he was already caught? So he stood up instead and crept into view, a nervous grin on his face. He ignored his buzzing phone in his pocket. Sorry. And hi again, Eraserhead, he said, waving shyly. Eraserhead huffed in amusement and planted his boot on the shark villain's head, leaning against his knee as he turned to look at Izuku. Hey, Izuku. I'm surprised to see you again. Izuku nearly cried with happiness. He remembered his name. What's with meeting you in dangerous places, huh? He asked, a brow raised. Oh, you're right, haha, he said sheepishly. First the roof, and now a dangerous alley? It must look pretty weird. A little, Eraserhead said. I promise it's just a coincidence. I am actually headed to dinner with my mom. Izuku said, wringing his hands. And I really gotta go. Oh, but I wanted to ask you some things. Worrying his lip, he watched Eraserhead turn his head away, eyes unfocusing for a moment. Ah, he must have a comlink and be listening to it. He hummed an affirmative to whatever was said and looked back at Izuku, gaze calculating. It's very late. Once this guy is picked up, why don't I walk you to the restaurant, he suggested, head tilting similar to a cat's. Izuku was going to die if Eraserhead kept dropping these bombs. He fought down his beaming grin and nodded excitedly, eyes nearly sparkling. Why you would? That's so great. Thank you, Eraserhead. He proceeded to bombard the man with questions, asking about everything and anything as his phone kept buzzing in his pocket. His quirk, why he kept his hair down, because having it in a ponytail would hide the tail of your quirk and keep it out of your face dash, and what his capture scarf was made out of. Some things were answered, some weren't, but at least Eraserhead seemed to be considering adding a hair tie to his costume, which made Izuku squeal with excitement. A hero, a real hero, taking his advice. How amazing. Finally they left the alley, Izuku vibrating in excitement and Eraserhead looking a bit exasperated but ultimately fond. He didn't look forward to the matching squeals he'd get from his husband and best friend, but at least he'd be able to tell someone about the frankly adorable kid he'd stumbled upon. They walked in companionable silence, with Izuku mulling over all he'd learned and Eraserhead weighing the pros and cons of adopting a child versus getting 3 more cats. Surely the cats were the better option, especially financially. The smell of smoke caught Izuku's attention first, then Eraserhead's. Izuku's eyes widened and he jogged forward, before breaking off into a sprint. The man struggled to keep up, finding that the boy was either a track star or his shoes were a lie. He rounded a corner to find the kid stock still, his eyes wide and body frozen stiff. The restaurant was on fire. Izuku could see 2 villains inside, one with a flame quirk it seemed, hunched over and shouting profanities, the other fallen at his feet, flickering in and out of existence. The heroes were already working to detain him. He looked frantically to the small crowd of survivors nearby. Some people were standing, others laying on the ground, but none of them had green hair. None of them were his mother. "Mom," he shouted, running forward. A scarf grabbed him around his shoulders and dragged him back away from the building, away from danger. He yelled and screamed, fighting the scarf and then Eraserhead's arms as he tried to get away. His mother was in there. "Let me go," he shouted. "My mom's in there." Kid! Eraserhead shouted, finally catching his attention. "You can't go in there. I'll go find her, okay? Stay here." He pushed Izuku's shoulders down to cement his orders before rushing towards the flaming building, eyes blazing red with anger. He knew these villains, they were the ones he'd failed to capture earlier that day. He wouldn't fail a second time. Eraserhead leapt through the broken storefront window and slammed his fist into the villain's face without hesitation, sending him crashing to the ground. Then he picked both villains up by the collars and tossed them out of the building before heading back inside, arm thrown over his nose to try and block the smoke. "Midoriya-san," he called out, heading further inside much to the chagrin of the firefighters on the street. Eraserhead rounded a half-wall and cursed, rushing forward. Inko was trapped beneath a half-charred support beam, half the ceiling having fallen down behind her. She coughed weakly and looked up at him, squinting her eyes as blood ran down her face. "Eraserhead," she rasped, reaching out with one hand, the other pinned. When the hero took it she smiled weakly, coughing again, though this time sounded much worse. "Is my son okay? He should have been heading here by now. I found him on the way, he's all right," Eraserhead assured, talking rapidly into his comm, "help's on the way." Inko was quiet for a moment, prompting Eraserhead to shake her gently. She blinked slowly and looked up at him, her breath shallow and her face twisted in pain. Whatever Eraserhead couldn't see behind the bin couldn't be good, she was declining rapidly. Take care of him," she said, eyes glazing over. He'll be a hero, he needs someone to believe in him, please take care of my son." "Midoriya-san, stay awake," Eraserhead said, watching her eyes slip shut. "Midoriya. Inko. Minute, I need help. In here. Help." He clutched her hand and pressed his fingers against her pulse, but he couldn't find anything. He tried again and again, on her wrist, her neck again, and pressed his ear to her chest. Nothing. Eraserhead stumbled out of the smoke and fire after the fire and rescue teams had gone in, coughing into his sleeve as paramedics rushed towards him. He was ushered to an ambulance and given oxygen, the paramedics chiding him as they rushed to go help the other survivors. Izuku managed to find him, eyes huge and full of tears. They spotted each other at the same time and their eyes met, one full of exhaustion and the other full of grief. The boy ran towards him and opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Eraserhead knew what he was going to ask, though, and he couldn't tell him the answer. He looked away instead, feeling like a coward. Immediately, tears welled up in Izuku's eyes, his breath catching in his throat. Eraserhead looked up again and watched the boy fall to his knees, his face in his hands as he screamed, his agony so raw and potent that even Aizawa could feel his throat closing. Aizawa fell forward and gathered Izuku up into his arms, squeezing him tightly as the boy grabbed onto his shirt and wept into his scarf, his mouth open as he shrieked and bawled like a baby. The hero held them both upright, his gaze far off. Inko's last words echoed in his ears. Take care of him. He'll be a hero, he needs someone to believe in him. Aizawa let go for a moment to tap his earpiece, speaking quietly into it. Call Hisashi, he whispered softly, Izuku's cries all he could hear as he waited for the call to go through. Before a foster application can go through, a newly orphaned child becomes a ward of whatever prefecture they belong to. The police pick them up, then they're dropped off at a facility where they will wait until the proper paperwork is processed and inspections are done. Usually, this is when belongings are picked up, which is what Izuku is doing right now. A police officer opens the apartment door for him and lets it swing open, waiting for Izuku to enter first. But the boy doesn't move. Everything has moved so fast, leaving no time at all for him to process all that's happened. With a nudge to his shoulder, he finally takes a step forward, taking off his shoes on autopilot and sliding his feet into his slippers before walking further into the apartment. It's exactly like he left it, with the hallway light on and everything. He's sure that if he went into the kitchen, he'd find his mother there making dinner like always, but once he rounds the corner, he's left disappointed. His mother isn't here. And she never will be. Izuku gathers up his things in a daze, the officer's voice sounding like it's underwater as he grabs his yellow backpack and shoves clothes into it. He thinks he's telling him about a storage unit or something, but he can barely hear him. It's like he's floating above his body, watching himself grab a suitcase to fill it with more things. A present mic, put your hands up. Radio hoodie, his Mirko blanket, and a few action figures, including one of All Might. His hero card binder goes in there too, along with his many notebooks and writing supplies. He doesn't want to leave anything behind, but these are the most important things that have to come with him. I'm ready, he says quietly, reaching up to turn out his bedroom light. The ride to the orphanage is quiet, the officer not bothering to fill the silence. Izuku finds himself grateful, he wouldn't know what to say anyway. He barely even thinks throughout the entire drive, his gaze stuck out the window but not focusing on anything in particular. He fears that if he thinks, his thoughts will wander to things he really doesn't want to think about, like his mother. He might just break if he does. The staff at the orphanage are nice, he supposes, though a few of them are clearly only being nice when in front of a police officer. He suspects that once he's gone, they'll drop the act. Maybe if he keeps his eyes and head down, their gazes will pass over him like most people's do. He hunches in on himself as the officer finally leaves, leaving him alone in the wolf's den. Come on, Izuku. I'll show you where you'll be staying, a younger staff member says, a woman with blonde hair and eyes similar to a snake's, with slit pupils and a bright yellow coloring. He suspects she has a similar quirk, maybe a venom aspect or scales hidden under her clothes. It's hard to tell, since she wears long sleeves and doesn't open her mouth wide enough to show folding fangs. You're mumbling, she says, but Izuku can't really bring himself to care. He just shrugs as he's led down a hallway. She eyes him warily before looking ahead, brows furrowed. You might want to drop that habit. It's weird. I know, Izuku says quietly, eyes down. The woman opens a door to the left and reveals a room with multiple bunk beds. There's only one kid inside at the moment, a boy a year or two younger than him with a bat mutation. He seems to be asleep, his wings wrapped tightly around himself as he snores quietly. You'll be sharing with 3 others. Keep quiet, don't start any fights, and don't leave your room except for meals or when given permission. Breakfast is at 6 o'clock, lunch at 12 o'clock, and dinner 18. If you're late, you don't get to eat, she says, before pointing to one of the beds. That one's yours. Bedtime is 2000 hours, if you're found awake during room checks you'll be punished. Got it. Izuku nodded silently and stepped into the room, wincing as the door slammed shut behind him. At least the other boy wasn't woken up. Must be a deep sleeper. Home sweet home, he thought sullenly, a shiver running through his body. He wanted to go home. Only a few days later, he found himself back on a rooftop, though this time he wasn't training. Instead he had his face buried in his arms, shoulders shaking as he held back tears. It didn't matter that there was no one around to see them, he couldn't cry. Pray you'll get a quirk in the next life and take a swan dive off the roof. It's not realistic. I'm so sorry, Izuku. Why should he bother anymore? His dreams were crushed, his mother was dead, and he was nothing but a quirkless Deku. He was a coward and a freak. Maybe if he'd had a quirk, if he'd been faster, he could have saved his mother. He could see others looking at him in admiration instead of hatred. He could have heard All Might praise him and tell him that, yes, he could be a hero. Izuku stood up suddenly and wiped his eyes furiously, fists clenched. He took a few steps forward towards the edge of the roof and stopped at the very edge, staring down until vertigo made him shake his head and look up and forward. Was it all worth it? That was dumb, but admirable. I hope to see you in my class. His mom, cupping his cheek, eyes scrunched as she laughed softly. My hero. Tears rose and fell, running down his cheeks in steady rivulets. He sniffled and sobbed quietly, holding his face in his hands. He couldn't be a hero. He couldn't even save himself. Izuku leaned forward as he dropped his hands, eyes slipping shut. He was scared, but it would be over soon. Despite his heart trying to beat its way out of his rib cage, he wouldn't back down. A sharp pain in his chest made him gasp, eyes flying open as he clutched the front of his shirt. It was too late, though, for he was already falling. Izuku screamed, both in terror and in pain as his whole body lit up, each nerve firing sporadically. His legs, arms, spine, his head. It all hurt so much. Faintly, he felt something wrap around him, holding fast as he reached the end of its length, just a few feet from the ground. He was lowered down and released, though the pain refused to subside. He was crying still, his eyes squeezed shut as he thrashed to and fro, scraping his skin on the asphalt beneath him. Someone was calling his name, too far away to identify properly. Mom dash, he gasped, crying out as his back arched painfully. Make it stop. Mom, please dash. Izuku went limp a few moments later, drenched in sweat and still twitching in silent agony. His savior hovered above him, hand to his ear as he called in for assistance. If he'd arrived even a second later, Eraserhead would have been too late. Hang in there, kid, he urged, rolling the boy onto his side as his ears and nose started to bleed. You're gonna be okay. Quirk awakening. A 1 in a million chance for the average person, but for someone quirkless? Practically unheard of. It was caused by times of extreme stress, whether that be physical, mental, or emotional. It could be brought on by great revelations of oneself or a horrific injury, so long as it was a great enough trigger. It seemed the series of unfortunate events that was Midoriya Izuku had been enough to force an entire evolution upon the boy, though not without repercussions. He was in the hospital for one thing, a fever raging through his body like a tsunami. The change itself wasn't a quick one, seeing as it wasn't a mental block or simple step up into higher ability, but a whole physical transformation. Aizawa stared at the boy where he lay in the hospital bed, looking even smaller than he already was. His face was flushed and he was surrounded by ice packs to try and keep his temperature down, his body so hot it was a few degrees away from steaming. His ears were morphing and shifting position, growing longer and longer as the hours passed. They, being mostly skin and cartilage, grew quickly, the fastest of his attributes to do so. His legs, though, were a different story. The bones were lengthening and his ligaments stretching to accommodate them, as well as the entire musculature of his lower body. His spine was shifting around too, making the doctors concerned about his spinal cord as it lengthened, the vertebrae shrinking in some areas and extending in others until he had a tail poking out of his hospital gown. Everything was bare as of right now, but Aizawa suspected that Izuku would start growing fur soon enough. It seemed that the mutation that had laid dormant in his cells was that of a rabbit, though what else the quirk had to offer was a mystery as of right then. His erasure hadn't even helped, which had solidified at least this aspect of the newfound quirk. What am I gonna do with you, kid? He asked no one in particular, running his hand through the bangs that had escaped his hair tie. You're just full of surprises. He couldn't help but pity the boy. His mother had just died, now this? What had the poor kid done to deserve such a thing? Aizawa wondered if his mother had asked the same kind of question before. Aizawa-san? The hero looked up to find Izuku's doctor standing in the doorway looking rather frazzled. At least he wasn't the only one feeling that way. Dr. Hinata, he greeted, standing up. Any news? The doctor stepped inside and eyed Izuku's monitors for a moment, worrying a lip between his teeth. He sighed and nodded, gesturing for Aizawa to sit back down. Izuku is stabilizing. His quirk is coming in as well as we could have hoped, but there are some complications. If it had come in as a child, he'd be fine, but since he's older, there are a few things. For one, quite a few muscles have torn during the transformation, and some of his joints dislocated. His immune system has been on the fritz, too, though we have some theories as to why, Dr. Hinata says, flipping through his chart. His appendix, gallbladder, and other vestigial organs are being ruthlessly attacked by his own body. We'll have to do surgery to remove them and start him on immune suppression drugs in order to keep him from accidentally attacking other parts of his body. We can only hypothesize at this point, but we think he's going through what is essentially rapid evolution. His immune system is boosting itself and he seems to have quite the healing factor, which might be aiding him right now. Aizawa was quiet as he absorbed the information, brows furrowed as he glanced at the greenette laying before him. Will he be okay? Again, theoretically, Dr. Hinata said. There have been so few cases that we really can't predict the behavior of the developing quirk. But from what we've seen so far, yes, he'll make it through. Nodding, the hero stood up and crossed his arms, stepping towards the door. Good. Proceed with the surgery and treatments. I need to make a call. He headed out into the hallway and pulled out his phone, his hands shaking. He pressed on his first contact and held the device to his ear, staring straight ahead. Show. Finally, how's the listener, came the worried voice of his husband. It's complicated, Aizawa said, staring down at his boots. His quirk manifested. Or awakened, something like that. I didn't even know that was possible. Neither did I, till now, Aizawa said, rubbing the bridge of his nose. There was a soft sigh on the other end, before Aizawa heard a door open and close. He perked up, brows furrowed, as he heard a car door slam. Hisashi? You're not headed here, are you? He asked. Are you kidding? Of course I am. You need me, but the kitty does too, the other scoffed. I'm on my way right now. I'll get you a coffee. Any protests died down at the offer of his favorite beverage. He simply sighed and hung his head, shaking it gently. You're the worst. I'm the best, he corrected. I'll see you soon, hun. Aizawa just hummed and pulled the phone away as the call ended. What would he do without his annoying, blonde, mess of a husband? He turned back towards Izuku's room and went back inside, sitting back down as he watched nurses and staff bustle about before rolling him away to prep him for surgery. He hoped things went smoothly, for the kid's sake. Surgery went well, according to the surgeon Aizawa talked to. It was a relief, especially when he was allowed into Izuku's room and saw that his flush had retreated from his face. His ears were already starting to grow a soft green fuzz, which was frankly adorable. He had to use his quirk on his husband before his overjoyed squealing blew out the windows, which put a bit of a damper on his mood. Sorry, Sho, Yamada said, putting on his best puppy eyes. You forgive me, don't you? His ears are just so cute. I couldn't resist. Aizawa sighed and rubbed his nose again, shaking his head. You know better than to let your quirk slip like that, you big blonde idiot. Ouch, Yamada said with a snicker. I'm wounded, Sho. You'd call your own husband an idiot? If he was being one, yes, Aizawa grumbled. It took at least a dozen kisses and a cup of coffee for Aizawa to relent and grant his forgiveness, to which Hisashi squealed even more in excitement, albeit without his quirk this time. An hour or so later, Izuku began to stir, slowly rousing from his slumber. His ears twitched, much to Yamada's delight, and his eyes peeled open, blinking blearily. He mumbled, squinting against the bright lights above him. Was he dead? Not dead. Izuku turned his head to see Eraserhead sitting next to someone else, a blonde with a short mustache and green eyes. Wait a minute, he knew that mustache. Present Mike, he rasped, throat parched. Why are you here? Yamada quickly pushed a paper cup into his hand, coaxing him to drink slowly before answering any questions despite obviously wanting to. He bit his lip instead, forcing himself to stay quiet until Izuku was ready. What happened? Izuku finally asked, throat no longer so dry. His mouth opened, closed, opened again, but Yamada couldn't speak, so Aizawa took over. He stood up and headed to the bathroom, pulling a hand mirror from a drawer to bring over to Izuku. The boy took it with a look of confusion directed to the both of them, but their expressions revealed nothing, so he takes a look. Are those, he asked faintly, eyes wide as he took in the sight of himself. Ears, Aizawa confirmed, mouth drawn into a flat line. Your quirk. All Izuku could hear was static as he stared into the mirror, eyes wide and breath hitching. His quirk? No, that was impossible. He had the toe joint to prove it and everything. It's real, kiddo, Yamada said, catching his mumbling thanks to his proficient lip reading. Izuku felt angry. His quirk? Did that mean his whole life was a lie, or was this some kind of sick joke the universe decided to prank him with? Why had it shown up now, and not when his mother needed him? When he needed it? He couldn't stop fresh tears from rolling down his face, nor his arm as he threw the mirror as hard as he could with a scream of rage. It shattered against the wall, breaking into a million tiny pieces before falling to the floor. Izuku! Yamada shouted in alarm, standing up, only to be pushed back down by his husband. Izuku, Aizawa repeated, expressing calm as he walked towards the bed, reaching out to grasp Izuku's hands and hold them tight before he could hurt himself. "I need you to breathe, kid. In, then out." Izuku sobbed quietly but did as told, eyes closed as he took great heaving breaths before letting it out in a quick whoosh of air. His crying made it hard, but with Aizawa's guidance he managed to keep his breathing under control despite the tears that continued to roll down his face. "What are you thinking?" Aizawa asked, voice steady as he moved his hands to set them on Izuku's shoulders instead. He sniffled and gathered himself before answering, finally looking up to meet the hero's eyes. "Why didn't it come sooner? Why didn't it come when everyone hated me for being quirkless? Why didn't it come when my mom needed me?" Finally he's drawn into a hug, one that held him so tight his breath was nearly taken away. His arms came up to hold Aizawa tightly, clutching his costume as he wailed and cried, grieving for what he could have had and screaming his anger and frustration into the older's capture scarf. A second pair of arms wrapped around him, securing him on both sides and holding him together as he broke apart. It made him miss his mom all the more. "I don't know, kid," Aizawa said quietly into green hair. "It'll be okay. I promise." Him and Yamada held Izuku until he cried himself to sleep, his body still using up too much energy to stay awake for long. They laid him down and watched over him as he slept, vowing to make sure the child, their child, would never cry like that ever again. "Get up, problem child." Izuku looked up from his bed, meeting his foster father's eyes, before rolling back over and pulling the covers back over himself. "Go away." There was silence, which made him think that maybe Aizawa went away, before the blankets were suddenly ripped off of him. He squawked and scrambled to grab them back, only to find Aizawa there instead, eyes narrowed and arms crossed. "Get up." Aizawa isn't taking no for an answer anymore, and Izuku finally rolls out of bed, slowly standing upright on weak, wobbly legs. It had only been a week since Izuku was released from the hospital, 2 since he got his quirk, and 2.5 since his mother, since that day. Getting out of bed had been a challenge, let alone trying to do the exercises a quirkologist had recommended he do to get used to his new body. If Izuku had it his way, he'd have never gotten up at all, which was why Aizawa was taking things into his own hands. "We're going out," he said, tossing a fresh change of clothes at Izuku and turning around before he could reply. "Get dressed. If you're not in the living room in 10 minutes, I'm dragging you out in what you're wearing." Izuku only stared as he left, eyes wide, before he snapped back to himself. Quickly, he shoved his arms and legs into his shirt and pants before stumbling into the living room fighting his way into a hoodie. He didn't bother with shoes, seeing as even custom ones made his fur feel funny. Aizawa and Yamada had gotten a small foot bath at the front door for him instead. "Where are we going?" he asked, finally pushing his head through the neck hole. "We're going to start your training," Aizawa answered, tossing an apple at him. Izuku very nearly dropped it, absolutely flabbergasted. "Training? What training? For what?" "For UA. Unless you think you're just going to quit," Aizawa said, staring at Izuku until he started to squirm. Izuku stared down at the ground, clutching the apple in his hands as he tried to figure out how to tell Aizawa that he did want to quit, that even with a quirk, he wasn't cut out to be a hero. He opened his mouth, closed it, and shrunk in on himself, his long ears lowering against his head. "Izuku. I've only known you for a short time and I know you're not a quitter," Aizawa said quietly. "Don't give up. Not now, not when your mother would be so sad to see you do so." He knew it to be the truth, too. Izuku could almost see her lower lip wobbling, the first sign of tears before the waterworks actually began. He couldn't make his mom cry, alive or not. "It feels like cheating," he mumbled instead, reaching up to wipe at his wet eyes. Aizawa set a hand on his shoulder and squeezed gently, crouching down to meet the boy's eyes. Thanks to his new legs, he's taller, so his knees don't have to bend as much, which he was grateful for. Still, the boy is small, smaller than most are at his age. "Izuku. A quirk is a tool," he said, nudging Izuku's chin up to meet his eyes. "You are not your quirk. Do you think my quirk is useful in a fight against a mutant? Against a guy with a gun? What about Endeavor's quirk when he's fighting a water villain? In those situations, we're quirkless too. We need to figure out a different angle and you've already got a head start. You've been thinking in different angles your whole life. You are not your quirk, Izuku, but you are smart, kind, and brave. That's what makes a hero, not how high they can jump or how far they can run." The tears started falling for real and it's all Izuku could do to nod and hold back his sobs, though he couldn't stop his shoulders from shaking. Aizawa squeezed his shoulder again and stood straight, bringing a fist up near his chest. "Now are you going to be a hero?" he asked, sounding more intense than he ever had before. Izuku's breath hitched and he nodded wildly, bringing his own fist up and pumping it hard. "Yes. I will be a hero. Aizawa nodded in approval and headed for the door, not slowing down even as Izuku struggled to keep his legs steady under him. He didn't stop when he picked the stairs rather than the elevator, nor when he picked the long way to get to the nearby park. Izuku tripped, fell, and struggled, but he always got back up, always ran to catch up, and refused to give up. He would be a hero, quirk or no quirk. Izuku bent down and hoisted a microwave up onto his shoulder, huffing and puffing as he ran across the beach to deliver it to the truck Aizawa sat on top of, arms crossed and expression stern. Beside him on the ground was Yamada wearing a crop top and shorts, arms raised as he cheered non-stop for him, even waving a banner around above his head. "You can do it, Izuku," he shouted, his voice amplified by his quirk. "I believe in you." Yeah. Izuku thought his face couldn't get any more flushed thanks to his training, but lo and behold, Yamada's endless support drew an extra pint of blood up to his face, turning it a beet red. He ducked his head as he set the microwave in the truck bed, the last item of the day. "Good job, kiddo," Yamada praised, ruffling his sweaty hair and ignoring the greenette's protests. Aizawa hopped down and surveyed the beach with a critical eye, pausing as he noticed Izuku watching him, waiting for his approval. After a moment he turned and gave him a nod, watching the boy sigh in relief, a small amount of pride in himself welling up in the form of a tiny smile. Those had gotten so rare these days, making each one all the more precious. "You're getting there, Izuku," he said, standing beside him to look over the dump that Dagoba Beach had become, though much better looking since Izuku had started cleaning it up. 5 more months before the entrance exam. I think you'll be done by that point." Izuku nodded and sat down heavily on the ground, happily accepting a water bottle offered by Yamada. He drank deeply, draining half the thing before forcing himself to stop and take a few deep breaths instead. Then he downed the rest and tossed the bottle into the back of the truck, since they were headed to the actual dump anyway. "I feel stronger," he said quietly, staring down at his hands and flexing them to feel the calluses he'd built stretch and bend. His claws poked out of his nail beds too, short and black but no less sharp. He might not have the talons of a hawk or anything, but his claws could do some serious damage if he needed them to, proven by the sheet metal he'd torn through earlier as instructed by Aizawa. "You are stronger," Aizawa said, ruffling Izuku's hair too but wincing as his hand came away wet. "And sweatier. I think a shower is needed." Yamada laughed at them despite having done the same thing earlier, his grin massive as he rounded the car to climb into the driver's seat. They'd head to the dump, drop off their haul, and then head home to shower and order dinner. "Aizawa?" The man in question turned around to find Izuku standing at the edge of the retaining wall overlooking the beach, his gaze turned towards the sea. He stared for a moment, analyzing Izuku's form and spotting many changes, some less obvious than others. He stood steadier than before, his chin up, eyes raised, and his hands loose and relaxed. He'd grown into his new body, finally gotten used to it, and it showed. Not only that, though. Confidence had been something he'd shied away from, thinking it to be arrogance, but now that he knew the difference he was slowly growing used to wearing it comfortably. It was a good look on the kid. Finally he turned around, facing Aizawa and smiling the brightest he had since that fateful day. "Thank you." He'd never admit it, but his heart melted in his chest, his expression softening as he nodded gently. "Always, kid." Izuku passed him to climb into the truck, leaving him standing for a moment longer. He shook his head and followed, exasperated as he realized yet another kid with chubby cheeks, wild hair, and adorable freckles had wormed his way into his heart. Oboro would have loved him. The day of the entrance exam had arrived. Izuku stared up at UA with awe, his heart pounding away in his chest. It was even bigger up close, larger than any pictures or news channels had made it seem. He swallowed and adjusted his bag on his shoulder, hardening his resolve as he took a determined step forward, and tripped. Arms flailing, he let out an embarrassing squeak as the ground rushed up to meet him, faster than he could get his hands under him. Just as he closed his eyes, a hand met his back, stopping his descent and preventing him from breaking his nose before he even set foot on UA grounds. "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I would have asked if you were okay with me using my quirk on you, but you were falling so fast." Izuku's head whipped up, sending his ears flopping backwards, gaping at the girl who'd saved him. He watched her press her fingers together and yelped as he fell again, though a much shorter distance. He pushed himself up and dusted himself off, looking up in amazement. "That was so cool," he said, eyes sparkling as he bounced from foot to foot. "What's your quirk?" Wait, it must be gravity-based, right? A 5-point touch emitter?" "Why yeah. You're right," the girl said, shocked. Izuku flushed and ducked his head, rubbing his neck bashfully. Sorry, I just really like quirks. I'm Midoriya Izuku." "What's your name?" "Uraraka Achiko," she says, gathering herself up and sticking out a hand. "It's really nice to meet you. Midoriya." What course are you going for? Izuku beamed and took her hand, shaking it before starting to head for the main building. The H-Hero course. What about you? Same. Uraraka said, bringing her hands up near her cheeks in excitement. I hope we're in the same class. It'd be nice to know someone before the first day. Izuku swallowed and nodded, thinking of a certain blonde Pomeranian. And me too. Sorry, I gotta run. My exam hall is all the way across campus. I'll see you later? Uraraka nodded and quickly grabbed a pen from her pocket, brows furrowed in determination. She grabbed his hand and wrote something across it before pointing at it firmly. This is my number, please save it. Even if we don't get in, or one of us does and the other doesn't, I'd love to be friends. You seem really nice. Izuku couldn't wipe the smile off his face as he nodded and waved before dashing down the hallway, his tail wagging in excitement. His first friend. He couldn't wait to put her number into his phone, but he couldn't text and run, so he'd do so between the written exam and the interviews. He arrived shortly and slipped inside, making his way to his designated seat. Thanks to his foster parents enrolling him in online school, he wasn't placed in the row Aldra was seated at and was able to locate Bakugo without being spotted himself. He half hoped the boy didn't get in so he wouldn't ever have to see him again, but his other half wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt, even now. For now he'd just ignore the issue and face things as they came. Hopefully that wouldn't come to bite him in the butt. Izuku sat down next to a boy with purple hair, shifting impatiently in his seat as he watched the clock in the corner of the room count down. He didn't even notice his leg bouncing until his neighbor cleared his throat, drawing his attention to him. Could you stop fidgeting so much? I'm trying to nap before the exam, the boy drawled, blinking slowly. He was about to apologize before two things hit him at once. First, his voice, which was like molten honey to his ears, and second, that he was trying to sleep. He said intelligently, though at least his feet were still. Thanks, his seatmate said, turning away and closing his eyes again, shifting to get comfortable. Izuku watched him for a moment, curious, before yanking his gaze away. It was weird to stare at people while they slept. So he kept his gaze forward and discreetly nudged his heel against the purplet's shoe once the teacher, Ectoplasm, started sending clones around to hand out exam packets as he explained the rules. No talking, no eating, no cheating, no quirks, and finish the exam in the 3-hour time limit. There was an offer for an extra hour's time that a few students meekly took up, including a boy with bright yellow hair with a black lightning bolt through it. Not hard to guess what quirk he had. Excuse me. Are bathroom breaks and water allowed? A student with bright orange hair asked. Of course, just alert one of my clones if you need to be excused, Ectoplasm said, which was a relief. Izuku needed to drink a lot of water to process his new vegetarian diet, though he wondered if he'd be allowed to snack during the exam. He got hungry quickly too. He was distracted quickly by the packet being slid in front of him, though. This was it. If he aced this test, he'd be guaranteed a spot in the general course even if he didn't make the practical exam. He'd studied hard, learned the subjects, and felt confident in his abilities, though the usual nervousness threatened to rear its ugly head. He didn't have time for that, though. Begin. Like a shot had been fired at a race, everyone jerked to life, tearing off the plastic of their packets before pressing pencils to paper. Izuku started with what he was familiar with, aside from his name and the date. Math was easy, numbers had always come to him like a duck to water. The science subjects weren't too difficult either, and Yamada's English lessons paid off when it came to the language part of the exam. The other subjects weren't his strongest and the art essay gave him some difficulty, but he didn't think he'd outright messed up on any of them, so he felt safe to dot his last PRD and begin going over everything again. Aside from some rushed answers, he didn't think he could improve on anything, so he looked up to check the time to see if he could triple-check his work. It had been an hour and a half. Only half the time and he was finished before anyone else. He even looked around to see if there were any others finishing up and only saw furrowed brows and hunched backs. Izuku looked back down and swallowed, going over the packet a third, then a fourth time, before he couldn't stall any longer. He raised his hand. He braced himself for the stares, the whispers, but when he opened his eyes again all he saw was Ectoplasm walking towards him. He handed over his packet and waited to be dismissed, watching as the hero flipped through the pages before nodding once. Nice job, he whispered. There's a break room across the hall with snacks and things, go ahead and wait there until you need to head to your interview. Izuku breathed out a sigh of relief and stood, wincing when finally he received a few looks. Nothing bad, mostly some curious stares or dismayed glances before the students redoubled their efforts. He hoped they did well, he felt bad for anyone who looked like that. He headed for the break room and picked out a plate of veggies to snack on, immediately digging in before pulling out his phone. Midoriya, hey, it's Midoriya, from earlier. I hope your exam goes well, smiley face. He hoped that didn't sound awkward and focused back on his food, his foot beginning to bounce again. He had to refuel before the interviews, then again before the practical. Izuku desperately hoped all his training would be enough. He really wanted to be a hero. Midnight had been a pleasant surprise. Since Aizawa and Yamada were her best friends, he saw her a lot, but hadn't known she'd been teaching at UA. It helped him feel more comfortable and relaxed, her gentle teasing familiar enough that he didn't flub his answers like he worried he would. She even gave him a hug afterwards, which was very appreciated. Go eat your lunch. Zashi and Shosho should be in the teacher's break room, though I'm sure no one would mind if you went and joined them, she said, before giving him directions. Which was why he wasn't sure how he ended up here, standing in front of the purple-haired boy from earlier, his ears pinned and teeth bared. Leave him alone, he shouted, clenching his fists as the group of middle schoolers in front of him merely laughed. What are you gonna do about it, bunny? One taunted, flexing his hands that looked like eagle talons. Don't you know birds eat rabbits? He's a villain, anyway. I don't know why you'd care about a freak like him, a girl scoffed, her quirk taking the form of spikes littering her skin like a hedgehog's quills. Izuku shook his head, growing more and more agitated. This was the exact same sheet he dealt with at Aldera, just with the word quirkless replaced with villain. People really did just find excuses to hate each other, didn't they? I'm sorry, but that's FING stupid, he said bluntly, shocking the group into silence. What makes him a villain, exactly? He's just another student taking the exams. He's got a villain's quirk, came the predictable protest. Oh, really? I don't see him robbing a bank with it, Izuku snarked, eyes narrowed. Honestly, it seems like you're the villains right now, ganging up on some innocent kid. They sputtered and protested, puffing up like a bunch of peacocks before someone cleared their throat behind them. All of them, Izuku and the purple-haired kid included, snapped their heads around to see Nezu himself standing in front of them, a serene smile on his face. Hello. Am I a mouse? A dog? A bear? It doesn't matter, because I am the principal of UA, he said cheerfully. And you children are in a lot of trouble. Oh, not you, Midoriya-kun, or you, Shinsu-kun, though I'd like you to come to my office with your lunches anyway. Izuku blinked and glanced at the boy, Shinso, apparently, who was wearing a similarly stunned expression. He met Izuku's gaze and the greenette immediately looked away, hoping his blush wasn't too obvious. Instead he grabbed his backpack off the ground and pulled it back over his shoulders before following the principal, along with the group of bullies and Shinso. You didn't have to do that, Shinso said, walking up beside Izuku. Izuku sent him a puzzled expression, before he suddenly jerked, eyes widening. Sorry, I'm so sorry. It just looked like you needed help, I am so sorry. What? Shinso asked, taken aback. What are you talking about? I was just gonna say thank you. You know, for standing up for me. Now it's Izuku's turn to be taken aback. The two of them stared at each other for a moment before looking away, both puzzled by the other's behavior, though for wildly different reasons. They didn't speak again until they reached Nezu's office, at which they're gestured into a side room while the bullies are dealt with. Izuku sat down and opened his bag, pulling out his bento as he listened to the conversation in the next room. He couldn't hide his grin as the group was kicked off of UA property and banned from taking the exam and applying to the school. Good riddance. What are they saying? Shinso asked, his own lunch in his hands, though it's simply a takeout container, probably picked up before school. Jumping slightly, Izuku berated himself for forgetting that with his quirk came enhanced senses. Not everyone could hear through walls, after all. They just got kicked off campus, he related. Nezu banned them from applying to UA ever again. They both went quiet, eating quietly as they mulled it over. It's obvious Shinso wasn't used to being defended, which made Izuku sad. No one should have to suffer like he did. He was distracted by his phone buzzing, though. Uraraka, I think it did? There was this one question that really stumped me and made me nervous about a few others, but I'm sure I passed the written. The interview went great. I got present mic, who'd you get? Midoriya stuffed his cucumber sandwich into his mouth and held it there as he texted, his ears perked forward towards his phone. Midoriya, I'm sure you did great. I got Midnight, she was super nice. Uraraka, lucky, I love Midnight, she's a huge inspiration for me. Your sandwich is falling. Izuku squeaked, something he was beginning to think was a rabbit trait, and quickly put his sandwich down before it fell apart, sheepishly pushing the cucumbers back between the bread. He muttered his thanks and moved on to his zucchini muffins instead, trying not to squirm against the intense gaze he could feel burning into the side of his head. So, does my knight in shining armor have a name? Shinso asked, picking up a piece of shrimp with his chopsticks. Izuku nearly choked and had to cough into a napkin, absolutely mortified. At least the guy didn't seem to mind. In fact, he seemed to almost be smiling, as if he thought that was funny. Midoriya Izuku, he managed to get out, turning to the other. You? Shinso Hitoshi, came the reply. What course are you applying to, SH Shinsukuin? Izuku asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Hero course. Right on the nose. Izuku smiled brightly, bringing a fist up in offering. Me too. I am gonna try my best and hope for the best, too. Shinso stared at him for a moment, wondering how such a small boy could hold so much optimism. He bumped their knuckles together and huffed softly, nodding in agreement. Izuku didn't mind, since most days Aizawa wasn't very vocal either, and he and Yamada often communicated with JSL anyway when the latter forgot to charge his hearing aids. Izuku was even learning it. Shinsukuin, Midoriya-kun. Please return to my office, I'd like to speak with you both. They both jumped at the sudden voice over the intercom before scrambling to put their things away in their bags. They glanced at each other, wondering if the other had an idea for why they were being called, only to shrug and head back to Nedzu's office. I'm glad you two are alright, but I wish an event like that hadn't happened in the first place, Nedzu said upon their arrival, his trademark smile absent from his face. A frown took its place, which somehow looked all the more sinister. He shook his head though and offered them a sharp-toothed grin, earning a shudder from Izuku and an uncomfortable shift from Shinso. You won't be bothered by them again, though you two knew that already. They've been banned from UA's grounds and I've put in an alert to other hero schools in case they try something there, too, he explained, before shifting forward and tapping at his keyboard. But that's not all I wanted to talk about. I took a look at your exams. I know I'm not supposed to tell you your scores, but I'm the principal. I do what I want. Izuku blinked and shifted forward in his seat, curious to know how he did, but also why Nedzu wanted to know. Midoriya-kun, you scored the highest on the written exam, the highest in quite a few years. Shinsukuin, you also did incredibly well, earning yourself 4th overall, he said, his smile turning more genuine and almost proud. Which brings me to my first question. Izuku and Shinso were stunned, their eyes wide and Shinsu's mouth having dropped open at some point. He snapped it shut and shook his head, falling back in his seat. He didn't seem to believe it. There are 3 students who have caught my eye this year based on test results, you both and one other. I want to present an offer to you both, one that you do not have to accept. Will you be my personal students? It has been quite a few years since I took on pupils of my own, but I see potential in you all that I'd be a fool not to try and nurture, Nedzu said, folding his hands over his desk. Do not answer right now. Please, think more about my offer, discuss this with your parents, and tell me your response via email. Now it was Izuku's turn to gape and fall back, while Shinso looked like someone had told him he'd won $1 million. They were both staring at Nedzu, too stunned to do anything but take the small business cards he offered and shuffle off out the door. A girl outside stared at them for a moment, at their aghast expressions, before swallowing nervously and walking through the door, her long black ponytail swinging behind her. Am I dreaming? Shinso asked faintly, moving to lean against the nearby wall before he passed out. Izuku shook his head, because that had just happened. He whipped out his phone to call Aizawa, bouncing from foot to foot as he waited for him to pick up. Problem child? Hi, Nedzu just asked me to be his personal student, he squeaked, clutching his phone tightly. He what? Once he had told his foster parents about Nedzu's offer, Izuku left Shinso with a shy wave and a smile as he headed for his next exam. The practical loomed over him ominously, breathing down his neck with every step taken to his assigned lecture hall. He swallowed and gave himself a full-bodied shake, having learned that it was a great way to relieve his stress. He felt the majority of it melt away, allowing him a few minutes to breathe as he lingered in the hallway, though it wasn't long before his nerves returned. Izuku headed inside and lingered in the doorway for a moment, looking around for anyone familiar. He spotted Uraraka's brown hair and perked up, making his way over to her swiftly. He poked her on the shoulder and squeaked as she threw her arms around him, surprised by the action. Midoriya. I'm so glad we're in the same practical. I'm so nervous, it's a relief to know I'm not alone, she said, laughing anxiously. Midoriya and her sat down next to one another, chatting quietly about how they thought their written exams went, though he didn't share his meeting with the principal. He didn't want to accidentally tell anyone only for it to have been a secret the whole time. Though Nedzu wasn't the type to overlook things like that, so maybe it was okay? Before he could think about it more, Present Mike entered the room, greeting all the students with an enthusiastic wave. Good afternoon everybody. Welcome to today's show here at UA. Everybody say, hey, hey. Izuku shouted happily, only to realize after a few moments of silence that literally no one else had shouted back. Uraraka quickly followed his lead with a shout of her own, not wanting him to be embarrassed by himself. He sank into his seat as nearly everyone stared at them, though Present Mike thankfully redirected their attention back at him. Thanks, listeners. Now, I'm here to explain the practical exam. Yeah. Present Mike was surprisingly thorough, explained the robot's point system in a way almost everyone understood, and answered any and all questions everyone had, though Izuku obviously wasn't all that surprised. Everyone thought the guy was an airhead, but Izuku knew him personally. He was an English teacher after all and spoke the language fluently, not to mention he was also fluent in JSL and had a degree in language studies. He was no joke. Izuku headed out after instructions were given, making for the boys' locker room. He stuffed his bag into a locker, set a code, and quickly got changed in a stall once one was available. Then he headed outside and did his stretches. Aizawa would kill him if he forgot, so he made sure to go through every stretch he could. Think of until he felt less like a person and more like a rubber band. He noticed a couple others doing the same, some outright copying him, but he didn't mind. He'd hate for anyone to pull a muscle and fail for such a stupid reason. Present Mike gathered everyone up outside Ground Gamma, where the practical would actually be taking place. Izuku leapt from foot to foot, eyes on the door as Present Mike hyped everyone up, the crowd growing louder and louder in their excitement. Well, that's it, folks. Go! Izuku was off like a shot, leaping over the crowd before taking off into the city without hesitation. Aizawa didn't do countdowns and neither did Present Mike. It was as he was currently explaining. What are you waiting for? Villains don't count you down before a fight. He heard the crowd behind him, wincing as people trampled over each other. He was glad he got away from the main group for that reason, but also because of the mob of robots set up along the main street. He flexed his fingers and unsheathed his claws, eyes narrowing as he focused up. He was suddenly hyper-aware of where he put his feet, analyzed any weak spots he could see, and put his new quirk to good use. His foot slammed into a robot's head, knocking it clean off and sending it flying into another robot's face. He took out 3 one-pointers in only a few seconds before moving on to a duo of 2-pointers. With them he went for their armpits, using his small size to duck under their arms so he could tear into the exposed wiring and rendering their guns useless. Then he slashed at their necks, destroying their connection to their power supply in one fell swoop. 6 points, but not nearly enough to pass, so he leapt off of one of the 2-pointers and kept running, intent on hunting down more robots to dismantle. Izuku used every ounce of his training to his advantage. His newfound sense of smell and hearing were useful, since the robots smelled so heavily of machine oil it was easy to locate them, and the whirring of their mechanics helped him pinpoint their exact position. From there it was a matter of targeting their vulnerable necks and underarms, or kicking their heads clean off. His feet were starting to bruise, though, so he stuck to using his claws until he could get support gear to protect his feet. With 39 points, he was feeling confident as he kangaroo kicked a 1-pointer in the chest, sending it flying down the road in a heap of metal. He counted 40 and went to jump up off the street and onto a building, where a 3-pointer was standing, only for the ground to begin to shake beneath him. He wobbled and fell over, struggling to get his feet under him as a shadow crossed over him. Izuku's head whipped up and he gasped, eyes wide as he finally caught sight of the final type of robot. The 0-pointer. It was massive. Larger than the skyscrapers that made up the faux cityscape, with military green paint and a massive gun for a head. It took a step forward and shoved its shoulder into a building, sending debris falling down across the block. He darted away, ears pinned to his head as he lowered himself to all fours in order to get the speed he needed to run away. Help. His ears picked up the weakly spoken words, his feet coming to a complete stop and sending him tumbling head over heel. He turned once he'd stopped and looked back down the road, eyes wide. Uraraka. She was pinned beneath a slab of concrete, a trickle of blood running down her face. In an instant he was running again, though this time towards her. Uraraka-chan, he shouted, coming to a stop in front of her. Are you okay? Can you move? Weakly, she shook her head, one pupil larger than the other. A concussion. My ankle's pinned, I think it's broken, she said, before looking behind him with wide eyes. You need to run. The 0-pointers headed our way. Izuku whipped around and gulped, watching it take a step towards them. He looked at Uraraka, then to the 0-pointed, then back at the girl. He clenched his fists and steeled himself, before leaping upwards and launching himself off the side of a nearby building. He jumped onto the robot's arm before standing up and waving his arms, trying to get its attention. Hey! Hey ugly! He shouted, wincing at himself. Look over here! It turned its head to him, joints creaking, and raised its other hand before bringing it down faster than he expected. He just barely leapt out of the way and onto its shoulder, just in time for the robot to hit itself hard enough to dent its outer casing. He covered his ears at the resulting shriek of metal on metal, gritting his teeth as he ran up towards the robot's neck. There were so many wires, many of them encased in thick rubber, protecting themselves from his claws. So that was a no-go, but the test was about to end, right? 30 seconds. Just 30 seconds, then, and he and Uraraka would be picked up by the medbots. Izuku jumped up onto the robot's head and crawled in front of its camera, eyes narrowed as he grabbed a hold of the edges and brought his legs back. He slammed his feet into the lens and broke it, rendering the robot blind. Then he leapt directly upwards as it punched itself in the face, destroying it and sending itself reeling backwards. Izuku whooped in victory, floating at the apex of his jump for a moment, before flailing his arms and legs as he began to fall. Right, that was a thing. He couldn't help but scream as he plummeted, his heart pounding so fast in his chest he could feel himself becoming lightheaded. He closed his eyes and covered his face as the ground raced up towards him, praying that he'd live to see his test results. A hand slapped him across the face, his descent halting so fast his limbs and head snapped downwards. He groaned, all of his joints and neck having gotten some serious whiplash in the process. At least he wasn't dead. He opened his eyes and saw Uraraka. With her hands raised, sweat beading her brow. She was surely experiencing quirk overuse, but she'd used the last of it to save him. Uraraka-chan. Thank you, he said, braced this time for when she released her quirk. Izuku caught himself and limped towards her, his shoulders and hips aching. He managed to lift up the top slab of concrete and uncovered her body, gently pulling her free and raising her leg up so it was above her head. And no problem, Midoriya-kun, she answered, eyes squeezed shut in discomfort. Thank you for saving me, I was so scared the zero-pointer was going to step on me. Izuku nodded in agreement, though she couldn't see him. He only moved when the medbots arrived, letting them set Uraraka on a board before slowly following after him to where Recovery Girl had set up a first aid station outside of Ground Gamma. He sat down in a chair and waited to be seen, absolutely exhausted. But he'd done it. He made it through the test with 40 points and only hoped it would be enough. All right, your turn, dearie, Recovery Girl said, finally approaching him. He perked up and nodded, happily giving her his hand as directed and voicing his consent before she used her quirk on him. Immediately his exhaustion increased tenfold, making him sag in his chair even as she pushed a handful of gummies into his palm and folded his fingers over them. I hope you have a ride home, mister, she tutade. Else I'll whack Yamada and Aizawa's shins until they have dents in them. Izuku blinked as she walked away, taken aback. She knew about him, about them. Did that mean the other teachers did too? That was almost a relief, he didn't want to have to keep their secret from everybody. Maybe that was a conversation to have when they got home. He made his way back to the locker rooms and got dressed, grabbing his things before heading to the teacher's lounge to meet up with his foster parents. He yawned as he knocked on the door, barely able to keep his eyes open. He jerked awake as the doorknob turned, looking up to see Midnight standing there, grinning. Auntie Nem, he greeted tiredly, accepting her comforting hug before making his way into the room. He made a beeline for Yamada, who welcomed him with open arms. The other teachers watched, some cooing, before a glare from Aizawa startled them into looking away and giving them a bit of privacy. Vlad King outright left, muttering something about needing to walk his fish. I'm so tired, Izuku complained, burying his face into Yamada's shoulder. Can we go home? Course, kiddo. We'll pick up dinner on the way, Yamada said, rubbing the base of his ears just how he liked. They packed up and said their goodbyes, with Yamada carrying Izuku while Aizawa got their bags. The teen didn't even make it to the car before he was asleep, Recovery Girl's quirk having drained him of any energy he might have had after the exam. It meant for a quiet trip home, but neither Yamada nor Aizawa minded, content to talk quietly in the front seat while Izuku dozed in the back. Dinner was picked up, eaten, and then Izuku was sent to bed afterwards to sleep off his recovery, too tired to recount anything that happened that day. They'd save the celebration for the next morning. Midoriya has added Shinso and Uraraka to the chat. Midoriya has renamed Uraraka to Beach Slap. Midoriya has renamed Shinso to E-Boy. Midoriya has renamed Midoriya to Fairy Godmother. E-Boy, I'm being attacked. Beach Slap, same. Fairy Godmother, sorry not sorry. Fairy Godmother, Eve gathered you here today cause I met you both yesterday, you seemed nice, and I need friends. E-Boy, God same. Beach Slap, well I'm happy to be your friend. Achiko Uraraka. Fairy Godmother, Midoriya Izuku. E-Boy, Shirnu Hitoshi. E-Boy, Shinso. Fairy Godmother, also I want to invite you guys over once we get our test results, I thought it'd be fun to open them together. E-Boy, oh. E-Boy, sure. I'll let my moms know. Fairy Godmother, DMN Shinso your mom let you have two moms? Beach slap, that sounds so much fun. I'll bring snacks, smiley face. E-boy, lol I can bring my consoles. Fairy godmother, and I'll provide dinner. Beach slap, sounds like a plan, I'll let you know if my parents say it's okay. E-boy, same. Fairy godmother, okay, talk to you later then. Beach slap, E-boy, and fairy godmother are now offline. Izuku set down his phone and beamed up at his foster parents, earning their nods of approval. With his plans solidified, he returned to the mound of menus in front of him, humming as he shuffled through them. Some were old and didn't have vegetarian options, so they were thrown away, while others he wasn't in the mood for. He had a nice little pile of options after a few minutes, as well as another pile of favorites he'd add them to once they'd figured out their orders. Tensei's almost here. He's bringing Tenya, is that okay? Namuri called from the other room, poking her head into the kitchen with her phone pressed against her ear. Aizawa flashed a thumbs up while Hisashi shouted his approval. Izuku hadn't met Tenya before, but if he was anything like his brother, he's sure he'd like him. After a few minutes they arrived with Tensei barging in the door with a bag in hand, eagerly wrapping Namuri up in a hug before accepting one from Hisashi too. With Aizawa he just nudged his shoulder, but the gesture was appreciated. Behind him came his brother, walking in a much more controlled manner, his expression stern but not unkind as he immediately spotted Izuku and made a beeline for him. "Greetings, Midoriya-kun," he said, chopping his hand up and down in a strange manner. "I'm Ida Tenya, Tensei's younger brother. Apologies for the unexpected addition." He proceeded to bow so low he nearly banged his head off the kitchen counter where Izuku was sitting. The teen waved his hands frantically, ears falling back as he panicked slightly. It's okay, Ida-kun. I don't mind, really. We were just discussing menus, do you want to take a look, he asked, pushing his pile closer. All the adults watched the two mingle, slowly relaxing when it seemed they were getting along. Izuku was still nervous and Tenya very tense, but there seemed to be an understanding between them, one only a pair of weirdos could have. Seeing as the quad had the exact same understanding, they'd recognized it instantly. Looks like Izuku's finally relaxed a bit, Tensei said, making his way into the living room with the others trailing behind. How's he doing? Better. Therapy's been helping a lot, so's his training, Shoyuta hummed, standing while the others sat down. Way better. He's been learning JSL for me, Hisashi gushed happily. There have been hurdles, definitely, but we're taking them as they come. He's such an awesome kid, we're lucky to have him. Shoyuta nodded in agreement as Namuri and Tensei grinned, their expressions genuine. They were happy for the couple. They discussed on and off having kids, but never took it seriously until now. Parenthood seemed to be good for them and they couldn't have a better child. Do you guys want to pick out what you want? Izuku asked, walking into the room with Tenya on his heels. We decided on Thai, I want the Genkyou one and Tenya's having the pad Thai. He set the menu in front of them and pulled one of his ears down to tug at it, a nervous habit he'd developed recently. Aizawa nudged him with his foot and glanced at his hand, reminding him to stop. He dropped his ear and let it flick back up, cheeks burning with embarrassment. Oh, I've been craving pad Thai, Namuri said, grabbing the menu right from Tensei's hand. I want spring rolls and tapioca pudding, too. Her, Tensei, and Yamada bickered over the menu while Aizawa brought up an app, sighing in the long-suffering way only he could. They were as annoying as the day he met them, but alas, he wouldn't trade them for anything. Izuku glanced at Tenya and shrugged before leading him away to his room, sighing in relief when he entered the soundproofed space. He loved his new family, but they were loud. Do you think I could have your number? He asked Tenya, digging out his phone from his pocket. I have a group chat with some others I met at the exam, I could introduce you? I hope you weren't texting during the exam, Tenya said, frowning. Izuku squeaked and shook his head wildly, ears flopping about. And no. Of course not. We met before and during the lunch break. Satisfied, Tenya handed over his phone, making Izuku relax. He hadn't upset him, that was good. He typed his phone number into the other's contacts and handed it back over, sighing softly. Making friends was so hard. Who knew there would be this much talking? So, how do you think you did? He asked, sitting down on his bed and gesturing to his desk chair in case Tenya wanted to take a seat too. I think I did well, Tenya said, sitting down and pushing his glasses up. I studied hard and trained even harder. My brother was very helpful and assisted me every step of the way. I couldn't be more grateful to him. He sounds awesome. Aizawa and Yamada have been like that for me, always encouraging me to do my best and showing me how to train my new quirk. Apparently they called Mirko for tips, which was super nice of them. Izuku said, smiling brightly. Tenya nodded, face still stern, though Izuku suspected that might be his resting face, but his eyes shining. How amazing. I've known them since I was a baby, but even I find myself surprised at how heroic they both are sometimes. You are lucky to have them as your foster parents." Izuku nodded in agreement, the conversation petering off into less emotionally driven topics. Favorite foods, current school assignments, anything and everything that came to mind. Tenya was subjected to one of Izuku's famous rambles when he brought up a problem he was having with his quirk, that being overheating easily. Have you tried lowering your output for higher stamina rather than speed? And not that you shouldn't stop training for speed. It's just that not a lot of people are fast, so you won't find yourself in many situations where reaching your maximum output is really necessary. Instead all you need to do is find a middle ground where you can still be fast, but you aren't overdoing it. Or alternatively, you can get support gear that cools down your engine so you can have them running higher for longer, he suggested, his brain running at a mile a minute. All the while his feet bounced erratically, so fast they were nearly a blur. Tenya mulled over the information, bringing a fist to his mouth in thought. It was a good idea, he'd never thought of using his engines to boost his overall performance rather than going for 100% all of the time. UA always touted their plus ultra slogan, but that was useless in a drawn-out fight. I shall bring it up with Tensei. Surely he can help me make a plan for training in such a way. Thank you, Midoriya. That was a wonderful piece of advice, Tenya said with a nod, pushing up his glasses. Izuku blushed, flustered by the compliment. He waved his hand, trying to brush it off before he imploded. It's nothing, really. But thank you. Tenya was about to protest before their names were called from the living room. Despite wanting to say more, Tenya stood up and led the way back to the adults with Izuku trailing behind. Food's here, Namuri said once they appeared, holding up 2 armfuls of takeout bags. Everyone sat down at the table and got to work passing out plates and containers, chatting away happily about the boys' performances while Izuku mostly observed. He couldn't remember ever eating with such a large gathering of people before, though he knew he had done so with Bakugu's family at some point. It had been so long ago, probably before he was diagnosed as quirkless. He dug into his food, oblivious to both the smile on his face and the fond glances from Aizawa. It was nice to see his kid so happy for once. About a week later, Izuku got his letter. He'd texted the group chat, plus Ida, who he'd invited to it soon after the celebration dinner, and received excited replies, with some having gotten their letters too. They'd agreed to meet up that weekend, with Ida agreeing to bring some drinks with him to accompany Uraraka's snacks. Ding dong. Izuku leapt up from his bed and rushed to the door, speeding back Yamada who'd stood up to answer it. He flung open the door to see Shinso and Ida standing there, both carrying bags holding their brought items. They had their letters in hand, Shinsu's slightly crumpled from holding it so tightly, while Ida's was practically pristine. Oh thank goodness, I was gonna explode if I had to wait another day, Izuku said, holding the door open to let them in. Shinso entered first, only to stop in the hallway to stare at Yamada and Aizawa. He turned right back around to Izuku, grabbing him by the shoulder with a fierce look on his face. You didn't tell me your parents were Eraserhead and Present Mike, he yelled, eyes wide. Izuku blinked and laughed, rubbing his head gently. I forgot? Sorry. Hello Yamada-san. Aizawa-san. Ida greeted, taking off his shoes and replacing them with a pair of slippers. Heya, kiddos. Yamada greeted, amused by Shinsu's turmoil as he made his way back into the kitchen, a pink apron tied around his waist. A small black cat leapt off the back of the sofa and trotted away, intimidated by the amount of people in the apartment. Shinso looked sad to see it go, though he perked up when a fluffy orange cat waddled towards them, its front leg missing. That's Clementine, Izuku introduced, watching Shinso kneel down with a hand outstretched as Ida discreetly stepped away, nose already twitching. He's our most recent member, we adopted him last week. The tomcat sniffed Shinsu's hand before butting into it, purring up a storm. His stump was recently shaved and wrapped in bright purple bandages, clearly having been cut off recently. Shinso cooed softly and picked him up, kicking off his shoes as he cradled the fluffy baby. I love you, Clementine, he said. Yamada thought he was a girl, otherwise we would have named him Orville, Izuku giggled, scratching the cat on the head. Ida sneezed and promptly reached into his bag, pulling out a bottle of allergy pills and making his way to the kitchen to ask for water. The black cat from earlier stared at them from the hallway, its fur so dark it looked like a shadow with eyes. That's fuckhead, Izuku said cheerily, his smile growing as Shinso choked and burst out laughing. Don't let her fool you, she's shy now but just wait until she gets comfortable. You'll learn why she's called that very quickly. There was a knock at the door and Izuku turned around as Shinso vacated the hallway, greeting Yamada shyly. The greenette opened the door and smiled brightly when he saw Uraraka, accepting her hug happily. Now that he knew it was coming, he appreciated her hugs. He loved hugs. "Hi, Midoriya," she said, stepping inside and holding up her own bag of goodies. "I got the stuff. Where do you want me to put it?" Izuku guided her to the living room, directing everyone to put their things on the coffee table. Aizawa grumbled and vacated the couch, taking one of the armchairs instead. It was a hideous shade of yellow, but it was the comfiest piece of furniture in the house besides their beds, so they weren't getting rid of it. "Let's open our letters now," Shinso said, sitting down with Clementine in his lap. "Uraraka looks like she's about to burst." Uraraka giggled nervously and apologized, though no one really minded. All of them were anxious to know if they'd gotten in or not. "One at a time, trust me," Aizawa said, flipping through the papers he was grading. The group looked at each other but nodded, Ida volunteering to go first. He carefully peeled the letter open and tugged a leaf of paper free, as well as a small disc. He identified it quickly and set it down, tucking the paper away for later. "Greetings, Ida Tenya." They all gasped and freaked out, even Ida, as All Might appeared above the coffee table, wearing a horrible pinstripe suit. The man laughed and put his hands on his waist, projecting nothing but confidence as he spoke. "I am here, as a projection." That earned laughing from the group, before Ida shushed them to be quiet. Even Yamada had walked in, eager to see their results. Izuku felt even more nervous than before, remembering their last interaction. "I am your heroics teacher this year, as requested of me by Nedzu and the Hero Commission themselves. I strive to do my best to teach you all I know, to be as good of a teacher as I am a hero. Now, here are your results. Ida Tenya, you did exceptionally well on your written exam, earning a phenomenal score of 89%. Congratulations, that's a pass." "Congrats, Ida," Izuku said, Uraraka and Shinso echoing the sentiment. "For your interview, you received a score of 6 out of 10. While your answers were well thought out, your DLVRY was a bit stiff." Uraraka giggled softly and patted Ida on the back gently when he deflated a bit. "That's okay. Personally, I think your seriousness is admirable." "Thank you, Uraraka," Ida said, a light blush crossing his cheeks. "And as for your practical exam, we at UA developed a very special point system for the exam. We told you about villain points, acquired by defeating the enemies built for the exam, but not about our second form of points. Hero points. These were gained when you did something heroic, like rescuing or teaming up with a fellow examinee, or even taking great care not to damage your surroundings. You, Ida, earned 52 villain points and 15 hero points. You took great care to prevent damage to the buildings around you. That gives you a total of 67 points. You have passed. Congratulations, Ida-kun, and welcome to your Hero Academia." Izuku and Uraraka freaked out as the projection ended, both hugging Ida tightly as he protested loudly with wild hand chopping. Shinso just huffed and reached for a bag of chips, tearing them open to snack on. He got hungry when he was stressed. My turn, my turn." Uraraka insisted, gently pushing Ida's projector aside so she could rip open her envelope and set hers down. All Might's introduction was the same, but the test results were different, of course. "Uraraka, your written exam gave you trouble, but you pushed through to get a respectable 71%. As this is a passing grade, congratulations." "Nice job, Uraraka," Izuku said, nudging her arm gently. "Your interview went splendidly. Your answers were thoughtful and from the heart, with a fantastic reason to be a hero. You earned a score of 8 out of 10. "Whoa. What did you say for him to bring it up?" Shinso asked, glancing at Uraraka. Oh, I honestly thought my answer was pretty unheroic," Uraraka admitted. "I want to be a hero for the money." They all blinked, stunned. Uraraka seemed like such a kind, selfless person, but her reason was so selfish. That wasn't all there was to it?" Yamada shouted from the kitchen. Uraraka flushed as Aizawa scolded him for prying, but his eye was on the group too. "Well, I want to be a hero because my family is in construction. We don't have a lot of money, so I want to be a hero so my parents will never have to worry about a single penny ever again." "That's so heroic," Izuku protested. "That's a great reason to be a hero." Uraraka blushed as the others agreed and thanked them softly before turning to the projection again. "And finally, your results for the practical exam." All Might explained the point system again before finally sharing Uraraka's score. "While you may not have defeated as many robots as others, your selfless nature shined as you assisted other students in their endeavors. We watched as you rescued people from beneath rubble and debris, only to be trapped yourself. And then, at the very last moment, you saved a fellow student from serious injury. You may have earned yourself only 19 villain points, but your bravery gained you a whopping 37 hero points, making that a total of 56 points. You have passed. Congratulations, Uraraka-kun. Welcome to your Hero Academia. There was more screaming and congratulations, as well as a reluctant hug from Shinso. He couldn't stop grinning though, proud of his friends for pulling through. Shinso next, Uraraka said, nudging him gently. The purplet nodded and pulled out his letter from his pocket, dumping out his projector onto the table. Uraraka gathered up the other two while the intro ran on, handing Ida his before tucking her own away for safekeeping. Shinso-kun. For your written exam, you performed third overall out of everyone taking the test. You earned an outstanding grade of 96.98%. Congratulations. Shinso blushed a bright red at the sudden onslaught of compliments, sinking into his seat and burying his face into Clementine's fur. He finally batted them away and pointed at the projection, where All Might was moving on. For your interview, you did well, earning yourself a passing grade of 6.5 out of 10. I watched your interview personally, and I am sorry you've experienced so much hate. I hope that you grow into the hero you wish to be, to inspire children like you to be heroes too. Stay strong, young Shinso. I believe in you. Izuku felt a pang of hurt but pushed it aside to pat the other on the back. He honestly looked close to crying. It was probably his lifelong dream for a hero to tell him he could be a hero too. And as for your practical exam, unfortunately, you didn't do so well. Despite your best efforts, you only earned 8 villain points. But you earned 27 hero points. Because of your actions using your quirk to assist others and save them from falling debris and taking hard hits from robots, we've awarded you these points. However, this means you did not pass the practical exam. Shinsu's heart stopped, along with everyone else's. Aizawa's pencil paused and he looked up, frowning. Only, All Might continued. Shinsu-kun, everyone thinks that to be a hero, you need a flashy quirk and a blinding grin. But that is simply not the case. You've caught the eye of our very own principal Nedzu, who believes that you deserve a chance just like everyone else. He has decided to sponsor you personally as his own personal student. Congratulations, Shinsu-kun. Welcome to your Hero Academia. Tears welled up in Shinsu's eyes, his shoulders dropping as a startled sob left his mouth. He covered his face as Uraraka wrapped her arms around him, Izuku doing so on his other side. Even Ida patted his back, mumbling congratulations to him. Aizawa relaxed in his seat and looked back to his paperwork, relieved. For a moment, he was worried he'd have to take another problem child under his wing. He might anyway, because Shinso had talent far beyond even the exceptional hero students he taught every year. Well, every year except the previous. Why you turn, Mido, Shinso sniffed, wiping his eyes. You gotta get in too, okay? Izuku's breath hitched and he nodded, reaching for his own letter. He stared at it for a moment, terrified. What if he didn't get in? Even with a quirk, was he just not cut out for this? A hand landed on his shoulder and he turned to see Yamada smiling at him. He didn't need to say anything, though. It'll be okay. Izuku nodded and opened his letter, setting the projector delicately on the table. Midoriya-kun, All Might said, sitting down rather than standing. I requested a different video, because I owe you an apology. I once told you that you couldn't be a hero without a quirk, that without one, you should try for something else, that I couldn't tell you to be a hero because I would be condemning you to danger. But if I said that to anyone else, wouldn't I be doing the same? I realized that I was wrong, young Midoriya, that quirk or no quirk, anyone can be a hero. I am sorry I ever told you otherwise. Izuku could already feel tears streaming down his face, his hand over his mouth as he stared at the projection in shock. All Might stood up and clenched his fist, bringing it around to his chest as he grinned brightly. If I am to be your teacher, I must rectify my mistakes. I promise you, Midoriya, that I will never fail you again. Now, here are your results. You scored the very highest on the written exam with a truly amazing 99.3%. For your interview, you passed with flying colors, earning a 9 out of 10. You inspire us all, Midoriya-kun. And finally, your practical. You earned 40 villain points, but they were easily outshone when you single-handedly defeated the zero-pointer to save your fellow student. It takes a lot of bravery to do something when you are scared and you have bravery in spades. You earned 60 rescue points, rounding out your score to an even 100 and earning yourself first place on the leaderboards. For all of these reasons, Nedzu has also offered you a position as his personal student. Congratulations, Midoriya-kun. Welcome to your Hero Academia. Yamada screamed in glee and wrapped a bawling Izuku up in a hug, quickly gathering up the rest of the kids as well as a disgruntled Aizawa. All of them were cheering, shouting, or grumbling, their praises as Izuku sobbed his heart out into Yamada's shirt, staining it with his tears. I am gonna be a hero, he cried, looking up at his foster parents with teary eyes. I did it. You did it, problem child, Aizawa said with a huff, pride shining in his eyes. Izuku felt something warm against his back and thought of his mother. He sniffled and buried his face deeper into Yamada's shoulder, wishing she was here to see him. But he knew she'd be proud. Later, after being lovingly interrogated by his foster parents about what All Might had said to him, Izuku finally said goodbye after a wonderful dinner and a fun night spent playing video games and talking about everything and anything with his friends. He closed the door behind them and stood in the hallway for a moment, his shoulders sagging. He felt a bit bad about being relieved they were gone, but his battery had been waning for the past 20 minutes or so and he was exhausted despite having been doing something he enjoyed. "Zuzu?" Yamada asked quietly, tilting his head as he exited the kitchen, wiping his hand on a dish towel. "You okay, kiddo?" Izuku nodded mutely and turned around, making his way towards the man and simply shoving his head against his chest, ears limp against his head. He let out a heaving sigh and closed his eyes, too tired to even raise his arms. Yamada just chuckled and pet his hair, his other arm coming to wrap around him gently. "Long day?" he asked quietly, amused. Izuku nodded and squeaked as he was picked up, a protest catching in his throat. He was too old to be picked up like this, but then again, it was so comforting being held. The perks of having two pro-heroes as parents, they were very strong and he was unfortunately very small. Or maybe fortunately, in this case. He huffed and buried his face in Yamada's shoulder instead, reluctant to let go of even a sliver of his childhood just yet. "Never grow up, Izuku," Yamada said, rubbing the teen's back as he carried him to his room. "Just stay this small forever, okay?" The greenette laughed softly, amused by their accidental shared brainwaves. He nodded against his foster father's shirt and clung to him tightly, squeezing his eyes shut. Only a few months spent together and already he was firmly attached. He'd heard them whispering at night about adoption and starting the paperwork, which he was incredibly excited for, but he knew they wanted to bring it up themselves. Not to mention that the process for pro-heroes to adopt was a lengthy one, seeing as the job was incredibly high risk. They were determined though, which made Izuku feel all the more loved. "Good night, Zuzu," Yamada said softly, lowering Izuku onto his bed. Izuku tightened his grip, making the man pause for a moment. The teen remained in his hold for a while longer before pulling away and lifting his hands, his teeth digging into his lips. "I gotta tell you something," he signed slowly, not as practiced as Aizawa or Yamada. "Yeah? What is it, kiddo?" Yamada asked, signing along with his words. It helped Izuku learn to have the visual signs done with the words they correlated to. "I know I've only been here for a short time, but I feel like I've been here longer." Izuku looked away for a moment, nervous. "I wanted to ask, is it too soon to call you Papa?" Yamada's eyes immediately started watering and Izuku panicked, only for the blonde to turn around and shout out into the house. "Shoo dash!" Aizawa burst into the room with his capture scarf around his neck, eyes red and body tense. When he saw no danger he straightened, only to panic a little at the sight of Yamada practically bawling in the middle of Izuku's bedroom. "What's going on?" he asked Izuku, crouching down next to his husband. "I asked him if I could call him Papa," Izuku signed, hands shaky as he started to cry too. "Did I do something wrong?" Immediately Yamada gathered him up in his arms and sniffled wetly, hugging the life out of him as he shook his head. "And no, nothing wrong. I would be so proud to be your papa." Izuku relaxed and turned to Aizawa, face wet. "Could I call you Dad?" Aizawa ducked his face into his scarf and breathed in sharply, his hair hanging in his face. He lifted a hand to his mouth and took a moment to answer, overwhelmed. Then he nodded and stood up to join them, wrapping his little family up in his arms as tight as he dared. The wetness on Izuku's head was Hisashi's tears, not his. He definitely wasn't crying. "Love you," Izuku mumbled, his little tail shaking with happiness as he was bundled up tightly between his parents. There was no safer feeling than being wrapped up in their arms, though his mothers were equal in that regard. "Love you too, Zuzu," Hisashi said. Shoyuta pecked them both on the head, humming in agreement. "I love you both." They didn't part for quite a while, not until Izuku had fallen asleep and Hisashi was well on his way. Shoyuta had to carry his sleepy husband to bed, though he didn't mind all that much. The blonde was adorable like this, his face slack and arms tucked against his chest like a baby. He'd definitely tease him about it tomorrow. The first day. While the first day of school is always a little daunting, especially when one is changing schools, it's nothing compared to the first day of hero school. At least this time he didn't trip, which Izuku was relieved about, though he wasn't so happy about waking up so early to drive to school with his parents. The downsides of having teachers as parents, but then again, he'd never have to worry about taking the train ever again. Izuku yawned as he walked into the teacher's lounge, following Shoyuta to his desk while Hisashi headed to his classroom to do some last-minute seat assignments. The teen dumped his bag off to one side and crawled beneath the desk, curling up in a ball with his uniform draped over himself, unaware that he was in Shuta's spot. The hero sighed quietly and gently kicked his sleeping bag aside, sitting down instead. So much for taking a nice nap before class started. Izuku beat him to it, and he wasn't about to disturb him when he looked so peaceful. He supposed he could do some actual work in his workplace for once, though an idea came to mind as he stared at his desk. An hour later, Izuku was gently nudged awake. He crawled out from under the desk and blinked blearily, accepting the bento box shoved into his arm by Hisashi before the man pointed at the desk he'd been sleeping under. He was greeted by the sight of Shoyuta sleeping face down in his sleeping bag on top of it, dead to the world. He barely managed to keep his laughter down long enough to flee the room, Hisashi close behind. "Okay, kiddo, head to class," Hisashi said, ruffling Izuku's hair. "Have a good day, yeah?" Izuku nodded and rushed off, his heart pounding as he sprinted down the hallway before Shoyuta could beat him there. He was very good at doing things like appearing in places he logically shouldn't be able to. Maybe that was another part of his quirk, or maybe it was just another Shutaism. The rabbit boy skid to a halt in front of the doors of Class 1A, swallowing hard as he stared at the looming doors, wondering if they only looked like they were getting bigger. He shook his head and looked back down to stop the onset of vertigo and drew a deep breath, pushing open the door instead. He was greeted by some of his classmates, a girl with an obvious mutation that gave her pink hair, skin, yellow horns, and black scaras, a boy with spiky red hair and a minor mutation that gave him shark-like teeth, and Ida, who was arguing with someone on the other side of the room, though he couldn't see who it was from the doorway. "Hi, new person. I'm Ashido Mina, but you can call me Mina," the pink girl exclaimed, suddenly next to him. Izuku jumped a few feet in the air with a startled squeak, clutching the straps of his bag as he came back down. He flushed a bright red and managed to stutter his name, her amused giggles only making him more embarrassed. "Sorry for startling you. You just looked so lost in thought," Mina said, before dragging him by the arm to come talk with her and the redhead. "Come on. We have time before class starts and I want to get to know everybody." Walking further into class, Izuku noticed two other people. A girl with a long black ponytail and a boy sitting in the far corners with bicolored hair, one side red and the other white. He looked cool. "Hey, man. I'm Kirishima Ijiru, nice to meet you," said the redhead, his grin so wide it nearly split his face in half. Izuku smiled right back despite his newfound instincts quivering at the sight of those teeth. He gave his name right back and started chatting, though he couldn't help but look over as Ida's argument with the mystery guy grew louder and louder. "Oi, F off you stupid extra. Get your DMN hands out of my face." Oh no. His worst nightmare had come true. "Hide me," he squeaked to Kirishima, darting behind him just in time for Bakugo to stand up, fists sparking with anger. Bakugo stuck a finger into Ida's chest, eyes narrowed and teeth gritted. "Stop FING looking down on me, glasses. I'll put my feet up if I want and you can't tell me not to." He slammed his foot on the desk for emphasis, the sound so loud everyone in the room jumped, Izuku the highest. The boys were silent, glaring at one another as some others filtered into the class, wincing at the tense atmosphere. What a great start to the school year. "Whoa, he's scary. Do you know him?" Kirishima said, thankfully quietly. Izuku nodded and swallowed, glancing at Mina as she looked at him with concern. "He's always been like that. He used to bully me, back in our old school before I transferred out. That's not very manly, or heroic." Kirishima frowned. He stepped away from Izuku and walked towards him, leaving the poor boy suddenly exposed. "Hey! Cut it out, guys, we're classmates, yeah? We should be getting along." "Ah, you're right," Ida said, stepping back, though his fists were still clenched. "Apologies for disturbing the peace." But Bakugo didn't have eyes for either of them. He was staring right behind Kirishima, eyes wide with disbelief. Was that Deku? Where did he get the ears from? Were those seriously fake? Did he fake a quirk to get into UA? "You," he growled, stomping towards him, shoving Kirishima bodily out of the way. Izuku whimpered, his body locking up with terror as he quivered in place. Suddenly his vision filled with pink, Mina having jumped between them with her arms wide and a fierce glare on her face. "Back off, Blasty. You're scaring him," she yelled, glaring up at Bakugo as he stomped closer. "Get the F out of my way. I'm gonna teach that quirkless freak a lesson for looking down on me," the blonde snarled, blood-red eyes narrowed and full of hatred. "I am not quirkless anymore, Bakugo," came Izuku's shaky voice from behind Mina, his head poking out. "I stress manifested a quirk." The entire class fell quiet. You could hear a pin drop, it was so silent. Bakugo stared at Izuku in shock, before a wide grin crossed his face. Well, looks like you took my advice," he taunted, stepping back. But don't think just because you cheated means you aren't still useless, Deku. You're still beneath me, you'll never be as good as me. Bakugo stormed off to his desk and sat down, the rest of the students staring on in confusion, some with a bit of fear. Izuku swallowed and looked at the seating chart before promptly sitting down right behind Mina. Someone else could sit behind Bakugo. Ida came into view, peering at the chart for a moment before pursing his lips and shaking his head. I'll let whoever Tsuyu is know her seat's been changed. And our teacher. Izuku shot him a grateful smile and looked back down at his desk. The class slowly started up conversation again, the tense atmosphere fading. Kirishima and Mina started chatting at the latter's desk, talking about their previous classes together. The Greenette wondered if he should bring up the incident with Aizawa. It would be the responsible thing to do, seeing as this year he wasn't Bakugo's only target. Ida would be singled out for sure after confronting him, Kirishima too. Mina wasn't off the hook, either. Everyone sit down. The class all startled, taken aback by the sudden appearance of their teacher. Eraserhead stood next to the desk at the front of the room, head tipped forward and glowering at the students gathered. He jerked a thumb behind him and at the security camera in the corner, entirely unimpressed. It took you 5 minutes to de-escalate, 10 seconds to notice me, and none of you have even sat down yet, he said, though his eyes flicked to Izuku, who wasn't looking at him. His brows furrowed further. Everyone scrambled into their seats and sat at attention, their eyes wide and full of wonder and a healthy bit of terror. Bakugo, I will say this once. Intimidation, discrimination, and any form of bullying will not be tolerated. In fact, this is everyone's only warning. Anyone who bullies another student in my class for their looks, quirk, intelligence, etc. Expelled on the spot, he growled. Do I make myself clear? Yes, sensei. Good, Eraserhead said. Now, that being said, Mineta Minoru, you're expelled. The short boy squawked in protest, eyes wide. He cowered as Eraserhead approached and snatched his phone off his desk, shrieking as the hero promptly crushed it in his fist. My pictures were on there, Mineta said, visibly shaking. I'm aware, Eraserhead hissed. Get up and get out. Don't make any detours, Nedzu is always watching. The boy grabbed his bag and booked it, crying the entire way out of the room, his sobs audible even from down the hall. Izuku looked cluelessly at Eraserhead, though he noticed some of the girls looking relieved, a couple fixing their skirts. Oh. Everyone get up and get changed into your gym uniforms. Meet me outside next to the baseball diamond, Eraserhead said, walking back to the front and pulling a box from his desk, setting it down. Inside were everyone's uniforms, each one tagged with a student's name. Sensei. What about orientation? Ida called out, hand raised. You don't want to go to orientation, Eraserhead said tiredly, before walking out of the room. Izuku hopped out of his seat and trotted to the front of the room, digging through the box and pulling out a uniform. Then he swallowed and looked up, holding it up shyly. Mina? This one's yours. One by one he handed out uniforms, even Bakugo's, though he suspected the only reason the boy snatched it up and didn't explode him out a window was Aizawa's threat of expulsion. If looks could kill, the death glare he received would have done so. Izuku joined everyone in the change rooms, retreating into a stall as usual before emerging in his gym uniform and heading straight outside. He was surprised to be the first one, since he'd gotten his clothes last, but he stood silently in front of Aizawa, eyes downcast. Izuku, you okay? Aizawa asked quietly. If Bakugo is going to be a problem, I'll send him to Nedzu and get him transferred immediately. Izuku shook his head but didn't say anything, so Aizawa reluctantly dropped it, though he made a mental note. He wasn't just Izuku's guardian, but his and the rest of Class 1, as teacher. It was his responsibility to identify threats to their safety and deal with them, and Bakugo was definitely a threat to his students' safety. At the very least, he'd warn Nedzu about him. Uraraka and Ida joined Izuku, both offering their silent support as they waited for the rest of the class. It was a shame Shinso was in the 1B because Izuku would have liked all his friends to be there with him. Once everyone gathered, Eraserhead stepped forward, a baseball in his hand. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with the apprehension tests you took in middle school. But those measure your baseline strengths, not your quirks. I want to see what you can do with them. Midoriya. Izuku jumped and looked up, ears at attention. Eraserhead gestured him forward and held out the ball, to which Izuku hopped the few feet between them and took it, looking up at him curiously. Since you came first on the practical, I want you to demonstrate. Step into that white circle and use your quirk to project the ball as far as you can, Eraserhead said, gesturing off to the side. The Greenette stepped around him and walked towards the white circle drawn into the dirt of the baseball diamond, swallowing. He tried not to focus on the eyes on his back and tossed the ball up once to get a feel for its weight, before taking a step so he stood at the very edge of the circle's limit. Then he tossed the ball up and swung his leg around, slamming the front of his rabbit foot into the ball and sending it flying. It whistled as it soared off over the baseball diamond, the outer field, and finally the trees that made up the forest surrounding UA. Everyone looked to Eraserhead, who was holding up a small tablet with a score on it. 705.3 meters. Each test will be standard with minor adjustments to make it easier to use your quirks. Everyone head to the running track. We'll start with the 50-meter dash, Eraserhead drawled, tucking the tablet into his pocket before slumping towards the track that spanned the field. Izuku leapt forward first, grinning at Uraraka when she dashed forward to join him, followed by Ida at a slower jog. Then someone laughed behind them, and Izuku's heart dropped into his stomach. Haha, this looks like so much fun. I can't wait. Mina said, grinning happily. Eraserhead stopped, hands in his pockets. He slowly turned his head, glaring back at his students before whipping his body around and narrowing his eyes. You think this is fun, huh? How about this? Whoever gets last place will be expelled, he said slowly, an evil grin appearing as the whole class, sans Izuku, erupted into loud protests. He raised a hand and everyone quieted down, his grin fading. I am not here to teach you to have fun. I am here to teach you how to survive. Do you know the average lifespan of a hero? Ida raised his hand, as did Izuku. Eraserhead nodded at the former, who shoved his glasses up and swallowed. F5 years, Eraserhead-sensei, he said, lowering his eyes. That's right. 5 years, the hero said, face grim. My job is to teach you everything you need to know to live longer than that. If I see that any of you aren't taking my class seriously, I will expel you without hesitation. Do you understand? Yes, sensei. With a nod, Eraserhead turned and continued on, leaving the students to mull over his words. Some of them were frightened, others determined, and Izuku was just sad. How many students had Shoyuta lost to become so jaded? He bit his lip and ran after him again, though this time he wasn't followed so closely. The class was split up into 3 groups of 4 and 1 group of 3 before they were told to line up for the first test, the 50-meter dash. The first students up were Ida, Tsuyu, Uraraka, and Ojiro. Ida and Tsuyu were predictable, with the former simply using his quirk as normal and the latter hopping quite an impressive distance to finish the dash. Uraraka on the other hand used her quirk on her clothes to make them lighter, to which Eraserhead nodded in approval. Ojiro sprung off the ground with his tail almost like a kangaroo, alternating between launching himself off of it and running a few steps, before doing it again. Ida got 3.04 seconds, Tsuyu 5.58 seconds, Uraraka 7.15 seconds, and Ojiro 5.49 seconds. Many of the others did similarly. Mina used her slime-like acid to speed down the track past Aoyama, who was propelling himself with his laser, though he ended up puking in a bush afterwards. They got 5.23 seconds and 5.51 seconds respectively. Finally, it was him, a girl named Yaoyorozu, Shiro, and Bakugu. Izuku swallowed and got ready at the starting line, glad that Yaoyorozu and Shiro were placed between him and the ash blonde. He took off at the whistle, noting that Shiro was running like normal, having nothing to swing with, and Yaoyorozu had made herself an electric bike before the race started. His ears flipped backwards and he heard Bakugu's explosions getting closer and closer, his instincts screaming in his head. Before he knew what he was doing he'd leapt forward, using all 4 limbs to run faster than he ever had in his entire life. His tail was flipped up like a flag, the white underside visible as he shot over the finish line and away from Bakugu. Izuku slid to a halt and stood up, dusting off his hands and wincing. They were a bit scraped up since he wasn't exactly used to running like that, bits of gravel stuck in his palms. He looked up to find Eraserhead holding up the tablet again, their times on it. Midoriya, 3.80 seconds. Bakugu, 4.13 seconds. Ha! That was a fluke. You cheated, Midoriya. Bakugu snarled, stomping towards him. No, I didn't, Izuku said, standing up tall despite his rapid heartbeat and the fear coiling in his chest. We're supposed to use our quirks, Bakugu. Eraserhead cleared his throat, eyes narrowed at the blonde as he scoffed and clenched his fists. After a moment he turned and stormed off, making Izuku sigh in relief. That was terrifying. The grip strength test wasn't very exciting. A few people did better than others, namely Sato and Shoji, who were neck and neck in terms of quirk strength. Kirishima and Bakugu were 3rd and 4th, their natural strength beating out the rest of the class. Next up though was the standing long jump. It was easy enough for Izuku, whose rabbit mutation made jumping an absolute breeze, and tied with Tsuyu in terms of leg strength in that regard. In fact, the frog heteromorph met up with him afterwards, her hands held up near her chest. Karo. I'm Tsuyu Azui, she introduced. I heard you say earlier that your quirk was stress manifested. What was that like? Izuku blinked, floundering at the rather invasive question. He didn't sense any malice, though, simply curiosity. Well, it hurt. A lot. It's not easy growing ears and a tail in 2 days, haha. Oh. That sounds like it was rough, Karo, she replied, watching the next student, Jairu, leap across the pit, though she stumbled and fell into the sand. Us heteromorphs should stick together. I'd like to be your friend, if that's okay. Am more than okay, Izuku said, fists clenching in excitement. I'll give you my number after this, okay? Oh, and I'm Midoriya Izuku, but I think you knew that already, haha. Tsuyu just nodded before they went their separate ways, the next test needing their attention. Izuku found the repeated side steps easy as well. The act of hopping from foot to foot was one he enacted every day just from stimmying, so he continued on for several minutes before Eraserhead called for him to stop. At around Kaminari was stopped for a similar reason, being hyperactive as well, while Yaoyorozu bounced between 2 squishy pads, essentially extending her side steps to as long as she could stand being bounced around. Finally, the ball throw again. Since Izuku had already done his, he stood off to the side to watch, finally getting an opportunity to see everyone's quirks up close and personal. Tokoyami's throw was impressive, using his dark shadow, who seemed to be sentient, to throw the ball an impressive 200.9 meters. She was incredibly strong. There were a few people whose quirks were emitters and didn't affect their strength, like Kaminari, Mina, and Koda, who threw average distances. But then again, there were others with the same who simply used their quirks in creative ways. Todoroki, for example, used a pillar of ice to launch his baseball 290.8 feet, while Bakugo used his explosions, shouting out an expletive that got him scolded, only to land the second highest score of 705.2 meters and promptly swear again and stomp back towards the class. Sato popped a wrapped cupcake in his mouth and bulked up before launching his ball an astounding 314.1 meters. Ida pointed out the accidental joke to Uraraka, who giggled quietly, followed by Ojiro, who batted the ball with his tail, getting a score of 104.5 meters. Shoji threw his and got 313.9 meters, Kirishima 90.1 meters, and Siro whipped his ball and got 94.3 meters. Then Uraraka stepped up, simply touching her ball with all 5 fingers before lightly throwing it upwards. After a few minutes, Eraserhead turned the tablet around, showing her score. Infinity. Whoa, Izuku said, standing beside Ida. She knocked that one out of the park. Ida snorted and covered his mouth, to which Izuku started giggling to himself, though he straightened his expression when Eraserhead turned to look at him, eyes narrowed. He almost started laughing again. The last few tests went by quickly, too. Izuku and Tsuyu tied once again with the toe touches, both seated and standing, being the most flexible members of the class. Tsuyu even showed off by bending over backwards and grabbing her ankles. Izuku fell over when he tried. Before he knew it, the tests were over and everyone was gathered in front of Eraserhead, anxious to see their scores. Yaoyorozu Momo. Midoriya Izuku. Todoroki Shudo. Bakugo Katsuki. Ida Tenya. Tokoyami Fumikage. Mizo Shoji. Sato Rikido. Ojiro Mashireo. Tsuyu Azui. Kirishima Ijiru. Mina Ashido. Uraraka Achiko. Siro Hanta. Jairu Kyoka. Kaminari Denki. Aoyama Yuga. Koda Kuji. Hagakure Turu. There was a soft sniffle and everyone looked over to see who everyone assumed was in last place, a girl who was entirely invisible, or did she refract light? She wiped her eyes and drew herself up, turning to look at everyone. Thank you for having me. I am sorry I wasn't able to live up to this opportunity, she said gratefully, though she had to wipe her eyes again. I hope you all become great heroes. Hagakure walked away, everyone absolutely silent. Wait. The girl stopped and turned around again to see Eraserhead approaching, hands in his pockets. It was a logical ruse, I'm not expelling you. Besides, I like your attitude, I'd have taken it back anyway. Izuku and the others cheered, though he heard someone mutter about the ruse being obvious. Maybe he knew it was obvious, having lived with him for more than half a year, but to everyone else? Of course it wasn't. But he didn't see who said that anyway, so he let it be. Now, everyone go shower and get changed, you all have English next, Eraserhead said, smirking at the synchronized groans he received in response. A boy lingered behind for a moment, blue and gray eyes downcast as he frowned. He'd only gotten third, his father would surely be disappointed in him. SCRTCH 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 SCRTCH. Long fingers scratched endlessly, nails digging harsh lines down scarred porcelain skin until it split open, spilling rivers of red all the way down to the concrete floor. The hands came to a halt and stilled, pinky fingers raised almost delicately. Tamura? Crimson eyes darted up from where they'd focused on the ground, landing on the vague form of a man standing in front of his game over screen. The figure stepped forward, form flickering with black mist, a glass of water held in his hand. I think it's time you took a break, Kurogyri said gently, pushing the glass into his charge's hand without fear. With his pinky raised, Tamura brought it to his mouth and swallowed deeply, chugging most of it before he set it down on the coffee table hard enough to make Kurogyri wince. Maybe he should invest in cheaper glasses. Fine. I'm going on a walk, Tamura growled. Make sure everything is ready for next week, because Sensei won't be happy if I fail this quest. Of course, the Mistman said, bowing forward. Tamura stood up and stormed out of the room, reaching up to pull the preserved hand he always wore around his face off. His skin itched and it was all he could do not to itch, but the formaldehyde the hand was soaked in caused his skin to flake and slew off no matter what he did. He shoved open the door to the main room, entering into a rundown bar, before walking across to the front door and up a set of stairs to the alleyway outside. Then he shoved the hand, father, into his pocket, breathing in slowly, though the smell of rotting garbage and refuse didn't really help him calm down. It had been a long few weeks of waiting for the new school year. Tamura had never been good at that, always having been one to jump right into boss fights rather than stock up on buffs and elixirs. He never looked up guides or tutorials either, preferring to figure out mechanics on his own until he'd brute forced his way into a win. But his sensei had tasked him to do something different, to step back and plan, to gather a party rather than try to go solo. He gritted his teeth and kicked a can across the alley and continued forward, scoffing. Sensei always underestimated him, always belittled him, always told him he wasn't ready. He was more than ready. He'd deliver All Might's head on a silver platter and finally show his sensei that he was ready and worthy of his OP quirk. The ultimate power-up. Welcome, Midoriya-kun, Shinsu-kun, and Yayorozu-kun. Nedzu sat at his desk with a grin on his face, his paws folded on the desk in front of him. I'm pleased you all accepted my offer, though I'm sad to see that my fourth offer has been turned down. Izuku blinked and glanced over at his fellow classmates. Did this count as a class? There were only the three of them, after all. Please, go ahead and introduce yourselves, Nedzu urged, gesturing to Yayorozu first. Yayorozu perked up and straightened further, reaching up to tuck her bangs behind her ear. I'm Yayorozu Momo, I'm in Class 1A. My quirk is called Creation. I can use the fats and lipids stored in my body to create anything. I know the atomic configuration of the object, though I'm unable to create living organisms. Izuku was stunned. He was aware that her quirk was incredible, but the amount of book smarts it required had to be immense. No wonder she had placed so high, she had to be incredibly intelligent. Ah, thank you, Midoriya-kun, Yayorozu said, blushing, and Izuku blushed too, embarrassed. Stupid muttering habit. Oh, please call me Momo, she said, placing her hand over her chest. Yayorozu is such a mouthful and we're going to be classmates and eventually co-workers anyway. Shinso and Izuku both nodded before Izuku introduced himself too, taking Momo's lead. I'm Midoriya Izuku. I'm also in Class 1A, my quirk doesn't have a name yet, he said, blinking. I totally forgot. You forgot? Momo asked, blinking, before she perked up. Oh, that's right. Your quirk was stress manifested. Yeah. Anyway, it's a rabbit quirk, kind of like Maruko? But yeah, I like quirks. I analyze them every chance I get, Izuku stuttered, glancing down at his hands. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Midoriya-kun. Shinso? Nedzu said. Shinso Hitoshi, my quirk is, it's called brainwashing. If someone responds to my question, I can take control of them temporarily, Shinso said, glancing away. Izuku began to vibrate out of control, eyes sparkling. Wow. That's so amazing. You mean you could talk someone down out of a panic attack? Oh, or someone off a ledge. He could have used that last one half a year ago, but he was grateful all the same for Aizawa's quick save. I guess? Shinso said, looking rather stunned. Nedzu watched the three interact and nodded to himself, smiling. Yes, these three would get along swimmingly. Now to see about getting a certain pink-haired genius into the mix too. As heartwarming as this is, I would like to get down to business, Nedzu butted in. I have separate goals for all three of you that suit your talents nicely, I think. Midoriya-kun, I'd like you to hone the analysis skills you displayed on the test. He held up a few pieces of paper, which Izuku immediately recognized as being from the analysis portion of the entrance exam. Technically you were supposed to write 500 words, but Izuku had written nearly. He flushed in embarrassment and ducked his head as Shinso and Momo blinked at the papers, brows raised. On top of that, I believe that your analysis, paired with an education in computer programming and cyber hacking, will round out a suitable education in the subtle art of cyber espionage, Nedzu said with a fierce grin. What do you think? Izuku's jaw dropped and he stuttered dumbly for a minute or so, before snapping a hand over his mouth and thinking it over. Most heroes specialized in one or two things, like long range or brutal force. But Izuku was neither. He was small and nimble, able to fit into small spaces and get in close and personal with an opponent. But ever since his talk with All Might, he'd reeled back on his fanboy habits and realized that the man actually had a point. He had to be realistic when achieving his goals. He could go the route of Maruko and go limelight, but he'd never be able to knock over a building or go toe-to-toe with Endeavor. But there were Twilight heroes like Midnight, Night Eye, and even Best Jeanist, who had a public persona while specializing in analysis and support in the underbelly of Japan's criminal underworld, where the real villains lay hiding in the shadows. Slowly, he nodded, letting his hand fall away as he stared determinedly at his teacher. I think that's a good idea, Nedzu-sensei. Please, teach me all you know. He might not be the next All Might, but he didn't have to be. His dream was to be a hero, to help those who needed rescuing. Why? Because he was Izuku. Nedzu grinned wider and clapped his paws together gleefully. Excellent. I admire your tenacity, Midoriya-kun. I'm excited to teach you. Each of them received their focuses and curriculums. Izuku received his analysis and a beginner's crash course on computer coding and language, Shinso several textbooks on psychoanalysis, identity mimicry, and espionage, and finally, Momo a complete collection of atomic science textbooks, a diet plan, and Fatgum's personal phone number. Sensei? Momo asked, looking up from the piece of paper with Fatgum's information on it. What is this? Let me explain. I asked Toyomitsu if he could take you under his wing, in a sense, Nedzu said. His quirk is very similar to yours, in that he turns his own fat into kinetic energy. I asked him to mentor you because I am not equipped to do so myself. I can teach you all you need to know about the inner workings of complex machinery, the structure of atomic particles, but when it comes to actually using your quirk, that is where I am at a loss. He will teach you to store your energy efficiently, help you create a diet plan, and will teach you that your body is your greatest weapon. Momo was quiet, eyes wide. She looked down at herself, at her body, frowning. Her quirk had always felt like it was hindered by something. Her parents were strict about how she looked, so while she ate plenty, she couldn't eat enough. But she wasn't so sure. Was this really the right path? I think that's enough time for today, Nedzu said, standing up and walking the three students to the door, amused as they struggled to carry all of their new things. A sleek laptop and several thick information packets and textbooks for Izuku, even more textbooks and a tablet for Shinso, and a towering stack of papers, books, and binders for Momo, who could barely carry it all. Not bad for your second day. The students all chimed their farewells and made their way out into the hall, each of them wondering how they were going to get everything home. I guess I'll call my mom's, Shinso said, dropping his things on a desk outside of an empty classroom with a groan. Ugh. Momo, you have a ride, yeah? And you too, Zuku? Both nodded and joined him, setting their things down. There was no way they were getting it all to their vehicles by themselves, so they collectively whipped out their phones to call and text their parents. Oh, Momo. We should exchange numbers, Izuku said, sending off a text to Shoyuta and holding out his phone to the girl. Oh, right, she said, taking it and quickly tapping it out. You too, Shinso. We can coordinate study time much better this way. With their numbers exchanged, the trio just stood there for a moment, glancing between each other. Shinso was an introvert and certainly wouldn't go first, Izuku was too anxious, and that left Momo? So, what do you think about UA so far? She asked, horribly awkward. The other two left out relieved breaths of air. They were all awkward, which was comforting. I love the teachers, Izuku said, shifting from foot to foot. All of them are so nice. And qualified. Present Mike has a language degree. Everyone is a hero, either currently or retired, but they all have secondary skills that fit their role so well. Recovery Girl is a board-certified doctor. I like their policies. They actually enforce them, too, Shinso said, shrugging. Momo blinked at the two of them, confused. Were their old schools not like that? At her private academy, all of her teachers were retired university or college professors, or doctors in certain fields. She knew public schools were different, but surely they were at least competent. You both sound surprised, she probed, curious. Well, not everyone treats quirkless people right, Izuku said hesitantly. Or people with villain quirks, Shinso said bitterly. Momo mulled that over, brows furrowed. She was sheltered, obviously, but she wasn't blind. Discrimination existed everywhere, even in her own house. Her personal butler was quirkless and constantly belittled and doubted by the other housekeepers, even her own parents sometimes. Maybe that was another facet of being a hero, to be kind no matter one's background. I'm sorry that happened to you, she said sincerely. If anything like that ever happens to you both again, or anyone else for that matter, I will do my best to help. If the staff are so responsible, surely they'll help, too. She saw doubt flicker in their eyes and felt even more determined to ensure these two boys felt safe in her presence. As a hero in training, it was her duty to do so. Izuku. Present Mike appeared at the end of the hallway, waving his arm with a grin. Hey! I'm here to help you get your things to the car. Do you need help too, lil listeners? Oh, that would be lovely, Momo said with relief, glad to see ectoplasm coming down the hallway, too. His clones would be useful. With the help of ectoplasm's clones, they managed to ferry their things to everyone's vehicles, where they would be responsible for getting it all home. The math teacher took his leave soon after, leaving the students and present Mike. Good thing that was your last class of the day, the hero said, wiping his brow. That stuff was heavy. What were in those textbooks, bricks? Izuku chuckled softly and waved at Momo and Shinso as he and his papa left for the teacher's lounge to fetch Shoyuta. I guess the more knowledge a book holds, the heavier it is. And there was a lot of stuff in there. Nedzu wants me to hone my analysis more, but he also wants me to learn computer languages. I don't know what that even means. Geez. That's Shuta's area of expertise, not mine, Hizashi said with a laugh. He's always been the computer nerd between us. I still don't know how to convert a PDF file. The two of them laughed as they entered the lounge, waving goodbye to Namiri as she hurried to pack up. She was going out with a few colleagues for drinks and left a kiss on top of Izuku's head and one on Hizashi's cheek before darting out of the room. So? How was the rat? Shoyuta asked from his desk, though he didn't look up from the papers he was flipping through. Izuku sat down beside him and proceeded to rant all about it, his words flying out of his mouth at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Only Shoyuta seemed to understand, occasionally nodding or providing input, leaving Hizashi in the dust. The blonde simply sighed and shook his head fondly, leaving to go get his husband a coffee before they left. Yagi watched from the corner of the room, glad to see the boy so happy. He still thought of the absolutely devastated expression he'd worded all those months ago and winced, looking away. Aizawa had absolutely torn into him the day after he'd learned what he'd done, which he'd expected, but he was certain the mental scars would linger for quite a while. His threats were creative, to say the least. The man flipped through his schedule, eyeing the classes for the next few weeks. It was business as usual except for next Tuesday, where they were going off the main campus all the way to a facility called the USJ. That ought to be exciting. He'd have to be careful about his hours for that day, lest he use them up and be unable to teach. He only had a few hours left to use, after all. He set his schedule down and stood up, grabbing his things. Izuku and his parents were heading out too, it seemed. He took a step away and stopped, chiding himself before he turned around to grab his schedule. It was important that it stay with him, after all. Today is your first heroics class. The curriculum will not only consist of battle training, but ethics classes, practical drills, and hypothetical scenarios. For now, none of you will focus on one particular area of expertise. Instead, you are to learn the basics of all the general categories of heroes. Class 1A had their attention focused on Aizawa as he explained the curriculum, reading off a sheet of paper at various intervals before explaining what everything meant. Then he had Ida pass everyone their syllabi before stepping back and glancing at his watch, eyes tracking the time. And allow me to introduce you to your heroics teacher, he said, voice dripping with exhaustion and sarcasm. The Almighty? All Might. I am here. Coming through the door like a normal person. All Might filled up the entire massive doorway with his presence, blowing the entire class away literally and figuratively, his sudden entrance blowing a fierce wind into the class. It took everything Aizawa had in him not to use erasure right then and there. Good morning, Class 1A, he said boisterously, his booming laugh too loud for the small classroom. Good morning, All Might Sensei. 1A crowed back, awed by his presence. Izuku had his hands over his ears to protect them from All Might's booming voice, but he couldn't help but be awed too. He was even wearing his Silver Age costume. Amazing. I am your foundational heroics teacher this year. I promise to teach you everything I know, to shape you into the next generation of heroes, he said, pressing his fist to his chest proudly. He set it back on his hip and grinned, his smile somehow growing wider. However, I will need to see what I am working with, and to do that, I need to know your baseline skills. No need to grab your gym uniforms, I have an even better idea. All Might pressed a button on Aizawa's desk that opened the wall across from the front door, several hidden panels opening up with hisses of air to reveal 20 numbered suitcases set neatly within their shelving units. The hero gestured to the wall, and it was descended upon immediately by a horde of excited hero wannabes. Once everyone had their cases, he puffed up again, overjoyed. Everyone, get changed and meet me at Ground Gamma. Today we start with Battle Trials. Their cheers were deafening. Aizawa rubbed his temples, already feeling a migraine coming on. That had to be a record. Izuku looked at himself in the change room mirror, unable to look away. He looked cool. He definitely had some changes he wanted to make, but he looked great. He wore a fitted black bodysuit that ended at his mid-thigh and upper arms with dark green lines down the sides and along his front. A metal respirator sat around his neck, connected to a filtration system on his back, kept in place by green backpack straps. Over top his bodysuit was a cowl that strapped on underneath his armpits, giving him a hood that allowed his ears to poke through without hindrance. Black gloves reached all the way to his upper arm, exposing his shoulders, with red cuffs around his wrists that connected to crimson arm guards. Finally, he had a pair of pseudo boots that padded his feet, allowing him to use them for kicks, while leaving his toes and ankles free and stretching all the way to just above his knees where his fur ended, leaving a stripe of skin free. The guards on the tops of his feet were red, while the ones on his shins and knees were black, giving him an armor-like appearance. Around his waist was a red utility belt with plenty of room for small things like bandages, water, and most importantly, snacks. He turned this way and that, admiring himself in the mirror, only to find that he wasn't the only one. He squeaked when he saw Shinso of all people standing behind him, jaw slightly open. "Oh my god, Shinsu," he cried, whirling around and darting forward to yank the other into a hug. "What are you doing here?" "Oh, a dash," he said eloquently, his cheeks a bright red. Izuku stepped back and looked Shinso up and down, eyes sparkling. He was in a costume too, which meant, "You're joining us?" he asked, bringing his hands up to shake them in front of his chest excitedly. "Yay! I'm so happy you're here." Shinso was wearing a jumpsuit similar to Aizawa's, though he had a few key differences. Namely the strange metal mask around his mouth, as well as reinforced armor pieces on his upper arms, shins, chest, and draped around his waist. He had on thick gloves and boots, too, all black. "I got transferred this morning. I'm in Class 1A now," he explained, rubbing his neck gently. Izuku grinned and dragged Shinso out of the locker room, yelling excitedly for their friends, completely oblivious of how the purplet took the chance to have another look. Shinso mourned quietly in his head, for his friend was just so DMN pretty and so DMN oblivious. With the group of friends reunited, plus Momo and Azui, they all gathered with the rest of the class, waiting for All Might to begin his lesson. "Before we begin, I would like to outline a few things," the hero said, pulling a whiteboard from where it had been hidden behind a faux shop door. He pulled a marker out of his pocket and wrote down at the very top in ridiculously neat writing, "Hero types." "Hero types," he said, facing the class again. "The polls put us into 3 different categories. Daylight heroes, twilight heroes, and finally, underground heroes." He wrote those 3 terms on the board, leaving plenty of room beneath them. However, these are superficial and incredibly inaccurate. Instead, we have several terms that branch out into specific fields. Can anyone tell me what these terms are? Izuku, along with several others, raised his hand, eyes sparkling. He squeaked when the hero picked him, his face flushing with embarrassment as he stuttered over himself. "They're called, rescue, support, recon, offense, and defense," he said, watching All Might write the terms down. "Correct, Midoriya. Now, rescue heroes are self-explanatory. These heroes, like UA's own 13 and the group known as the Wild Pussycats, assist in disasters, whether that be digging through the rubble of a collapsed building, assisting with aid relief, or working to prevent things like landslides and floods. They fit into 2 categories: rural and urban. This dictates where they are assigned to lend their aid and what kind of training they receive. Natural disaster training, for example, is vastly different from collapse training. He went into detail about the other different types, too. Offense and defense are 2 sides of the same coin. Heroes who operate in public usually have things called patrols, where they roam the city in a set path in order to catch criminals and villains in action. It's how they function that is different, because while an offensive hero can leap into the fray and stop a robbery in action, a defensive hero is much more likely to work with police and provide assistance. For example, Bakugo-kun would be the one to fight a villain, while Kirishima-kun would defend any civilians nearby from flying attacks or henchmen. Finally, recon and support. Heroes who specialize in these are usually underground or twilight heroes who work behind the scenes or alongside fellow heroes to provide intel, undergo undercover operations, or interrogate villains with police. Recon are information gatherers, working tirelessly to allow public heroes to get all the information they need to tackle a situation. They are your dispatchers, your informants, and often lead raids on villain bases and the like. Support are heroes with less powerful or specific quirks, but no less useful. Shinsukuin, for example, or Hagakure-chan. Everyone nodded their understanding as All Might rolled the whiteboard away, dusting off his hands as if to do the same to the subject for now. I would like you to research this subject. That will be your homework. 500 words minimum, please, he said, before turning around and gesturing to the cityscape behind them. Now, battle trials. I have set up various buildings for our use. You will be split into pairs randomly and then into two opposing teams. One of you will be the attackers, the other defenders. The defenders may choose an object from what I've provided. A briefcase, a dummy, and a false bomb, he explained, walking towards one of the buildings and pointing to where he'd set each object on the ground. Defenders will try to hide the briefcase, which contains incredibly dangerous information, the dummy, who for all intents and purposes is a person you must protect, or the bomb, which you will have to defuse 4 or 5 minutes once the attackers arrive to retrieve it. Attackers are tasked with retrieving the briefcase and getting it outside the building without harming it, rescuing the dummy, which has sensors to detect damage, or finding the bomb and delivering it without harm to the bomb squad, which will essentially be the ground outside. It is up to the attackers to figure out which object the defenders have chosen. Both sides will be acting as heroes, while pretending the other are villains. The class whispered among themselves, excited as All Might pulled out a box with everyone's names inside. He proceeded to pick out teams, calling out teams and sorting everyone into their designated pairs. Then he put together opposing teams, then flipped a coin to see which side everyone was on. First up, Midoriya and Uraraka versus Ida and Bakugo. Oh no. This was going to go poorly. Izuku hated being right. It all started with Bakugo and Ida being chosen as the opposing team, before the blonde promptly chose the bomb as their item. Izuku knew that meant Ida would be tasked with staying with the bomb while Bakugo finally got the chance to hunt Izuku down and deliver the beating that had been coming ever since they locked eyes on the first day. Uraraka gently touched Izuku's arm, brows furrowed. Are you okay? We can tell All Might Sensei to switch our teams. Izuku shook his head and swallowed, clenching his fists. Doing that meant someone else would get the brunt of his rage and would simply delay the inevitable. It was now or never. Okay, I have an idea, Izuku said, turning to Uraraka. Have you ever seen Mission Impossible? The plan was simple. Izuku and Uraraka would make their way to the very top of the building and make their way down the sides with the aid of Uraraka's quirk and a length of rope Izuku had made by Momo before she left. The two of them would scout out possible rooms the bomb would be in, while avoiding Bakugo, who would most likely be pacing the bottom floors waiting for their entrance from the main doors. If the explosive blonde found them, Uraraka would go after the bomb while Izuku distracted Bakugo long enough for her to do so. Izuku listened to All Might rattle off the rules for the exercise as he hopped from foot to food, pulling his hood up as he loosened himself up. No excessive force, no structural damage to the building, and no serious injuries. He doubted Bakugo would listen to any of that. Okay, on All Might's mark, get on my back and use your quirk on us, I'll jump up to the top, he said, his voice wavering slightly. Uraraka flashed him a thumbs up as they waited, listening for the countdown. Ready. Set. Go. Uraraka leapt onto Izuku's back, arms wrapped around his shoulders as he leapt into the air effortlessly. Her quirk allowed him to send them flying up towards the roof, his tail and ears twitching with nerves as they grew closer and closer. And, release, he said, bracing himself as she brought her hands together. Izuku stumbled as they landed but managed to keep them crashing to the concrete. Uraraka needed a second to get her stomach back under control, but once that was done they grabbed their rope and went about securing it to the railings before they both peered over, apprehensive. Suddenly, Izuku wasn't so sure about his plan. He could feel vertigo hitting as he stared at the pavement far below, phantom pains running through his limbs. Ria. Midoriya. Izuku. He jerked to awareness and looked over, eyes wide. Uraraka gave him a soft smile and thumbs up, eyes crinkling. We got this. Izuku relaxed and nodded, swallowing. He took a deep breath before hopping over the railing and slowly lowering himself down, trying not to panic. He glanced in through the first window, heart pounding behind his ribs as he told himself not to look down. He went down another story, then one more, before Uraraka made a sound over the comms, making him look over at her. I have a visual on Ida, she said, placing herself beside the window so their classmate inside couldn't see her. He has the bomb. Good work, Uraraka, Izuku said, peering around. I think I can get in through this window. I'll distract him from the hallway while you slip into the main room and get the bomb. Keep an eye out for Bakugo. Uraraka made a sound of affirmation and got ready to smash through the window with the hard heels of her pink boots, brows furrowed with determination. Izuku went for the subtler approach, instead digging his claws into the silicone around a smaller panel of glass and cutting it free. Then it was a matter of pushing it in and catching it before it could fall before slipping inside. He sniffed the air and shuddered, smelling the nitroglycerin of Bakugo's quirk, but from its strength he could tell he wasn't around. I'm in, he whispered into his comm, on my mark. He bolted down the hallway suddenly, knocking over what seemed to be a cleaning cart. He slid to a halt beside the door to the room Ida was in, a foot raised. The moment he opened the door, Izuku snapped his foot out, slamming it into the boy's gut and winding him instantly. Now, he shouted, only for the stench of burnt caramel to suddenly overwhelm his nose. You thought I was stupid, huh, Deku? Izuku pushed Ida away and leapt backwards just in time to dodge an exploding fist, his ears pinning against his head as he watched the blonde yank his hand out of the wall. There was a fierce grin on his face, one that promised pain. Go deal with pink cheeks, he snarled back at Ida. Deku's mine. Before his teammate could protest, Bakugo had blasted down the hallway, propelling himself with his explosions as Izuku turned tail and ran, switching to all fours to bounce off a wall and around a tight corner. He was glad his costume had reinforced palms and fingers, it helped lessen the impact on his hands. Get back here you FING coward. Bakugo roared, slamming into a wall like a rhino before taking off after him. Izuku squeaked in alarm and darted for a stairwell, his ears flicking back to keep one sense on Bakugo at all times. He heard him gaining on him and bolted through the door, only to dig his claws in and slam his back against the wall next to it rather than keep going. When Bakugo kicked it open he made his attack, slicing at one of the boy's grenade-like gauntlets along the outer arm and punching it with the other hand, cracking it clean in half. Fucker! Bakugo snarled, stepping forward and letting loose a barrage of small, but quick explosions that Izuku had to put all his focus into dodging. Unfortunately for Bakugo, they were all things he'd seen before. His predictable right hook was countered by slapping his arm away and jabbing his knuckles into his collarbone, then responding to his angry axe kick with a nimble sidestep before sweeping his own leg out to knock Bakugo onto his back. Why yield? Izuku shouted, cursing as Bakugo shot off an explosion right at him before leaping to his feet with an animalistic growl. The two of them danced down the stairs, trading punches and dodging each other's attacks. They were perfectly matched. Izuku received an explosion-powered punch to the chest and was sent flying down the next flight, the wind knocked out of him, before Bakugo shot down after him with his fists raised above his head to bring down in a deadly strike. Izuku raised his legs and bunny-kicked, him right in the stomach, sending him bouncing up the stairs and onto the previous landing. It left them both gasping for air for a moment, struggling to stand back up, but Bakugo recovered first. Screw this. Let's see you humiliate me now. Bakugo snarled, reaching for the pin on his grenade gauntlet. Bakugo, do not pull that pin. It ain't gonna kill him. Probably. Bakugo said with a grin and a snarl. Let's see you dodge this. Izuku had nowhere to run. He was cornered at the bottom of the stairwell with no exits, not even a door to hide behind. He covered his face with his arm as he heard a shrill whistle, the gauntlet heating up far past Bakugo's normal output. This was it. He was going to die here. Boom! Izuku shrieked in pain as his ears ruptured, clapping his hands over them as he collapsed to the ground. He whimpered in pain, palms pressed to either sides of his head, his eyes squeezed shut. After a moment with just the ringing in his ears he realized he wasn't dead or dying and risked looking up, his eyes widening. All Might was there, his hand clasped around Bakugo's gauntlet, having taken the entirety of the blast. The boy's mouth was open and eyes wide with shock, but the surprising thing wasn't the fear in his eyes, it was the expression on All Might's face. He was said. Izuku couldn't hear a thing, though he knew Bakugo was getting yelled at. He was surprised when All Might turned around, speaking to him, before he seemed to realize what was happening. He proceeded to scoop Izuku up and rushed out of the building, though he stopped for a moment and said something else. Bakugo followed them, head hanging and shoulders shaking with anger. He shed his remaining gauntlet and clenched his fists nearly as tightly as he did his teeth, though Izuku yanked his gaze away before he could see his expression. I can't hear anything, he said, his throat vibrating but no sound reaching his ears. He began to panic, breaths hitching as he squirmed in All Might's hold. He knew he was crying but didn't care, too afraid that Bakugo had deafened him. All Might squeezed gently and he looked up to see him smiling brightly. Don't worry, Izuku saw him say, reading his lips the best he could. I am here. More tears fell, though he nodded all the same, trusting the man to carry him to safety. He'd made a promise, after all, and Izuku would hold him to that. Bakugo had been expelled from the hero course on the spot. There was no fanfare, no arguing, no explosions rattling through the entire school. He was expelled, given a pair of quirk cuffs to wear by the police, and that was that. Izuku had spent a few hours in Recovery Girl's office after the incident, but while his eardrums had received damage, they would heal just fine thanks to her quirk. Weeks of healing reduced to the span of a nap. He still couldn't believe sometimes how amazing quirks could be, even being on the receiving end. You're sure you don't want to press charges? Shoyuta asked when he woke up, clearly unhappy. Izuku shook his head and looked down at his lap, feeling oddly guilty. He was sitting up on his hospital bed with his ears and head wrapped in bandages to protect his sensitive ears. There was still a bit of recovery to be done, and Recovery Girl had ordered him to keep them dry for a few days until they were back to 100%. He was lucky to be regaining all of his hearing. I don't think this is a good idea, he stuttered, looking up at Shoyuta. Bakugo is, he's good, deep down, I swear. When we were kids, he promised we'd be heroes together. That doesn't excuse what he did today, Izuku, Shoyuta said, frowning deeper. I'm not saying that. I am saying there's other things happening. His quirk makes him sweat nitroglycerin and absorbs it into his bloodstream. To counteract this, he's constantly also making a lot of adrenaline, Izuku explained. His mood swings, volatile temper, and anger issues aren't just because he's bad. His mom, too, I don't think she treats him right. Please just give him another chance. Before Shoyuta could answer, there was a knock on the door. Izuku was expecting Hisashi, but in walked Nedzu instead, his smile sharp and predatory. I think we can arrange something, Nedzu said with a smile. Why don't we all discuss this over tea? They all moved to Nedzu's office once Recovery Girl discharged Izuku and picked up Hisashi on the way. With both guardians present, it was time to negotiate. I have a proposal, Nedzu started. While I would prefer Bakugo be expelled entirely, I understand you have some concerns, Midoriya-kun. Why yes. I think his mother, I think she abuses him, he said, averting his eyes. I haven't seen her in years, but when we were kids, she'd smack him over the head and call him names. I think that's why he's so violent with others, because he thinks that's normal. Our teachers encouraged it, actually. So, I don't think he really knows any better. Hisashi muttered something under his breath about being too pure for this world, before setting his hand on Izuku's shoulder and squeezing gently. I'm proud of you, Zuzu. You're being a real hero right now, though no one would blame you if you wanted to get a restraining order and leave it at that. And no, it's okay, Izuku promised, though it was a very tempting thought. Though, I don't think I'd like to see him for a while. Alright, with the information we have now, I think I have an idea, Nedzu said, pulling his chair up and tapping away at his computer. He turned his monitor around once he was finished to show everyone, his grin sharp and blinding. The redemption program? Hisashi read, blinking dumbly. Yes. It's a program I proposed many years ago, though it never gained traction. It's a course made for students who have been pushed into villainy by external or internal means. Whether it be abuse, homelessness, their quirks causing damage, or severe bullying. We have more than enough money to spare, what with our sponsorships and all, so the HPSC doesn't need to sign off on this at all, so long as a sufficient amount of our sponsors do, Nedzu explained happily. UA is only partly run by the commission, since it was founded to be as neutral as possible. So, it won't just be Bakugo in this program? Izuku asked timidly. Nedzu shook his head. No. He'll be placed in the general course as a baseline, since he didn't test for the business or support courses, but the majority of his day will be spent in this program. He'll receive quirk support, therapy, and anger management classes, then next year we'll re-evaluate. We'll also send people to his home to investigate, and if we find anything, he'll either be placed in foster care or as a ward of UA with one of our heroes. Any other students flagged for this program will also receive similar care, and anyone can apply even if they don't apply for the hero course itself. Shoyuta wrapped an arm around Izuku as tears started falling down his face. He was so happy. Finally, everyone who'd been a victim of the system could start getting help. Not only Bakugo, but the people he'd bullied as well. Will bullies and victims be separate? He asked suddenly. It'd be really bad for people's trauma if they were put in the same class. Of course, that will be accounted for in every case. We'll pair together different students to prevent both victim trauma and cliques in the aggressor's classes, Nedzu said, smiling. Izuku nodded and sighed in relief, sagging in his seat. While he didn't like Bakugo anymore and they were far from friends, he was glad he'd be getting the help he needed. He remembered how fond of the boy his mother was and how sad her expression had become at every mention of him. It was a good thing they'd caught him before his decline into actual villainy. "When will this happen?" he asked. "As soon as possible," Nedzu replied, standing up. "I will keep you all updated, but for now, I have work to do. Izuku, you're excused for the rest of today, please rest up and feel better soon." Izuku nodded and stood, waving his goodbye as he and his parents headed out. Hisashi would take him home while Aizawa stayed, presumably to chew All Might out for the shitshow that was his first class. Poor guy. It would have been so much fun if Bakugo hadn't done what he did. Izuku arrived early the next day, as usual. Instead of hanging out with his parents as he usually did, he went to his classroom and took his seat behind Ida's spot and dropped his notebook down. He flicked it open and put his pen to paper, brows furrowed. Quirk names and analysis. Everyone else's quirks were named. Creation, Acid, Dark Shadow. Rarely did anyone get to choose the name of the quirk, ending up with uninspired or downright horrible names like Brainwashing or Voice. The first just asking to be bullied and the later horrifically boring, especially for the man it belonged to. Everyone had a voice. So he wrote down some ideas. Rabbit. Bunny. Hair. Rabbit legs. Rabbit body. All were crossed out and he leaned back with a sigh, brows furrowing. Bland, boring, and the first one was taken by the rabbit hero herself, Miruko. He had an opportunity here, he couldn't just waste it. So he kept writing, even when the ideas were terrible. Lepority, Cottontail, Jackrabbit. Izuku? What are you doing here so early? He jumped, his pencil scratching across the page, his eyes darting up to see Uraraka standing in front of him, concern on her face. Momo entered behind her, as did Todoroki, the two of them heading to take their seats. Ida wasn't far behind and joined Uraraka, curious as to what they were talking about. Oh, I get a ride from my, parents, Izuku said nervously. They get to work early and taking the train isn't very convenient. Oh really? I guess that means you missed the press, then, she said, walking to one of the windows. Izuku blinked and stood up, following behind her and gasping at the crowd he saw outside. He saw a familiar shock of yellow hair, presumably Present Mike shooing them off so students could get through. Are they allowed to do that? We're all M-minors, he said, glancing at Uraraka and Ida. Ida huffed and shook his head. As long as they don't publish our names or faces, they can technically ask us for interviews. They're trying to get information on All Might, since it was just released that he's teaching here. Izuku frowned and looked back to the crowd with distaste. No wonder his parents hated the press so much, they were all vultures looking for a scrap to publish in their articles. More of his classmates filtered in, some joining them at the window, others taking their seats, but the majority gossiped about the crowd out front, both concerned and excited. Everyone sit down. Eraserhead's sudden appearance startled many of the class into rushing to their seats, including Izuku. Once everyone was quiet, Eraserhead spoke, already looking completely done with everything going on. As you all probably know, various news outlets gathered outside the gates of UA this morning. In response to their harassment of various students, we've hereby banned them from UA property. That being said, Eraserhead drawled, stepping back and picking up a piece of chalk. Today's lesson will be on media presence. Don't thank me, this wasn't my idea. Collective groans filled the class, accompanied by quite a few heads thunking down on desks. Eraserhead smirked into his scarf, always pleased to find new ways to torture his students. Tamura stood outside the gates of UA, his hands stuffed into his hoodie pocket with his fingers curled into his palms. He glared up at the sparkling glass and gleaming metal, wishing he could turn it all to dust right then and there. Instead he looked at the gate itself, eyes narrowing. Focus. He had to stay focused. He pulled his right hand free and held it out, placing all 5 fingers against the cool metal. Immediately his quirk activated, decaying the molecules to nothing but dust under his fingertips. He stepped back as the horde of reporters around him spotted the disintegrating door, muttering among themselves, their excitement growing. But not quickly enough. Time for a nudge. Hey! Now's our chance, he shouted. We gotta get pictures, this'll make headlines. All he had to do was step back and watch them all charge forward like a stampede, cursing at one another about equipment while simultaneously chattering to their cameras at the same time. He had to give it to them, they were good at multitasking. Tamura stepped through and jogged off to the left, hiding behind a large tree planted behind a short hedge, just in time for the heroes to arrive to try and wrangle the crowd into some semblance of control. It was a good thing he'd been training his stealth stat, it was paying off. Already he could see students flooding the doors, quite a few in a panic thanks to the alarm he could hear blaring loudly. It was laughably easy to slip past them, using his skinny frame to good use in order to slip past the throng of shrieking children. Then it was just a matter of remembering the map he'd had a contact procure for him to get to the staff room. God, distraction mechanics were so OP. Once inside, he inspected each desk carefully for clues. Now was the puzzle section of the level, something he'd always been good at. If there was one thing he had going for him, it was his brain. He was smart, alarmingly so, hence why his sensei had sent him on his side quest instead of one of his other goons. Present Mick's desk was easy to pick out, seeing as it was covered in his own merch and, was that a kid's drawing? It was pretty good. He set that little tidbit aside for later and moved on, his eyes landing on a yellow sleeping bag shoved beneath a desk. He scanned its surface and breathed out, head tilting to one side as he put together the clues he saw. Empty mugs, a still warm cup of coffee that said, "Have a nice day," though upon further inspection it had a middle finger on the bottom. He snorted in amusement and made another mental note to ask Kurojairi to order him one. However, a pair of yellow goggles with strange slats caught his eye. He knew those goggles anywhere. They were eraser heads. Tamura swiped them immediately and shoved them into his pocket. Surely Sensei wouldn't mind if he picked up some extra loot, right? He noted another drawing tacked up on the wall, the same artist as whoever drew Present Mix. Interesting. Finally he reached the desk he was looking for. All Might. It was hilarious to look at despite the itching it brought to his skin. Everything was All Might themed from his chair, to the action figures lined up on the edge, even his pen had a small cartoonish head of himself. What a narcissist. He swiped that very pen, promising himself to dust it later so he could imagine him scrambling to try and find it. Then he grabbed what he was looking for. His schedule. They must have nerfed the difficulty for this mission, he muttered to himself, flipping through the pages with both pinkies raised. It didn't take long to photocopy and print the page before setting the book down where he'd found it. With the paper in hand he pulled out his phone from his pants, shooting off a text to Kurojairi before heading to the supply closet they agreed to exfiltrate out of. Better get some good gold for this, he muttered, stepping through the misty portal with not even a glance behind him. Izuku wouldn't call himself lucky to have hearing damage, but at the very least he was grateful for the headphones he'd been given by Recovery Girl to protect his ears while they healed. It meant while everyone else was wincing from the shrieking alarm, he could stand up and get his bearings. He rushed into the hall, only vaguely aware of the others following him, and hopped over the crowd to land on a windowsill, his eyes widening. They weren't under attack, it was just the reporters. Hey, Momo, he shouted, turning around. See, can you make me a megaphone? The girl nodded and turned away, using her jacket as cover so she could bear enough skin to produce the item. Once it was in her hand she reeled back her arm and threw it over the crowd, right towards Izuku. He raised his hand and caught it, fumbling for a moment before standing up as tall as he could, breathing in deep. Hey! Everyone calm down, it's just the press that have broken in, he said, a tinge of guilt running through him as Jairu flinched again. After a few moments the student settled, looking to him for guidance. He wilted under the attention and tossed the megaphone back to Momo, throwing her under the bus. She didn't seem to mind, though, being much more of a leader than he was. He noticed Todoroki standing next to her, his eyes fixed on him. Izuku swallowed and glanced away, unnerved. Did the other know his gaze felt like ice? While she handled the crowd, he pulled out his phone and texted one of his parents, worried. How did the press get in? Realistically they wouldn't be able to even with a strength quirk, since the doors were reinforced. Maybe one of them used their quirk? Baby Bunny, Papa? What's going on? Papa Mike, press got in. Papa Mike, we're handling it, DW Heartsuit. Baby Bunny, how? Papa Mike, not sure yet. Just keep everyone from panicking, okay? Baby Bunny, way ahead of you. Papa Mike, that's my boy. Oh, Heartsuit. Izuku lifted his head from his phone and peered outside again, comforted to see his papa's familiar banana hair even from where he was standing. Even so, his mind was racing. The press had been told they weren't allowed, so why would they do something so drastic? Something wasn't right, but he couldn't focus on it right now. He turned and joined the rest of his class, comforting himself with the fact that no one would be stupid enough to attack a school full of heroes and hero students. Right? Because of the false alarm, students weren't sent home, though some teachers had to be excused in order to deal with the reporters still lingering outside. It was a mess and a half, but UA was a school of opportunity, so of course they'd use this as a lesson to be learned. But once that was over and done with, there was something even more important to be done. Today you'll be picking your class president, Eraserhead said, already slumped in the chair at his desk. I don't care how you do it, just be quiet about it, got it? He wiggled into his sleeping bag and plopped onto the ground, exhausted. Izuku was aware of what he called his battery, a term Shoyuta used to describe his energy levels throughout the day. In order to recharge, he needed to nap, which he did intermittently throughout the day in his hideous yellow sleeping bag. Some days he envied the man. A nap sounded pretty good right about then. Let's vote. Ida proposed, standing up. I will pass out pieces of paper for everyone to write their candidate on. Then I will tally up the votes and write them on the board. Everyone agreed, pulling out their pencils while Ida handed out paper. Then once everyone was done, he gathered them up and began to count names. The tally added up to this. Izuku, 4. Momo, 3. Ida, 3. A tie for vice president. Ida proclaimed, chopping his hand wildly. How interesting. Izuku squeaked and quickly stood up, though it made his heart race to do so. I don't want to be president. Thank you for your votes, but I'll pass, thank you. Immediately Momo and Ida started to debate who would be president, drawing the attention of the whole class. Izuku sighed in relief and slumped down, glad to be out of the spotlight. He felt those icy eyes again and turned, meeting Todoroki's gaze. His expression was unreadable and it made Izuku squirm, but he waved meekly, earning himself a slight widening of the other's eyes. The bunny grinned when he received a wave back before turning back around to find the debate finished. Thank you for having me as your class president, Momo said, bowing graciously. I promise to do my best. And I as well. As vice president, I will represent our class respectfully. Ida said, nearly taking his own head off on Aoyama's desk in the process. Izuku applauded with the rest of the class, only to flinch and squeak when Eraserhead woke up to face them all with his quirk, irritated. Whoops. Does everyone have their permission forms? Eraserhead asked, standing outside in front of the long bus that would be transporting them that morning. Yes? Good. The class of 1A milled about in a few separate clumps, talking quietly to one another. Izuku was letting Shinso lean on him, the boy complaining about it being too early, while Momo and Ida discussed their latest quiz and the answers they'd gotten, and Tsu and Uraraka showed each other pictures of their siblings. It was a nice way to spend the morning, though Izuku found himself worried by Eraserhead's tapping foot. What was he waiting for? I am here. Sorry I'm late. Everyone gasped as All Might arrived in his hero costume, this time the current iteration. He rubbed the back of his head sheepishly and apologized profusely to Eraserhead, who looked about ready to cuff the man over the head. Unfortunately, he couldn't reach it, so he settled for chewing him out instead. Ahem, yes, All Might said, sufficiently cowed. I'm truly sorry for being late, everyone. I got held up on the way here. Now that I am here, though, it is time to board the bus. We are going to the USJ. Universal Studios Japan? Kaminari squealed, earning himself fond sighs from Kirishima and Mina, who seemed to have adopted him. No, dummy, he means the unforeseen simulation joint. Kirishima said, lining up with the rest of the class as Ida instructed. Still don't know what that means, though. The unforeseen simulation joint is the world's most advanced training facility for various natural disasters. Uraraka piped up, interrupting Momo in the process. She apologized profusely before continuing. It's meant to prepare trainee heroes for potential disasters, like earthquakes, floods, and forest fires in a controlled environment. The class let out a collective ooh, their excitement growing even more. Everyone boarded the bus and took their seats, with Izuku sitting down next to Shinso and behind Uraraka and Tsu. The purplet immediately conked out with his head on Izuku's shoulder, a bright flush crossing the latter's face that he was immediately teased about, much to his chagrin. I'll give you a brief overview of today's class, All Might said, standing at the front of the bus with his back hunched so his head didn't knock into the top of the vehicle. Today will be a mix of practical and theoretical. We will be meeting 13 there, who will be your primary instructor for today. Wow! 13. Uraraka gasped, whirling around to face Tsu and then Izuku. She's my favorite. She inspires me to be a rescue hero just like her. That's amazing. Izuku said, eyes sparkling. Tsu nodded in agreement, her tongue sticking out of her mouth as she smiled gently. 13 will run us through some of the drills she typically practices at her agency with her fellow rescue heroes and sidekicks so that you all can understand what exactly goes into being a rescue hero, All Might continued, his grin blinding. Then we will discuss theoretical scenarios, then tackle one of the prepared disaster zones. With the explanation finished, he sat down across from Eraserhead, being too large to sit next to him without squashing him. The class started chattering like birds, growing increasingly more rowdy as they approached the massive domed facility in the distance. It was huge, with a circumference of several football fields, made of concrete and thick glass. Izuku had his face pressed against the window, gaping at it openly, in awe. It was so much bigger in person. Alright, everyone get your costumes from the luggage compartment and head to the change rooms, Eraserhead said once parked, quickly exiting the vehicle before the excited students could trample him. All Might wasn't as lucky. Once changed, everyone met up inside, where 13, All Might, and Eraserhead were waiting at the top of the stairs. Izuku looked around, both at the massive simulation zones and his classmates. He promptly balked at both Momo's costumes and Kirishima's, squeaking in horror. "What are you wearing?" he gasped, quickly raising his eyes. Kirishima looked down at himself, clueless, while Momo just blushed and looked away, lifting her arms to cross them over her exposed chest. "What? I think this is super manly," Kirishima said with a grin. "I just told them I needed skin access, I wasn't specific enough," Momo muttered quietly. Then Izuku spotted a pair of floating gloves and nearly fainted. Hagakure wasn't wearing anything. Aizawa-sensei," Izuku shouted, hopping over everyone's heads to land in front of his father, face red with both anger and second-hand embarrassment. "And Momo, Kirishima, and Hagakure's costumes need to be scrapped and the support department contacted. Just look." Eraserhead looked over and slapped his forehead with a groan, shaking his head as he looked away. "FS Sake, pardon my language. I have spare uniforms, please change into them, all three of you. These costumes are inappropriate for children. I apologize, I'll also be talking with the support department." All Might wisely said nothing, not wanting to gain any attention. He hadn't even noticed the costumes himself, being too focused on the fights and his lesson to pay attention. Thank you, Sensei," Momo said with relief, quickly gathering the uniforms for herself and Hagakure, while Kirishima grabbed his with a pout. He understood, though. He'd just have the support department put a muscle shirt or something underneath. Once they returned, 13 began her first lesson. The importance of human life. "You are all here because you want to use your quirks to save lives. I'm here to teach you exactly how to do that, because one wrong move and no matter your intentions, you could get someone killed," she said, holding up her hand. "At my very fingertips, I can create black holes. I could very easily SCK someone up and kill them in an instant, but instead I use it to pull rubble off of trapped victims. It requires a very precise sense of control over my quirk, which is what I want to teach you today. Control is just as important as power." Izuku's eyes drifted, the hairs on the back of his neck raising up. That was weird, the air smelled like ozone. He found himself staring at the center of the USJ, eyes narrowed, but he wasn't the only one. Tokoyami and Tsu were, too, their instincts flaring and making their skin and feathers crawl. "Sensei?" Tsu said, glancing at Izuku and Tokoyami. "Something's in the square." Eraserhead turned around just in time to see a tiny black speck appear, before bursting into a massive cloud of black smoke. The class gasped and screamed in surprise as a hand reached through, gripping the edge of the portal and pushing it open further. A single red eye could be seen before the person on the other side stepped forward, wearing 14 severed hands on his body, including one on his face that obscured his features. "Everyone's here," the man said, sounding pleased. Eraserhead. 13. All Might. And of course, Class 1A. Eraserhead, 13, protect the students, All Might said, stepping in front of everyone with one arm raised. "Call for backup." "Can't, there's no signal," Jiru said, her phone having already been whipped out. Eraserhead tried his comms, but he had no luck either. They'd been blocked off. That's cheating," the villain taunted, lifting a hand to scratch at his neck. "You're not allowed to call for reinforcements." "Too bad those rules don't apply to me, I got cheat codes." Kurojiri. The portal opened up further and further, smaller ones opening up all across the USJ. Hordes of villains poured through, with all manner of quirks and weapons. Guns, knives, gun hands, knife heads, almost anything you could think of. And all of them had malice in their eyes, their grins too wide and terrifying. Finally, a massive, hulking figure emerged with oil-black skin, a bird beak, and its brain exposed. It moved in jerky motions, its eyes unfocused, and it was obvious something wasn't right. Izuku wanted to puke just looking at it, his instincts going wild. Then he realized something. He couldn't hear its heartbeat. New plan. Eraserhead. "We'll hold them off while 13 evacuates the students," All Might said, cracking his knuckles. "Class 1A, do not engage. Worry about yourselves, your teachers will handle this." He leapt into the fray without another word, letting out a bellowing cry as he slammed his fist into the ground, sending up a shockwave that sent villains flying left and right. Eraserhead boosted himself off of his back and into the air, his capture scarf weaving and looping around half a dozen people before he yanked it taut and sent them crashing face-first into the concrete. Neither of the heroes were experts at working as a team, let alone with each other, but they had an unspoken agreement. Stay back to back, aim away from each other, and protect the students. Everyone head back to the doors. 13 called out, arms out as she backed everyone up. Please group up and try to stay calm. Her pleas fell on deaf ears as black portals opened up all around them, cutting off their escape route. The students raised their fists, or tails, ear jacks, and tongues, preparing for a scuffle should the need arise. Greetings, students. We are the League of Villains, please do not resist, the warp villain said, forming his head above the largest of the shadow gates. Step back. 13 ordered, throwing a hand out protectively. Izuku grabbed Ida by the arm and pulled him down to his level, eyes wide. Ida-kun, you have to run. We'll distract the warp villain while you go and get help. I can't just leave you all, he protested, only for Izuku to shake him gently. You'll be saving us. We're just students. Please, Tenya, Izuku begged, eyeing the front doors. Ida blinked, stunned by the use of his name, before he snapped out of it and nodded stiffly. He ducked down and made his way to the side of the group, where he could split off and flank the villain easier. That left Izuku to try and make a distraction. Or maybe not, because 13 raised her hand and uncapped her gloves, her black hole quirk activating immediately. It began to SCK the villain in, and Ida took the chance to run, making a break for it, only for a gate to open up directly behind 13. Before their very eyes they watched their teacher be torn apart, her costume the first to go before hair and skin started peeling away too. She screamed in pain, quirk flickering out, before she collapsed onto her back, out cold. Uraraka screamed and was at her side immediately, trying her very best to roll her over. Jairu joined her, balling up her coat to apply pressure, though there was far too much of a wound for just her hands to be enough. But the distraction of 13 managed to distract the villain, and Ida slammed through the front doors, taking off down the road. Ah, that poses a problem, the warp villain said, rather calm all things considered. No matter, they won't get here in time to rescue you all. Izuku felt the pull of gravity and gasped, shrieking as he began to fall. One moment he was standing, ready to attack, the next he was plummeting from very high up, his life flashing before his eyes. He was starting to get tired of that happening, honestly. He couldn't do much more than scream, arms and legs flailing wildly, before something wet and slimy wrapped around his stomach, knocking the wind out of him as he was forcibly yanked out of the air. Izuku fell onto the deck of a ship and rolled, wheezing and gasping for air as he quivered on the ground. He saw 2 eyes, then 4, one set green and the other purple. Shinso and Tsu. Izuku, Karo, Tsu said, relieved, though her face didn't change much. I nearly didn't catch you. You were flailing a lot. Are you okay? Shinso asked, holding out a hand to help him up. Izuku swallowed and nodded, grabbing hold and hoisting himself up. He looked around and cursed under his breath, ears flattening against his skull. The shipwreck zone, the last place he wanted to be. It was made all the worse by the villains swimming towards them, circling like sharks. We're so effed, Izuku said faintly. Tsu couldn't carry more than one person at a time, so while Izuku thought of a plan, it was up to the trio to beat back the oncoming villains. Despite All Might's order, they had no choice. It was fight or die, and the villains were out for blood. Shinso yanked his head back just in time to dodge the swipe of a knife in the claws of a shark villain, whose teeth were bared and beady black eyes wide open and focused solely on a cut on the boy's cheek. It was all Shinso could do to duck and backpedal away, at least before Tsu's tongue came to the rescue once again, this time to smack the villain so hard that he was thrown and clotheslined against the boat's railing. He sank to the ground and didn't get back up. Izuku, meanwhile, had leapt onto the roof and was engaged in hand-to-hand with a slim woman with eels for hair. Each time she punched was followed up by at least 3 snapping heads, his blocks useless when each one was intercepted by gnashing teeth and blunt heads. Eventually he was backed upright to the very edge, his foot slipping for a moment as he took a step too far, before he managed to regain his footing and look back at her, unable to keep his fear from leaking into his expression. Any last words, hero? The villainess taunted, before bursting out into hysterical laughter. Oh wait. You aren't a hero yet. How shameful, you won't even make it to your graduation. This wasn't working. Izuku was agile, yes, but this villain was far more experienced and would outlast him at this rate. He had to figure out a way to end the fight quickly. Wait, he said, flinging his hands up right before she lunged. I do have last words, please let me say them. The woman paused, frowning, before nodding for him to hurry up. Your quirk makes you focus on your upper body, he said, eyes scanning her form. Your punches are strong but your center of gravity is higher because your eels take up so much of your weight. So that means your weakness is your legs. Izuku lunged forward, keeping low as the woman tried to angle her body to punch down at him. He was right, her footwork was clumsy at best, so one sweep of his leg was enough to take her down. Then it was just a matter of grabbing her by the ankle and shoving her over the edge, back into the water. Hopefully she could breathe underwater. "Tsu! Take Shinso and jump for it," he shouted, turning to face another villain, this one a smaller guy with a blowgun in his hand. "When you land, call it out." Tsu croaked out an affirmative before grabbing Shinso and jumping before he could even brace himself. The boy cried out, clinging to her arm, eyes wide as they flew through the air. Izuku had to spend a moment or two dodging poison-filled darts before he had Tsu call out. He darted forward and leapt off the man's chest, using him as a launch pad to leap into the air, flying over the villains' heads. He saw Tsu's tongue coming for him and sighed in relief, glad his plan would work. He was yanked out of the air once again, though this time he'd expected it and braced his middle, even managing to land on his feet. "Okay, we gotta get back to the entrance," he said, grabbing Shinso's hand. "Get on my back, it'll be faster." Shinso blinked and gaped for a moment, face flushing, before Izuku's light tug on his hand snapped him out of it. He could think later, right now was a time for action. Once on the other's back he held on tightly, allowing Izuku to use his full range of motion to sprint back towards the center of the USJ. The three could only hope they didn't arrive at a bloodbath. Tamura had brought plenty of people with him to throw at All Might, buying time so he could study his strats and memorize his move set. Occasionally he'd glance at Eraserhead too, since his quirk was the perfect opposite to his own and could possibly tamper with the Nomu he'd brought with him. He scratched at his neck, eyes narrowing under his father's hand on his face, studying him closely. He counted the seconds between Eraserhead's blinks, when his quirk deactivated before immediately reactivating. He narrowed it down to a small window of opportunity, the perfect moment to strike him down and eliminate him from the match. "I think it's time to test out the Nomu," he said, tilting his head to one side. "What do you think, Kurogyri?" "I agree," the warp villain said, his attention split between his charge and the remaining students lingering on the steps above the square. "Nomu. Kill All Might," Tamura said, a grin spreading across his face. The undead creature let out a warbling screech and leapt into the air, buffeting Tamura and Kurogyri with wind in its wake. It raised its arms and slammed them down, only to be caught far too easily by All Might's hands. Hadn't he just been fighting? His awareness stat must have been high. "I guess that's why he's number one," Tamura said, turning to Eraserhead. "I'll deal with him. Kurogyri, keep an eye on the brats." Without waiting for a response he ran forward, hands held low with his fingers spread. He came up behind the man and lunged, a hand outstretched, only to be met with a pair of furious red eyes. His attack was deflected easily and he jumped away, a lazy grin crossing his face. "Ah, Eraserhead," he cooed, pretending to swoon. "You're so cool. You're my favorite hero, you know." Instead of the usual, stand down, villain he was expecting, Eraserhead surprised him. He whipped out his capture scarf, the loops flying through the air before wrapping themselves around Tamura's shoulders and torso. He huffed in amusement and gripped a length of the scarf tightly in one hand, lowering his head to peer at him from beneath fingers and bangs. "What, no monologue?" he asked, amused. Eraserhead narrowed his eyes and he counted down in his head, his smile only growing. 3, 2, 1. The scarf turned to dust in his hands and he escaped with ease, showing off great dexterity as he ducked and spun away from the hero's retaliating strikes. He was being much more wary of his hands, which meant he'd figured out Tamura's quirk, but that didn't matter. He just needed his attention away from the Nomu. They were both nearly knocked off their feet by a shockwave from behind, both glancing over their shoulders to see All Might and the Nomu beating the ever-loving sheet out of each other. All Might had a bloody nose and a few cuts, while the Nomu's extensive wounds were closing up before their very eyes. Tamura was pleased, the Nomu was a success thus far. "What is that thing?" he heard Eraserhead ask as he turned back around. "You like it?" "It's called a Nomu," Tamura said, tilting his head. "It's the perfect weapon needed to kill All Might." Eraserhead's eyes widened and he glanced towards it, only for Tamura to fill his vision instead. The blue-haired villain tooted, shaking his head in faux disappointment. "You're fighting me, Eraserhead-san." "That means your eyes are on me," Tamura said, leaning forward before lunging into a sprint, a yell on his tongue. Izuku and the others crept along the outskirts of the central plaza, keeping their heads down and staying out of sight for the most part. They hid behind a length of shrubbery and peeked their heads over, both Tsu and Izuku blending in with their matching hair colors, while Shinso drew the hood of his costume to ensure his wild purple hair didn't give him away. What they saw didn't comfort them, exactly. There were dozens of villains strewn across the ground, unconscious or too injured to move. A few were still standing, albeit with bruises littering their bodies and clutching broken or dislocated limbs. But it wasn't them they found themselves staring at, but the two pairs of fighters tearing up the floor, leaving dust and rubble in their wake. All Might, Tsu whispered, eyes wide, drawing Izuku's eyes away from where his father and the blue-haired villain were fighting and towards the number 1 hero. All Might was beaten and bloody at this point, panting heavily as he took a moment between deadly blows to recover some of his strength. The creature had been beaten into the dirt, its limbs twisted and one entirely blown off, but it was healing before their very eyes, a new arm sprouting and replacing the old one, while shattered bones and torn skin knitted back together in a grotesque display of lattice-like flesh and muscle that whipped across injuries, pulling it back together. Izuku felt nauseous and Shinso was gagging beside him, but he couldn't make himself look away. All Might punched it again, so hard that it was sent flying backwards, but it stood up again, unharmed. Its skin had rippled like water, drawing the force away, and Izuku gasped. "It's got multiple quirks," he exclaimed, before slapping his hands over his mouth. Izuku's head turned slowly, staring directly into a pair of red eyes as they spotted him. The blue-haired villain smiled and glanced back at Eraserhead, eyes narrowing when he saw the heroes. Drawn-up shoulders. "Smart kid, huh? Bet you're proud to be teaching him," he cooed, bending and relaxing his fingers. "What I wouldn't give to have someone with an intelligence stat like that in my party." Izuku grabbed Shinso again, ducking to the side as the villain lunged for him. Tsu leapt the other way, separating the group and forcing them on the defensive. Izuku wasn't sure what the villain's quirk did, but judging by his hands and the wreckage he'd left in the plaza, he didn't want to find out. "The hell are you doing this for, huh, fingers?" Shinso managed to shout, stumbling along after Izuku, barely able to keep his feet under him. "Wouldn't you like to know, whether the villain froze, eyes widening, stopping in his tracks. Stand up straight," Shinso said, terrified of the mind he currently had in his grasp. The villain did so, his height far taller than it had originally seemed thanks to his slouch. His back even cracked as his spine straightened. Eraserhead ran towards them, quickly wrapping the villain's arms and hands in his capture weapon, binding him up tightly. He made sure to wrap his pinkies and across his palm, ensuring he wouldn't be able to use his quirk. "Sheet, I hate to do this, but I need you three to keep him contained. Try not to release him, okay, Shinso?" Eraserhead said, looking at the boy. "If you can't, that's all right, he shouldn't be able to go anywhere right now. I have to deal with the warp villain." Shinso nodded, as did Izuku and Tsu. Then he left, running up the stairs to disable the warp villain and rescue the students still trapped on the stairs. "Zuku, I'm scared," Shinso said faintly, turning to look at him. Izuku swallowed, grabbing his hand and holding onto it tightly. He grabbed Tsu's too, who looked like she needed comfort. At that moment, none of them felt like heroes. It was quiet. Tamura was faintly aware of what was going on around him, but he was more focused on what was going on inside this headspace of his. Or rather, what wasn't. There was nothing. When was the last time it was quiet? When was the last time he'd sat down and not heard the faint whispers of his sensei in his head, controlling his every thought, or the voices of his parents reminding him that he was a monster? He couldn't remember. It was a relief. "Shinso? Your nose is bleeding, Karo," Tsu said with concern. Shinso wiped his nose with the back of his hand and stared down at the smear of crimson left behind. His head was throbbing with pain, the feeling like hot rods being jammed into the backs of his eyeballs. "I can't keep this up," he rasped. "And my head hurts." Izuku squeezed his shoulder in encouragement, though his expression was grim. "Don't worry, you can drop it. He won't be going anywhere, okay?" Shinso stared at him for a moment before nodding and closing his eyes, breathing in, out, and then snapping the connection. Immediately his eyes rolled back and his knees buckled, Izuku crying out in alarm as he caught him around the chest before he could fall to the ground. His head felt like it was splitting in two. The villain snapped awake, dazed, a little gasp leaving his mouth. He shook his head and noticed his bindings, the temporary calm he'd had wrapped around him suddenly fading as he realized what exactly had happened. He let out an angry growl and inhaled sharply, whipping his head around to glare at the three with sheer hatred. "You cheaters," he snarled, jerking in his bindings. "NOMU. Kill them." Izuku pushed Shinso and Tsu away with a kick of both legs, sending himself flying back in the process just in time to avoid the meteor that was the Nomo coming down where they'd been standing. He landed clumsily on his butt and rolled backwards, managing to get upright so he could run the hell away. He bolted, his heart beating so fast he could barely tell apart one beat from the next. It took the Nomo one stride to match four of his own, and it was quickly gaining on him. "Izuku!" He looked up to see his father staring at him, wide-eyed and terrified. His eyes lit up red and he felt the familiar wash of his quirk over him, but like many with heteromorph mutations, it didn't do much to him. The Nomu, though? Izuku leapt off of a wall and backflipped over the lumbering hulk, its fist crashing through the concrete where he'd just been. He dragged his claws down its back, leaving deep gouges, and found that it wasn't healing anymore. It wasn't quite the chance he was looking for, but he could avoid death for a few more seconds so All Might could catch up. He ducked underneath a powerful swing, using every single drop of knowledge from training with Shoyuta to stay alive. Don't try to stop a punch, but roll with it, flow like water around the stones that are your opponent. He tried his best, of course, but it felt more like fighting a mountain while he was a stagnant puddle. Each blow came closer and closer to killing him, until the Nomu caught him in the side, breaking his ribs and throwing him clear across the square. Izuku wheezed and clutched his chest, curling up into a ball as he struggled to breathe. Tears rolled down his face from the pain and fear, his ears picking up the sound of the approaching monster. He didn't want to die, not anymore. A thunderous crash sounded behind him, two titans meeting in midair. All Might let out a sonorous war cry and slammed the Nomu into the ground, grabbing it by the head so he could pound it into the concrete over and over until its brain and face were little more than mush. Izuku! Izuku heard his father cry, but he couldn't move. He squeezed his eyes shut and covered his head, praying for everything to be over soon. Tamura growled in frustration, stomping a foot childishly as he watched Eraserhead race to the kid's side. He scratched at his throat, harder and harder until he drew blood, until a pair of hands grabbed his own and pulled them away. Tamura-kun, I suggest we retreat, Kurojiiri said slowly, having appeared in front of him once he'd learned of the Nomu's brutal defeat. We shall try again another time. Tamura could almost see the game over screen floating before him, the mark of failure that would be permanently etched in his history. He feared Sensei's reaction and took a step back, beginning to hyperventilate. He couldn't fail, failure meant punishment and punishment meant Tamura, Kurojiiri urged, opening a portal behind him. We must go. The front doors slammed open, a barrage of heroes flooding into the USJ. Snipe, Present Mike, Vlad King, the entire faculty had arrived, even Nedzu. 4 gunshots went off, each one finding their marks, sinking into Tamura's shoulders and both thighs. With a pained yell he fell backwards, disappearing into the warp gate and landing flat on his back somewhere else. He clutched one shoulder and thigh with one hand each, his entire body shaking. He'd failed. Izuku struggled to draw in air, gaping like a fish where he lay on the ground. Every shift of his ribs sent agony along his side and moved what definitely shouldn't have been moving. He vaguely registered being rolled onto his side, people talking above him as black spots filled his vision. You're okay, Izuku. Your rib punctured your lung and air is filling your chest cavity, he heard, turning his head to look. Eraserhead, Dad. Dad was here. Dita dash. Don't speak, the hero shushed, scrambling with one of his pouches. You don't have the air to risk. Where are the ambulances? There were other heroes around, some sitting down Izuku's classmates while others began gathering up villains in a group at the center of the plaza. He didn't see the blue-haired villain among them. They're almost here, ETA 5 minutes. He doesn't have 5 minutes, his dad snarled, yanking something out of the pouch. I gotta make a hole to relieve the pressure. All Might, hold him down, this is gonna SCK. Izuku saw All Might come into his view and blinked as he gripped his arms with gentle hands. The man smiled at him, though it was tight around the edges. Close your eyes, my boy, he said, squeezing gently. He felt a pinch beneath his armpit, then pressure, then pain. Izuku screamed, struggling in All Might's grip as Shoyuta cursed and none so gently shoved a tube into the hole he'd made between the boy's ribs. Air hissed out and taking a break was suddenly easier, though the pain didn't ease. Sleep, Zuku, Shoyuta urged, pushing All Might out of the way to push Izuku's damp hair out of his face. It's okay, you'll be okay. Izuku cried quietly and nodded weakly, the hand on his good side coming up to grip his father's wrist tightly. It didn't last long, his hold loosening as he finally passed out, the paramedics arriving shortly afterwards. They loaded him and several others into ambulances, with Shoyuta riding with his son and leaving Present Mike in charge of the rest of his class who were uninjured. He trusted him to keep his kids safe as he took care of their number one. He held Izuku's hand as the paramedics fluttered over him, fitting an oxygen mask over his face and inserting an IV into the hand Shoyuta wasn't holding. He closed his eyes and let a third paramedic bandage his arm, the damage thankfully superficial. He'd need a skin graft, but he was all right. Everyone was alive, he knew, but that didn't mean his heart wasn't still pounding. That warp villain, his voice sounded all too familiar. Tamura. At the sound of his name, Tamura flinched, his breath catching in his chest. He rolled carefully onto his side, his wounds aching distantly as he fought to stand up. He couldn't afford to look any more pathetic than he already did. I'm disappointed in you, boy. He managed to get to his feet, his thighs burning with pain. He let his arms go limp at his sides and hung his head, ashamed of himself. He couldn't stop shaking from what he convinced himself was anger. Deep down he knew it was really fear. Your plan was half-baked at best, your lackeys weak and disloyal, and you destroyed one of my Nomu. If we didn't get valuable information from your silly little quest, I'd kill you for your insolence. Tamura flinched, though it wasn't the first time he'd been threatened with death. He peered at the television in the corner of the rundown bar, at the blinking red dot in the corner. His sensei never showed his face these days, but he was always watching. I'm sorry, sensei, he rasped, lifting his fingers to claw at his throat, tearing open old scabs to try and sate the itch that crawled up his throat. I thought I could win. You were arrogant. No matter, though. You're still far too valuable to me, so I will let you off with a light punishment. I won't heal your wounds, you'll have to have Kurojairi deal with them on your own. Consider it a reminder of your failure. The screen turned off, but Tamura wasn't foolish enough to think that meant Sensei had turned off the cameras in the corners. It didn't stop him from falling to his knees, though, unable to stay upright any longer. Tamura, whispered his caretaker, Kurojairi's misty hand reaching out from the side in offering. Shall I assist you? Tamura swallowed and nodded, lifting a shaky hand to grab Kurojairi's own. With his help they staggered to the bathroom, where he was sat down on a stool and told to stay put. It wasn't like he was going anywhere, but Tamura didn't bother pointing that out, simply observing from under his father's hand as the mist villain dug through a first aid kit. Using his malleable body, he applied pressure to all of Tamura's wounds, apologizing quietly as he hissed. He had Tamura take off the hands, yes, even father, I'm afraid, and set them aside, giving Kurojairi more room to work. His shirt and pants were cut off and discarded, revealing a stick-thin body with zero fat and thin strings of muscles clinging to his bones. He was skinny, too skinny, and covered in scars. Self-inflicted scratches along his wrists and neck, silvery lines from knives, and countless others rendered unrecognizable thanks to being layered over top of each other into pinkish-red blobs of scar tissue. Despite trusting Kurojairi with his life, Tamura curled into himself, ashamed. Your wounds all have entry and exit points, Kurojairi said softly, dabbing at his left shoulder with an alcohol pad. Aside from your left shoulder, nothing critical was hit, though it seems the bullet caught your collarbone here. It's severely fractured. Tamura nodded, dull eyes focused on the floor as he drifted away. He didn't flinch when the wound was stitched up, nor when Kurojairi rotated the arm to test range of motion before wrapping it up and putting his arm into a sling. Even a few experimental snaps didn't catch his attention, so Kurojairi simply sighed and continued, a little glad he wasn't aware for the duration of his treatment. The wounds were pretty painful. Here, he said afterwards, pushing 2 pills into Tamura's hand and a glass of water into the other. This will help you sleep. Tamura popped the former in his mouth and drank deeply, draining the entire glass before handing it back. Kurojairi portaled it away and helped Tamura up, though when it was obvious he wouldn't be able to walk to his room on his own, he lifted him up, ignoring the quiet hiss of protest. It's all right. I'm here to care for you, yes? Kurojairi reasoned, walking down the hallway. Tamura said nothing, fixing his gaze on one of the mist man's vest buttons instead. Kurojairi set Tamura down on his bed, dragging his blanket over him before stepping back. He had the quiet urge to tease and tuck him in, though it slipped away as quickly as it had come. He thought back to the man from earlier, Eraserhead. He'd seemed so familiar, but he just couldn't place his face. He waved the thought off and left, leaving the door open a crack in case his charge needed him. Tamura curled up on himself, hugging a pillow tightly, exhaustion weighing down his very bones. He closed his eyes and dreamed of a black-haired girl and a dog with orange fur, its eyes so soft and innocent before his own hands turned it all to dust. Izuku opened his eyes and groaned quietly, already annoyed. This had to stop happening, he was sick of hospitals. You can say that again. He looked to the side, unaware he'd talked aloud, again, and saw his papa sitting next to him, an exhausted smile on his face. He reached out one arm and quickly received a hug, his eyes falling shut with relief. Is everyone okay? Izuku asked, voice raspy and dry. He coughed weakly and groaned again, though this time because his whole left side was killing him. Careful, kiddo, Hisashi said, grabbing a cup and standing up to fill it. You busted your ribs pretty good, I don't even think Sho's messed his up that bad. Izuku accepted his papa's help with the cup and drank slowly, careful not to overdo it. When it was empty he glanced around, frowning. Where is Dad? He asked, his memories fuzzy. And why you didn't answer my question? Everyone's fine, even Dad. Couple people are in here too, but nothing serious, Hisashi assured, sitting down on the bed. Your dad's in surgery, though. It's okay, I promise, he just got a hit from a villain and needs a skin graft, it's alright. Izuku nodded in relief and sagged against the bed, lifting a hand to rest gingerly over his chest. He couldn't remember how he got the wound, though he did remember the creature he assumed gave it to him. He shuddered. What was that thing? The Nomu, he asked, blinking rapidly to banish the vision of the monster from his eyes. Hisashi seemed to be at a loss for words, mouth opening and closing multiple times without him saying a word. Finally he sighed and ran his hand through his yellow hair, pushing it away from his face. We don't know, kiddo. We're trying to figure that out, so don't worry, okay? Focus on getting better and I'll tell you all I know. Izuku nodded and took his papa's hand, squeezing gently. He must have been scared for him, judging by the bags under his eyes. He doubted he'd slept since Izuku was admitted. They talked for a while after, about Shota's surgery and a bit of Izuku's fight against the eel lady, before he grew too tired and went back to sleep again. It wasn't for long, but he felt a bit more refreshed after, and a healer stopped by to check on his ribs. Still broken, but with time and the assistance of Recovery Girl's quirk, they'd be alright in a week as long as he took it easy. What now? Izuku asked after the healer had left, looking at Hisashi. Now we sign you out and go see your dad, Hisashi hummed. Think you can put your pants on by yourself? I can help with your shirt. Izuku blushed and nodded, standing with a bit of careful maneuvering. He got dressed by himself, no help needed, and they headed off to get him discharged before visiting his dad post-surgery. It was a short walk, seeing as they were on the same floor, and they were allowed right in to see Shota already sitting up, though a bit bleary-eyed. Hey kid, he rasped, only to grunt as he suddenly found himself with a lapful of fluffy green kid. I'm so glad you're okay, Izuku said, eyes full of tears. I was so scared. We got dropped in a lake, then there were all these villains, then that blue-haired guy was trying to kill you. Izuku, Shoyuta said, putting a calming hand on his shoulder. Breathe. Izuku inhaled sharply and burst into a coughing fit, ending up gasping for air as his ribs protested. Shoyuta just sighed and rubbed his back, letting him work himself through it. I'm okay, kid. Everyone's alright, the villains were detained, and nobody died, Shoyuta said, running his fingers through Izuku's green hair. The boy nodded tearfully and snuggled up against him, burying his face in his shoulder. He let himself cry away the stress and found himself falling asleep again to the sound of his parents talking quietly above him. He felt a little bad because he was so clingy, but he blamed it on his quirk. Good night, Zuzu, Hisashi whispered, planting a kiss on his head. Izuku drifted away as Shoyuta added his own to his mess of curls, affection welling up in his chest before dissipating and warming the rest of his body pleasantly. Izuku took it easy, as per the doctor's orders. He worked back up to full-blown training bit by bit, until he was right back to sparring and working out with his parents like normal, though with the addition of after-school meetups with his friends at one of the gyms. Shinso needed the most help next to Uraraka, the two of them having the least training out of all of their class, so Izuku met up with him one-on-one, having offered to teach him to spar quirkless. A week and a half after the USJ saw them both resting after an intense morning workout, the two of them sitting quietly as they guzzled their water and wiped sweat from their brows with their t-shirts. Occasionally Izuku would sneak a glance, quietly admiring the other boy while he was distracted, ignorant of how the other did the same when he wasn't looking. Hey, Izuku? Shinso asked, brows furrowed. Your dad taught you how to fight and stuff, right? Izuku nodded, head tilting to one side and making his ears flop over. Well, do you think you could ask him if he'd take me as his work study? He asked, voice quiet. Izuku blinked, mouth falling open for a moment. He snapped it shut and thought about it, his foot tapping idly on the ground. I could, I guess. But I think he'd appreciate it if you took initiative and did so yourself. Maybe you could talk to Nedzu, too? I think Dad mentioned something about being his student too at one point. Shinso sighed and hung his head. Izuku was right, of course, but that didn't mean he didn't dread the ensuing conversations. Nedzu was terrifying and Eraserhead was intimidating. It wasn't a good combination for his social anxiety. I could go with you, though, Izuku offered instead, patting his back. Shinso nodded and stood up, puffing out his chest like he'd seen Kirishima do. Yeah, okay. I can do this. Izuku watched him immediately deflate and rub his chest, snickering softly. He didn't know how Kirishima managed to make his torso inflate like that either. We should get changed and get to class, Izuku said, excited for that day's announcement. We shouldn't miss homeroom, my dad's got something super cool to tell us. I don't know what it is, so don't ask. Shinso closed his open mouth and mimed zipping it shut, before grabbing his gym bag. They rushed to the locker rooms and got showered and changed before running to the main building to get to class. They bounced ideas off of one another, ranging from pop quizzes to a PRGNNCY announcement for Fucklehead, despite the cat having been spayed long ago. They made it right before the bell rang and darted to their seats, sitting down as Eraserhead stepped up to the podium with one arm still wrapped in bandages. He'd foregone his long-sleeved top in favor of a t-shirt, though that didn't make him any less intimidating and instead showed off his extensive scarring and wiry muscles. "It's been a week since the USJ," he started, bracing his arms against the podium. "I trust you all are back in tip-top shape, but please remember that Hound Dog's office is open an hour before classes and 2 hours after. I will not question anyone if they ask to visit his office during class either, so please use the resources UA has offered you." Eraserhead waited for everyone to nod their affirmations, though he knew quite a few of his students had already taken up the offer, including Izuku. "Now, you've been here a few weeks and I trust that you've learned the general flow of things here at UA. But there's one thing that slipped your minds as of late, though I can't blame you. That being said, it's time to prepare for the sports festival." The classroom erupted into noise, people shouting in excitement and making those with sensitive hearing wince and cover their ears. Kuda shrank into his chair and even Shinso winced, his usual poker face breaking under the din. Eraserhead glowered and activated the secondary aspect of his quirk, his hair floating up around his head ominously. Everyone immediately sat down and quieted. "I understand your excitement, but remember that some of your classmates have quirks that make them sensitive to certain stimuli. Make sure you remember that in the future," Eraserhead said, eyes narrowing. "Yes, Sensei," the class chorused back. "Now, we're reaching the end of April and the sports festival is the first week of May, so you all only have a week and a half to prepare. You all would have had more time, but the recent villain attack pushed things back," Eraserhead said. "Sensei," Ida called out, raising his hand. Eraserhead just sighed and nodded. "Why is UA continuing with the sports festival? Isn't Principal Nedzu concerned about another attack?" the boy asked, pushing up his glasses. Eraserhead shook his head. "No. We've tripled security this year and have set up preventative measures against teleportation, warp, and quirks similar to the warp villains. As well, we're screening all visitors extensively to ensure no one tries to sneak in. Nedzu and the staff agree that canceling this year's festival will only lower morale and tell the villains that they've scared us. So we're going to turn the tables and show them how wrong they were by showing them we've come back stronger." His words. Satisfied, Ida lowered his hand. The answer seemed to comfort the rest of the class, too. "Now get your gym uniforms, we're gonna practice your quirkless sparring," Eraserhead said, turning on his heel to walk out the door. Izuku pumped his fist while several other people groaned, though Kirishima, Mina, and Shinso looked especially excited. There was a cold sigh from the corner, and a bicolored head thunked onto the desk beneath it. The day before the festival, the school was buzzing like it was full of bees, the halls full of chatter as students discussed possible events, frontrunners of each year, and the rivalries of different classes and students. Izuku's ears picked up on all of it as he gathered up his things for lunch, though his focus was mainly on the door. He heard people talking right outside it, the group growing larger and larger. "There are people outside," he said with a frown, turning to Shinso next to him. "Must be the other classes and courses," he said, frowning. "Scoping out the competition. It's what I'd do if Nedzu didn't help me get in." Izuku hummed and grabbed his headphones from his bag, putting them on as Ida headed for the door, ignorant of the crowd outside. It slid open and he gasped, hands chopping in the air. "Please refrain from blocking the doorway," he shouted, though he was largely ignored. Class 1A was faced with dozens of eyes picking them apart, wanting to see what made the notorious hero student so special. They eyed those with physical mutations, like Tokoyami and Mina, or prodigies, like Momo and Todoroki, before scanning the rest of the class too. They didn't seem satisfied with what they saw. "This is it?" A blond boy with blue eyes and wearing a haughty expression stepped up to the front, hands crossed over his chest. "I expected more." "What's that supposed to mean?" Mina shouted, jumping up to the bat even as Kirishima held her back. "It means we're honestly underwhelmed," the boy scoffed, leaning forward to provoke the class further. "Rumor has it that you fought villains in the USJ attack, but it looks to me like you were nothing but scared little bunnies." His eyes landed on Izuku with a smirk, making his fur stand on end. His eyes narrowed and he stomped forward, ears pinned against his head as he yanked his headphones down. He wasn't very tall, so he had to crane his head and stand on the very tips of his toes to meet his eyes, but his glare made up for what he lacked in the vertical department. "Until we get our provisional licenses in January next year, hero students are classified as civilians. The attack took place a week into the school year, meaning all of us had a week of hero training before we were suddenly dropped into a closed-off arena with over 100 villains and forced to fight for our lives. There were no casualties, no permanent injuries, and only 2 villains escaped," Izuku said through gritted teeth, before he grinned, eyes narrowing. I bet you can't say you've fought 10 villains at once and lived to tell the tale, can you? There was silence. The blonde was fuming as he glared at Izuku, fists clenched. He clicked his teeth and poked a finger into Izuku's chest, eyes narrowed. Brag all you want, Midoriya. None of it will mean anything when I stand on the podium above you all, making me the best, he said. My name's Monoma Nito, remember that. Monoma turned on his heel and stalked off, followed by a girl with bright orange hair tied back in a ponytail. Izuku watched them go before turning to the rest of the crowd, angry. Are you done? You've seen the class, seen whatever teenage angst that was, so please move so I can go and eat my lunch, Izuku said, the fur on the back of his neck fluffing up in annoyance. After a moment the crowd dispersed, their mumbles reaching his ears and making him pull his headphones back over his ears again. Shinso joined him as he headed out into the halls, silent for the majority of their walk to the cafeteria. That was pretty cool, he said, nudging Izuku gently. Izuku looked up in surprise and flushed, rubbing the back of his neck as he shrugged. Oh, I thought I was kind of rude. I was just so annoyed, you know? That guy, Monoma, was saying some pretty rude things about my friends. And about you, Shinso huffed, rolling his eyes. That bunny comment almost got him tap dancing on Aizawa's desk. Pretty sure Mina was about to defenestrate him, 2-. Midoriya, Shinso. They both stopped suddenly and turned around, eyes wide. Todoroki stood behind them, his gaze intense. It made them both shiver, but that could have also been thanks to the sudden temperature drop in the hallway. You both are two of the strongest in our class. Midoriya, your agility and analytical skills make you terrifying in combat, and Shinso, your quirk ends the fight with just a few words, Todoroki said, glancing back and forth between them as he clenched and unclenched his fists. I would like to be your friend. Izuku could almost hear a record scratch as he and Shinso stared at Todoroki incredulously. Had they heard him right? Todoroki, who'd been almost invisible since the school year started, who hadn't spoken a word to anyone, wanted to be friends, just like that? Do you just want to be friends because of our quirks? Because we're the strongest, or whatever? Shinso asked suspiciously, bringing up a point Izuku hadn't even thought about. Why yeah, that's not even close to true, honestly, Izuku said softly. We're not the strongest. Strength can't just be measured by how strong your quirk is or how smart you are. So what are you really asking? Todoroki didn't say anything for a moment, brows furrowed. His mouth opened and closed without words coming out, before he swallowed and tried again. I saw how you two interact. How you defend one another and don't let others' prejudices define your opinions, he said slowly, unable to meet their eyes. I thought that maybe you'd be friends with me without wanting something from me or my father. Izuku had forgotten for a moment that Todoroki was Endeavor's son. They were so different and he couldn't see the resemblance just looking at him. Aside from the half-red hair and one blue eye, he could have been anyone else's kid. He was scrawny and tall, with a thin face and long nose. He recalled some of their classes and remembered his quirk, half-cold, half-hot, which was a stupid name if you asked him, but had only ever seen Todoroki use his ice before. Did that mean he was actively avoiding his fire? Shinso nudged him, snapping him out of his mutter spell. He looked up to see Todoroki standing there, shocked, brows raised into his hair before he quickly schooled his expression, though Izuku caught a hint of fear before it was shuttered away. Yes, he blurted quickly, waving his hands. Why yes. We'll be friends with you. If that's okay? Shinso rolled his eyes and held out a hand to Todoroki, as unimpressed and deadpan as ever. Friends, I suppose. Todoroki hesitantly took it, shaking once before offering the same to Izuku. The greenette eagerly took his hand and shook enthusiastically, so bright in his demeanor it made the other two wish for sunglasses. They met eyes and something passed silently between them, a promise to protect the fluffy ball of sunshine they'd come to be friends with. Oh okay, time for lunch, I'm starving, Izuku said, pulling away and hopping off down the hall with Shinso and Todoroki trailing behind, helpless to his whims. They had no idea what they were in for. There wasn't a single gym left unbooked the days leading up to the sports festival. Everyone was training their bodies to their limits in a desperate attempt to unlock new skills or perfect ones already discovered. Even Aoyama was training, though most of his time was spent admiring himself in his new shiny tracksuit rather than actually working out or practicing. Izuku spent most of his time training his strength. While he was agile and fast, if he got caught, that was it. Game over. So he asked Mina and Kirishima for advice and started lifting weights. He knew he wouldn't see much progress until after the festival, but he still swore he felt stronger. Shoyuta saw some improvement in their sparring, too, though he'd pitted Izuku against Shinso and Todoroki while he was still resting his arm. But finally, the day arrived. The sports festival. Izuku shifted from foot to foot, fiddling with the earplugs he'd been given earlier by Recovery Girl in order to negate the sound of the crowd. He was allowed to wear them during the initial walkout, which he was grateful for, and he saw Jairu fiddling with a pair of headphones she'd gotten from the support department a few days ago. It made him feel good to know UA truly cared about its students. Hey! Izuku turned to see Shinso standing beside him, looking more nervous than he probably meant to, which meant he was quaking in his shoes underneath his stoic demeanor. Immediately Izuku inched closer and put a hand on the other's arm, hoping to comfort him. "Everything okay?" he asked, watching Shinso's face slowly redden. "Peachy," Shinso wheezed, averting his eyes. Just nervous. What if everyone sees my quirk and thinks it's a villain's? What if I SCK out there?" Izuku thought about it for a moment, dropping his hand in favor of putting a finger to his chin. An idea formed and he smiled at Shinso, his nose twitching. "Then they're wrong. Besides, as long as you try your best, isn't that what matters? You're aiming for underground heroics, so top 3 won't be your goal anyway. But I want to fight you one-on-one, okay?" Shinso stared for a moment, mouth open but no words coming out. He snapped his jaw shut and just nodded, his anxiety melting a bit. Izuku always knew what to say to make him feel better. "You too," he said, nudging Izuku's shoulder. "Do your best." "I will," the greenette assured. A buzzer sounded and a green light flashed above the doors leading into the arena, signaling the students to start walking. The class exited out onto a massive field with a concrete podium, a couple teachers standing on top including Cementos, Midnight, and Ectoplasm. "Everyone give it up for Class 1A." Izuku froze, eyes wide as he struggled to get himself to move. There were so many people, all of them staring, judging, screaming. There was so much screaming. "Izuku?" Todoroki took his hand and tugged on it, brows furrowed. Izuku shakily turned to look and met bicolored eyes, his racing heart calming a bit. "Focus on me, okay?" the boy said, pulling him forward. "They don't matter." Shinso joined them on Izuku's other side, the two shielding him from the worst of the crowd. Izuku gripped both of their hands tightly, thankful he had such great friends to make sure he was okay, especially Todoroki, who he knew to be stoic and not very touchy at all. He would have never been able to step out onto the grass alone. Midnight stepped up onto the platform in the center of the arena, her whip held in one hand and heels clicking loud enough to be heard over the crowd. She spun to a stop and snapped her wrist, a loud crack silencing the crowd. "Welcome to this year's sports festival. Today, our first-year students have the chance to show the world what they're made of. Now let's give it up for this year's top-ranking student, who topped the exam leaderboard. Midoriya Izuku." Izuku swallowed and let go of Todoroki and Shinso's hands, his whole body shaking with nerves as he stepped up to the podium and the microphone in front of it. He cleared his throat and leaned forward, eyes fixed on the microphone so he didn't panic at the sight of all the people watching him. "I know everyone here is watching our Q-quirks, to see who's the FL flashiest A and the strongest. But I'm here to say, the quirk D doesn't make the hero. Why your heart does," he started, fists clenched at his sides. "Everyone here has the makings of a H hero, but a quirk is only a tool in a hero's arsenal. So everyone, give it your all, and bring it from here." He put his fist over his chest, finally looking up to see that he'd not only enraptured the audience, but his fellow students. I know that we all can do it, can achieve our dreams if we really try. So aim for them. Go all the way. Plus ultra. Plus ultra." Izuku stepped down, shivering like a leaf even when Shinso ran up to take his elbow and lead him back to his spot. He felt like his head was spinning. "Thank you, Midoriya. What a rousing speech, it almost brings a tear to my eye." Midnight sniffed, though she shot Izuku a real, proud smile. "Now, on to the first event. This year, our students will have to face a gauntlet to see which of them will continue on to the next round." She cracked her whip again, a massive screen lowering down to display a large wheel with different events on it. An animation played and it spun around and around, everyone holding their breath to see what would be first. Tick 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 tick. Tick, tick, tick. An obstacle course. Midnight shouted, the crowd erupting into cheers along with her. Soon enough, the participating students were gathered up at the starting line, which was actually a long hallway leading outside of the sports festival arena. Izuku identified the first obstacle immediately, that being the hallway itself. It was a bottleneck, too narrow for all of the participating students to even hope to get through at once. Instead of heading near the front where some other students had, Izuku stayed at the back in order to observe his competitors. The lights above the tunnel lit up all at once, signaling the start of the countdown. "Ready!" Midnight shouted, snapping her whip as the red light lit up brightest. "Set. Yellow. Go. Green." All at once, the students lunged forward, pushing and shoving their way towards the tunnel in a dangerous mob. Once they entered the tunnel, however, Izuku shivered and leapt into the air, just in time to miss the ice that spread across the ground at lightning speed. Todoroki had frozen everyone's feet to the ground. "Sorry. So sorry," he called out, jumping over the crowd and hopping from shoulder to shoulder, having no choice but to use his peers as stepping stones to get through the tunnel. Once free, he sprinted forward, turning his head from side to side to get a grasp on his fellows. He wasn't the only one to escape the ice. Tsu and Tokoyami had similar instincts to his, though Tsu seemed to have jumped away in time while Tokoyami had to break free, judging by the ice chips clinging to his pant legs. To his left was Mina, who'd simply used her acid to melt her bonds and was skating forward, a grin on her face. There were others, but those were the faces that stood out to him immediately. Furthest ahead, however, was Todoroki himself, running towards the next obstacle with eyes fixed ahead. Izuku followed his gaze and nearly tripped at what he saw, his eyes growing larger as his head craned upwards. 3 0-pointers, the same ones from the entrance exam. Todoroki wouldn't have fought them like the rest of the class, sans Momo, which was a point in everyone else's favor, but he was recommendation for a reason. Izuku skid to a stop and watched as Todoroki effortlessly flung a great wall of ice up with a sweep up his arm, trapping the robots within and shocking their systems into powering down. In just a few seconds they'd been taken care of, leaving Todoroki free to dash between their legs, though not before throwing out a warning. "Careful, they're about to come crashing down." Izuku flung out his arm just in time for a student to clothesline into it, but it was better than being crushed as the robots fell into a pile of melting ice and scrap metal. The student groaned, but Izuku figured it was better to be alive and so simply squeaked an apology before leaping forward. In this situation, he finally had the upper hand. His legs pumped like pistons as he sprinted forward. He could even match Ida for speed if the turbo student wasn't still struggling in Todoroki's ice trap. At the last second, he sprung upwards, his furry paws slipping on the metal robots before his claws and fingers found purchase where the ice had dented or gouged the metal. He leapt again, even further, scaling the rest of the height in a single bound, before falling down the other side, occasionally touching his paws to a surface to slow his descent. He hit the ground running, some other students having done the same, including Kirishima, who'd bulldozed his way through. "Whoa! Nice moves, bro!" Kirishima shouted, flashing Izuku a thumbs up as the bunny boy sped past. Izuku spared a moment to grin but couldn't offer more than that as he reached the second obstacle. The fall. And the students reached the second obstacle after an amazing display of power from Class 1A student, Todoroki Shoto. Present Mike shouted, his voice audible even outside the stadium where the obstacle course was. Taking a moment to observe, he didn't need much of a plan, unlike if he were still quirkless. If that were the case, he'd crawl over the ropes like many of his classmates, but since he wasn't. He knelt down and braced himself, before shooting forward and jumping the gap like it was nothing. He peered down, his suspicions correct as he spotted netting before the bottom of the bottomless pits, so he didn't have to fear he'd get injured if he were to botch a jump, nor his classmates if they slipped and fell. So he turned his focus forward yet again and cleared the obstacle with ease. He spotted Todoroki ahead and frowned. Was he ahead because he could think quicker in stressful situations? With a hero father, that seemed logical, but Todoroki had to be fast on top of that, too. He caught up and hesitated, spotting mounds of freshly upturned soil nearby. A minefield. There was no easy way across, unless he wanted to blow himself up. Wait, that was it. Izuku turned around and bolted, much to everyone's confusion as he darted between students. The gaps were cleared once more and he found himself in front of the robots, almost back at the start of the race. Present Mike was shouting, but he ignored him as he dug through the rubble. What is Midoriya doing? It looks like he circled back for, what's that in his hand? He yanked free a piece of scrap and ran again, panting heavily as he passed students who shouted in outrage. Izuku couldn't spare them any sympathy, he had to be fast, faster than he ever had been before. In no time flat he was at the minefield, but to his dismay, Todoroki was nearly past it. He'd been lucky when everyone seemed to realize that going slow was their best bet, but Todoroki was quick on his feet. Izuku couldn't help but admire him even as he crouched down to dig up as many mines as they could, setting them down carefully in a heap. Once finished, he stood up and positioned himself like he was about to go down a hill on a sled. It would be the same initially, only his hope was to go up instead of down. Izuku didn't give himself any time to think and leapt forward, eyes clenched shut. The explosion propelled him through the air, his shriek fading in and out of competitors' ears as he shot overhead like a rocket. He was approaching Todoroki quickly, but was falling just as fast, so he pulled his legs underneath him and pushed. He saw the boy's heterochromatic eyes widen, fixed on him in shock as he soared overhead, right past the last line of mines. He crashed and rolled, giving Todoroki enough time to get beside him, but even he realized it was no use. Izuku ran for his life, his lungs burning and legs not much better, squinting as he passed through the final tunnel and into the stadium. He had to cover his ears as the crowds roared, but his grin was huge as he looked all around at the people shouting the same thing. Midoriya! 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 Izuku threw his fist up in victory and turned around, smiling from ear to ear as his friends passed the finish line, all making a beeline for him. They met in a hug and he laughed as his hair was ruffled and body squeezed until he could barely breathe. He looked over Hitoshi's shoulder, past Ida and Uraraka, spotting Todoroki glaring up at the scoreboard above them. He huffed and glanced his way, his expression smoothing out. He nodded once, then turned to leave as the other students flooded the stadium. Something about that slip-up made Izuku's stomach clench. Todoroki rarely showed emotion, let alone anger like that. But his thoughts were drawn elsewhere as the second round was announced and Midnight stepped onto the stage. It was time for the next round. He could figure out the mystery of the bicolored teen later.
Okay, sadly the chapter is over, and if you enjoyed the video just leave a like, and subscribe with post notification, so when the next chapter is ready, you will be notified. Okay, see you in the next video. Bye.